Chapter 1812. The spring snow building by the Guangling River was full of guests tonight. Guangling Prince Zhao Yi held a big banquet and invited distinguished guests. Those who entered the building were either rich or noble, and they were all very rich and noble. Among them, there was the newly appointed Guangling Jidushi Liu Baijie, the administrator Wang Xiongui, who was a former subordinate of Zhang Lu, and Song Li, who had been promoted from General Hung Jiang to General Zhenan and Deputy Jidushi of Adao. Song Li could be said to be an old man of the spring snow house, and was once Zhao Yi's lucky general. It was also Song Li who had successfully blocked Ko Zhonghuai's sneaky attack and harassment, which delayed the war until Wu Zhongshuan's army went on a northern expedition. The Ministry of War in Liang had held a very small but very high-standard military merit evaluation, and Song Li was ranked as the fifth most meritorious official. Other than these three, who were now considered people from the capital, the provincial governors of the three provinces of Guangling Road also appeared. Compared to the storms of the past 2 years, the 6 provincial governors were now beaming with joy. Their speech and actions were filled with the elegance of a noble official. Unfortunately, the Prince of Shu, Chen Zhibao, who was rumored to be attending, did not appear for some reason. On the other hand, the Crown Prince of Yanqi, Zhao Zhu, came uninvited, which could be considered as adding flowers to brocade. If this young Crown Prince was the flower, under the premise that Chen Zhibao was absent, then the King of Jing'an, Zhao Sun, was naturally the grand finale of the luxurious brocade. After Zhao Sun's carriage stopped at the spring snow building, Zhao Yi, who was also the great feudal lord of Liang, personally went downstairs to welcome him. As the owner of the spring snow building, after all the guests had taken their seats, Zhao Yi raised the priceless luminous goblet in his hand high, and laughed loudly. There was once a literary giant in Dafeng dynasty who said, "There are 4 people who wish to be safe and sound in life, and an old friend of Qingshan has a collection of famous books. I like to pretend to be cultured, so I want to have one more wish, which is that spring snow is safe and sound. Therefore, I named this building Spring Snow. The Spring Snow building is honored by the presence of so many virtuous people tonight. Let me drink this cup of wine." The Tongxi sword immortal, Liu Baijie, and the former Minister of Revenue, Wang Xiongui, were the leaders of the civil and military officials. They sat at the head of the table on the left and right. After the toast at Guangling Road, the 2 of them also picked up their wine cups. However, Wang Xiongui and Zhao Yi downed their wine cups in one gulp. Liu Baijie only took a small sip before stopping. She quickly put down her wine cup and glanced at the crown prince, Zhao Yi, sitting next to Zhao Yi. This provincial governor frowned. Following the self-immolation of the young West Chu Empress on the battlefield of the Western Wall, the civil and military officials in the capital of West Chu, which had once been renamed Dingding City, had all surrendered. The Guangling War officially entered its final stage. The emperor ordered that the imperial army was not allowed to harass the people of Guangling Road. They were not allowed to kill people to vent their anger. Once discovered, the provincial governor and the administrator of Guangling Road could be killed on the spot, bypassing the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Justice. However, not killing people did not mean that the rebellious officials of West Chu could escape this calamity. Other than those who had been tactful enough to flirt with the generals of the Liang imperial court, or those who had been able to get the high officials of Tian City to give them protective talismans, most of the other officials who had resolutely chosen to serve in West Chu did not have a good ending. Thus, 2 great jokes were made in Guangling Road. The first was to use money to avoid disaster. Gold and silver objects, as well as antique calligraphy and paintings, were all sent to the mansions of certain generals. The second was to pawn women to curry favor with the new nobles of Guangling Road. Of these, the new general of Zhenan, Song Li, and the Guangling heir, Zhao Yuang, were the most unscrupulous. If one said that Song Li only chose a few famous young and beautiful women to keep in his house, his influence was limited. But Zhao Yuang really did not care. Whether it was young women or married women, he only counted them based on their family status. The wealthy families ranked in the top 10 of West Chu's new dynasty took 3 people from each family. After that, there were more than 40 aristocratic families that extorted 1 or 2 people from each family. If there were people who were unwilling, Zhao Yuang did not dare to kill them openly, but he had his own methods to deal with them. He had plenty of ways to make those families who did not want to be humiliated live a life worse than death. Liu Baijie raised her wine cup and then put it down again. She looked around with mixed feelings. The commander-in-chief of the southern expedition Liu Xianxia, the general who pacifies the south Wu Zhongshuan, the prince of Shu Chen Zhibao, the assistant minister of the Ministry of War Su Gong, the Duke of Huainan Zhao Ying, Yan Zhenchuan, and Yang Shenxing. These were the real heroes who quelled the war in Guangling Road. They were either not here or dead. Lu Baijie smiled bitterly. What was the point of her sitting here? It was only because of the title of the provincial governor of Guangling Road. Song Li, who had a meteoric rise in the imperial court of Liang, was actually sitting beside Lu Baijie. However, he probably knew that he was not on the same side as the Tongxi Sword Immortal, so the youngest permanent general of the Liang dynasty did not show too much eagerness. Instead, he was chatting happily with his old acquaintance, the general of Jizhou. He did not get carried away by his meteoric rise. Soon, Song Li, who was a little tipsy, looked up at the magnificent ceiling of the spring snow building. His fingers twirled the wine cup, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Revisiting the old place, he had been living under someone else's roof. Now, it was hard to say who was living under someone else's roof. When awake, he had 100,000 palms. When drunk, he lay on a beauty's lap. A real man was nothing more than this. Inside the spring snow building, toasts were exchanged, and singing and dancing were celebrating peace. It seemed that when the first floor was peaceful, the world was at peace. Lu Baijie looked at the distant administrator Wang Xiongui, who was sitting across from him. This noble and upright civil official who was about to make a comeback and return to the center of the capital was raising his cup to toast the Prince of Guangling and his son. He held the cup with both hands, his sleeves hanging down. He was wearing a high hat and a wide belt. Lu Baijie looked at some of the people at the back of the seats. Previously, they were all important officials of the Jiangling dynasty, who held jade edicts in their hands and wore red and purple robes in the imperial court of West Chu. Although they were slightly more submissive now, it was difficult to hide the joy of being pardoned. Therefore, they had the demeanor of having to enjoy life to the fullest. Lu Baijie lowered his head to look at the cup of wine. For some reason, he thought of a young face. When that young man first came to visit, he asked the Tongxi Sword Immortal, who had not yet become an official at that time, "How many pounds of benevolence, righteousness, and morality do you sell me?" He suddenly raised his cup, tilted his head back and drank the wine. The hall was full of well-dressed guests. He was full of himself. Chapter 18:13. The Crown Prince of Yanqi, Zhao Zhu, was an uninvited guest. He could have sat next to the King of Jing and Zhao Sun, but he was not particular about it. He rejected the arrangement of the spring snow building and took the opportunity to sit at the back. There were two people on his left and right. One of them was Xianxia, the son of a wealthy family who had studied at the Xianxia Academy. He had a handsome face and was very good-looking. He did not speak much but was not arrogant. He was very likable. On the right was a burly man called Zhou Daliang, an old subordinate of Lu Xianxia. This time, he did not follow his benefactor to Jizhou to take up a post. Instead, he used his military exploits to stay in Guangling Road as the deputy general of Yezhou. He ate even more than Zhao Zhu did and was more likable. Xianxia and Zhou Daliang didn't deliberately try to build up a relationship with His Highness, but the general sitting next to them frequently came over to toast to them. Zhao Zhu didn't get tired of it. "If you toast to me, I'll toast to you." Gradually, the two flatterers became familiar with Xianxia and Zhou Daliang. In addition, Zhao Zhu seemed to have a natural ability to make people feel close to him. For a while, the five of them drank, urged, and avoided wine, each showing their own abilities. They didn't care about the rank of the officials. Wasn't it fun? Compared to the complicated relationships between the other seats, it could be said that the scenery here was unique. Halfway through the wine, 7 sword concubines of the spring snow building entered the building with their swords. The 7 of them were dressed in colorful clothes. They had graceful figures and slender waists. They were like a 3-foot sword that could cut off the head of a hero. The sword dance was dazzling. It was soul-stirring and dazzling. When the 7 sword concubines jumped up at the same time, it was as if a rainbow was hanging in the building. After a famous scholar shouted, the whole room was filled with cheers. Just as the 7 sword concubines were about to leave, an extremely handsome stranger appeared at the entrance of the hall. It was hard to tell if he was a man or a woman. The expression of Prince Zhao Yi of Guangling, who was coordinating with the person outside the door, changed dramatically. The luminous cup in his hand almost fell to the ground. This burly vassal of Guangling stared with wide eyes, his face full of disbelief. Zhao Zhu followed everyone's gaze and shuddered. His expression turned ugly, like a mouse seeing a cat. He wanted nothing more than to hide under the table. The 7 sword concubines that Spring Snow Building had painstakingly nurtured were blocked, unable to advance or retreat. They looked very pitiful. The stranger who spoiled the mood was holding a jug of wine and sitting on the doorstep. Beside him walked 5 beautiful women in snow-white clothes. Compared to the 7 already stunning swordsmen of the king's mansion, whether in terms of appearance or bearing, they were superior. 5 women in white, each with a saber, lined up in front of their master. It was a famous saber of the old southern Tang dynasty. The current standard saber of the Liang border army and the 4th-generation saber of the Bailiang Su family were all examples. General Zhenan Song Li's eyes lit up. He quickly recognized their identities. They were the personal maids of Nailan Yusi, known as the 2 vassal kings of Nanjiang. Their names were also very strange. They were Dongyue, Shishu, Fengdu, 3 Corpses, and Qinglu. The 5 women in white simultaneously took a dozen steps forward. With a light shout, they drew their sabers and chopped down. Just 5 sabers created a majestic momentum of thousands of cavalry breaking through the formation. The 7 Spring Snow Building sword concubines were so scared that they fled backward. Most of the guests invited by Spring Snow Building were also pale. They didn't know what was going on. Was it Prince Zhao Yi of Guangling's ingenuity to liven things up? Or was there someone who dared to make trouble in Spring Snow Building? Everyone only heard the handsome scholar sitting on the threshold, shaking the wine pot with one hand and patting his knee with the other. He sang loudly, "Please look carefully at the people in front of you. Every year, they bury the grass. More or less, there are graves in the grass. Every year, half of them are not swept." Now everyone understood that these people didn't get along with the vassal king's mansion. Otherwise, if it was the arrangement of Spring Snow Building, those words alone would be too unlucky. Prince Zhao Yi of Guangling gritted his teeth. Lu Baijie looked calm. Wang Xiongui was puzzled. Song Li smiled playfully. Zhao Zhu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The obese Zhao Yi slowly got up, squeezed out a smile, and asked tentatively, "Mr. Nailan, I don't know why you came to Spring Snow Building. Do you have something to discuss?" Wang Xiongui, who was about to retire as the administrator and return to the capital, was furious after hearing the title. He asked knowingly, "Who are you?" Nailan Yusi, who was as charming as a god, stopped singing. He smiled intoxicatingly and pointed at himself. "Me." Then he got up leisurely. He had been drinking when he went upstairs. Before sitting down at the door of the top floor of the Spring Snow Building, he had already drunk more than half of the wine. His face was flushed, and he became more and more radiant. This advisor, who was only known by name in the entire Liang Temple, laughed and said, "I, Nailan Yusi, am a scholar." Following Nailan Yusi's words, the 5 beautiful maids once again moved forward. Their figures spun in the air, and then they stepped heavily on the rich and luxurious clothes. They slashed out with their blades, and their imposing manner was even more powerful than before. Nailan Yusi slowly moved forward as if there was no one around. His words made the entire Guangling Path's dignitaries feel as if they were struck by lightning. 150,000 armored soldiers from Nanjiang went all the way to the north. They have already crossed the Guangling River. Wang Xionggui's face was pale, and he fell back to his seat. Not only was this Guangling Path administrator out of his wits, but there were also countless crisp sounds of wine cups breaking in the building. Zhao Yi's face was gloomy, and he did not say a word. Song Li narrowed his eyes and began to weigh the pros and cons. Zhao Zhu was stunned on the spot. The Nanjiang army left their territory to the north without permission. Obviously, even he, the king of Yanqi, and his royal highness were kept in the dark. Lu Baijie gently put down the wine cup, stood up and asked in a deep voice, "What is the king of Yanqi, Zhao Bing's intention?" Nailan Yusi seemed to be stumped by this question. He frowned and lowered his head to think for a moment. Then he suddenly raised his head and smiled. "Rebellion, isn't this obvious?" "Why, Mr. Tongxi, you don't believe me?" Lu Baijie shook his head and smiled sarcastically. At this time, 2 people walked in side by side. One of them was wearing a royal robe. He was a burly old man, and he was very similar to the crown prince of Yanqi that everyone in the building was familiar with. However, compared to Zhao Zhu's frivolity, this old man was imposing. The old man smiled and looked at the Guangling king, Zhao Yi, who was sitting high on the main seat. "Little fatty Yi, how have you been?" I have been in the barren Nanjiang for 20 years. I have been drooling over your Guangling path for a long time. But then again, it should have been I, Zhao Yi, who owned Guangling. You, Zhao Yi, are only fit to help me guard the house for 20 years. Zhao Yi's face was ashen, and his lips were trembling. However, compared to the king of Nanjiang who had not spoken in the Liang palace for more than 20 years, the king beside the old man who was also wearing a royal robe made all the dignitaries feel more terrified and desperate. The former protector general of Beiliang, the current king of Shu, Chen Jibao. If it was only Zhao Bing's Nanjiang army rebelling, Liang and Gu Zhentong's two border armies going south to quell the rebellion, it would be nothing more than another disaster of West Chu's restoration. However, once Zhao Bing had Chen Jibao's help, everyone began to doubt whether the Liang imperial court, which had shown signs of trouble since the Yonghui auspicious talisman, would be able to luckily survive this calamity. At this time, some people in the Spring Snow building finally remembered the Northwest Armored Cavalry. They began to ask themselves, if he had the deterrence of the 300,000 loyal and devoted armored cavalry, would this Nanjiang barbarian, Zhao Bing, not dare to touch the Central Plains for the rest of his life, and could only slowly die of old age in the man miasma? The butcher Su Shao was dead. The blue-eyed Zhang Julu was dead. When the two were alive, the world was truly at peace. The Nanjiang army did not dare to take a single step out of Nanjiang. Even Beimang's million-strong army did not dare to take half a step south. After the two died, West Chu was quickly restored, Beimang knocked on the pass, and Nanjiang rebelled. No one knew why Chen Jibao chose to rebel against Beiliang. Since he had chosen to rely on the orthodox Zhao clan of Liang, he had long since become a vassal. Why did he in the end place all his bets on a vassal in a remote corner? Chen Jibao was expressionless. He calmly looked at Liu Baijie, the provincial governor of Guangling. In the end, Liu Baijie sighed and slumped back into his seat. How many people would die in the Central Plains before they would stop? Chen Jibao's lips curled into a cold smile. If people in the Central Plains did not die, how could they remember that some people were dying for them? I, Chen Jibao, am not Su Fengmian. I am not afraid of war, and I am not afraid of people dying. Chapter 1814. The Spring Snow building had a banquet that would decide the future of the Central Plains. The Qingcang city of Liuzhou also had a banquet. Although it was a simple meal, it would decide the future of Liangmang. Provincial Governor Yang Guangdou looked at the young faces crowding around the table and couldn't help but smile. The old man was happy and gratified. Chen Shiliang, who had just been promoted to Liuzhou, General Ko Jianghuai Xiaxibian, who had just come from outside Liangzhou to take over the two towns of Linyao and Fengxiang, Yul Wandao, who had led 10,000 Yuzhou cavalry to this place, Chao Wei, who was about to go to Mount Lantua in the western regions, and of course, Su Longxiang. The old man looked at these energetic young people, as if 5 rising stars had suddenly appeared in his family. It was like suddenly seeing clusters of fresh green on a snow-white winter day. It was too much for the eye to take in, and it filled one with joy. Chao Wei was short and had an ordinary appearance, but he was arrogant. Even though he was eating at the same table as these people of the same age, his voice was the loudest and his aura the sharpest. This short man chewed on a mutton pancake as he snorted at Yang Guangdou. Old Yang, just wait patiently and help me deliver the victory report to Mount Qingliang and the Protectorate. Actually, if you want me, you can pick up the brush right now. Just write the military merit as big as possible. I guarantee it won't be wrong. Chen Shiliang smiled. We still have to follow the rules. Chao Wei squinted. Old Chen, you don't trust me, Great General Chao, do you? Chen Shiliang smiled helplessly. Yul Wandao sneered. Don't forget that Zhong Tan led 10,000 elite southern cavalry to Mount Lantua. You only have 10,000 men and horses. Victory and defeat are still uncertain. Now you're thinking about military merit? Who leads soldiers to war like you? Do you believe that I won't write a secret letter to the prince right now? Everything had its vanquisher. Chao Wei was frivolous with everyone except for the eldest grandson of the Yu family, who had defected to the Central Plains. He rolled his eyes and said, Bitch, I won't lower myself to your level. The handsome Yul Wandao pressed his hand on the famed saber Dalwan at his waist and raised his eyebrows. Going outside to play? Chao Wei swallowed the last bit of the pancake. Suddenly, he cried out and held his stomach. I ate too much. Today, I only used 20 to 30% of my usual strength. Forget it. Yul Wandao, I will use 20 to 30% of my strength to fight with you. I'll still beat you up. Yul Wandao sneered. Afraid of you? Xie Shibian smiled knowingly. Ko Jianghu silently chewed and swallowed the mutton pancake, occasionally taking a sip of water. He ignored the tit-for-tat between Chao Wei and Yul Wandao. Su Longxiang, barefoot and dressed in black, grinned. Why don't the two of you fight me together? Yul Wandao and Chao Wei looked at each other and said in unison, only one hand. Only one leg. Su Longxiang chuckled. Sure. The hidden wand saber was in high spirits and eager to fight, while Chao Wei was still cowering like a coward. Yang Guang laughed angrily. A bunch of brats. Stop messing around. The old man threw a look at Chen Shiliang. The latter put down the mutton pancake and straightened his clothes. He said in a low voice, the latest report from the Whispering Waterhouse shows that the real Battle of Liuzhou will be fought at Beimang Nanchao. This is a confirmed report. Ningame will lead 6,000 iron stupas to Qingcang City to support the Longxiang army. At the same time, Liangzhou's General Shifu and the White Feather Light Cavalry stationed around Qingyuan Army Town can enter the Liuzhou battlefield at any time to help the Longxiang army tie down Huang Songpu's Beimang main force. Chao Wei frowned and asked, after the Battle of Longyan, didn't the Iron Stupas only have 2,000 men left? Chen Shiliang laughed. 800 white horses just joined the Iron Stupas. They also transferred 3,000 cavalry from the two passes in Liangzhou. Chao Wei slapped his thigh and glanced at hidden wand saber. He purposely complained, damn it, so the Iron Stupas are Su Fengnian's sons. Hidden wand saber, who had followed the young king from Jizhou to Calabash, raged, Chao Wei. You better watch your mouth. Chen Shiliang turned to look at Ko Jianghu and Xie Shiliang. He continued, to ensure that we can wipe out Zhong Tan's cavalry, other than Chao Wei's 10,000 cavalry as the main force, I'm afraid we will need another cavalry force to support us. Ko Jianghu said directly, I don't eat such small fish. Xie Shiliang said calmly, I'll go. Feng Xiang and Lin Yao are familiar with the geography of the western region. Hidden Wand Saber narrowed his eyes and smiled. Then I'll go straight to the heart of the southern dynasty's Gusai prefecture and go straight to that Shijing temple? As Chen Shiliang's line of sight met, Su Longxiang had already answered, the Longxiang army will meet Huang Songpu's main force on the battlefield at the border of Liuzhou. They will retreat as they fight. Before Huang Songpu sees the walls of Qingcang City, it will be after 3 or 4 battles. Ko Jianghu nodded. 3 battles is the minimum. As long as the 30,000 Longxiang army can last until 4 battles, I can make that previous king of the southern courtyard unable to return. I want him to end up like Yang Yuanzan. If there are 5 battles. Ko Jianghu paused and looked at Hidden Wand Saber provocatively. Then I'll have to compete with you to see who can cut off more heads of the southern dynasty officials. Chapter 18:15. Chen Shiliang cautiously said, although in the Battle of Longyan Plains, the northern Mang chieftain and the other elite Malanzi troops were almost completely wiped out, Huang Songpu was after all the king of the southern courtyard for nearly 20 years, so he definitely still has some foundation. Zhong Tan is also entrusted with high hopes by the Zhong family. Therefore, in Liuzhou, no matter where the battle is, we cannot lower our guard. For this reason, I have specially requested the Governor-General Manor to transfer at least 600 white horse wandering crossbowmen from the Liangzhou border army. Chen Shiliang suddenly spoke in a more serious tone, his eyes sharp. Everyone, although I, Chen Shiliang, am not good at military affairs, I am very clear about one thing, and that is that on the battlefield of Liuzhou, where a single move can affect the entire situation, no one can make up for their mistakes just by killing a few thousand Beimang barbarians. I will say the ugly words up front, if anyone dares to delay the overall situation of Liuzhou for a little bit of merit, then as long as I, Chen Shiliang, am alive, I will not rest until he or she is dead. Chao Wei, Yul Wandao, Ko Jianghu, Xie Shiliang. Chao Wei sighed and resentfully put down the leg on the stool. I'm scared of you, old Chen. I know. Yul Wandao said with a solemn expression. You know the severity of the situation. Our Yuzhou cavalry will only make Shi Jingqing our primary target. We will do our best to avoid Gentleman's Pavilion and the other military towns, regardless of whether their forces are empty or not. Xie Shiliang nodded. Ko Jianghu was still a taciturn person, but he could not withstand Chen Shiliang's gaze and could only nod along with Xie Shiliang. Su Longxiang scratched his head. Shiliang, is there nothing else for me to do? Chen Shiliang raised his arm, clenched his fist, and swung it down. General, you only need to focus on stopping Huang Songpu's main force. Su Longxiang laughed foolishly. This is indeed not a problem. Chao Wei slapped his forehead. This stupid little prince. Who knows how he could have such a crafty older brother? Xie Shibian couldn't help but laugh. Then, he was a little dazed. Back in Guangling Road, although he had personally won many unbelievable battles, he still felt uneasy. That kind of feeling was like knowing that even if you won 99 battles, as long as you lost one, you would lose the whole game. After arriving at Beiliang, after arriving at Qingcang City, apart from the arrogant Ko Jianghu, they became fellow soldiers with these strangers. Even though there was a great disparity in strength between them and the enemy, they felt incomparably at ease. At this moment, a handsome young man dressed in light armor strode into the house. He suddenly clasped his fist and said, White Horse Crossbowman Li Hanlin, leading 1,200 riders, has entered the Azure City and is on standby. With a face full of shock, Chen Shiliang stood up and asked, Officer Li, why are there so many crossbowmen? What about outside the Liangzhou Pass? Li Hanlin said with a straight face, This is a military order from the Protectorate. I only follow orders. Then, the only remaining White Horse officer of the Beiliang Frontier Army winked at the people in the house. With a bright smile, he lowered his voice slightly and said, There are no Beimang soldiers left outside the Liangzhou Pass to kill. That old fellow Huang Songpu has 700 to 800 private soldiers under him, so it's not too bad. Ko Jianghu raised his head and asked, You are that Li Hanlin? The son of the administrator Li Gongda? Chao Wei immediately got into the mood of watching a good show. He was afraid that the world would not be chaotic enough. Tiska. Ko Jianghu was someone who usually treated everyone he met as if they owed him millions of taels of silver. Now that he met someone like Li Hanlin who had both a family background and military exploits, he really wanted to have a good fight with him. Li Hanlin was stunned. He smiled and said, Yes, I am Li Hanlin. You are Ko Jianghu, General Ko, right? When you guys were fighting to the death with the Liang Imperial Court, Nian and I, we had letters with the prince. In the letters, the prince said that if one day you and Xie Shibian could work together for the Beiliang Frontier Army, that would be great. I didn't think that such a day would really come. I, Li Hanlin, am a rough person. Without any hesitation, as long as I can return from the battlefield alive, when I reach Lingzhou, I will treat you, Ko Jianghu, to drink wine for an entire year. Not only you, Chao Donghua, Yulwandao, Xie Shibian, none of you will be able to escape. Chao Wei, who had his nickname called, said angrily, Where did you get so much silver from? Lingzhou, that gold-consuming lair. How could you get a decent courtesan without at least 200 or 300 taels of silver? Li Hanlin laughed and said, What are you afraid of? Just borrow it from my father. If you can't pay him back, you can pay him back with a bunch of grandchildren. Ko Jianghui's lips curled up. This once infamous White Horse commandant seemed to be much more pleasing to the eye than Xie Shibian or Yulwandao. Xie Shibian said with a bitter smile, Commandant Li, drinking wine is fine, but drinking wine with courtesans, I'm afraid that after a year of drinking wine, you will have to kneel on a washboard. The Beiliang, who was known for being serious, Chen Shiliang said with a smile, I am a bit better than Xie Shibian. I haven't married yet, so I am not afraid of drinking wine with courtesans. But if I want to drink, I will only drink green ant wine. As for courtesans, Chen Shiliang said with a serious expression, I still care a lot. Ko Jianghu couldn't help but glance at this young Liuzhou officer, who had made him look at him in a new light. He cursed in his heart, F***K, as expected of a scholar from Gangnam-do. Yang Guangdo didn't interrupt these young people. The old man would occasionally pick up a peanut and throw it into his mouth. His eyes were full of smiles. After the old man clapped his hands, he suddenly stood up. With his hands behind his back, he walked straight to the door. After crossing the threshold, he turned his head to look at the young people and slowly said, In this world, there is probably only Beiliang. Only I, Yang Guangdo, have a basket of mutton pancakes at the farewell banquet for the generals. I'm sorry. After the old man said this, he walked away. Chao Wei quickly pulled Chen Shiliang's sleeve and laughed. Old Chen, did you see that? Is old man Yang crying? The old man who had not gone far increased his pace and cursed. Bullshit. Our Bailiang has a lot of wind and sand. Chapter 18:16. If one did not go to Guangling, one would fail to live up to one's expectations. If one did not eat crabs, one would fail to live up to one's stomach. As a scholar, it was not difficult to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. One must know that the Spring God Lake was connected to the Guangling River. Then, one could go to the Xianxia Academy near the Spring God Lake to eat crabs. However, the Xianxia Academy was not a place that anyone could enter. One had to pay attention to one's family background, status, and aspirations. With the arrival of the Grand Chancellor Qi Yonglong to the capital, the Xianxia Academy became even more prosperous. The former Minister of War Liu Baijia, who was known as the Tongxi Sword Sage, seemed to have been demoted to the Guangling Jidushi. The first thing he did was to go to the library of the Xianxia Academy to borrow books. He made an appointment with the administrator Wang Xiongui to sharpen his knowledge for more than half a decade. This pushed the reputation of the academy to its peak. Under such circumstances, the influence of thousands of scholars at the beginning of Xiangfu gradually dissipated from the map of the Central Plains. In the Xianxia Academy, which was now known as the Jianghu Hanlin Academy, there was a woman named Teacher Ji Shang who was even more dazzling. She was Yu Yuwei, who taught music and miscellaneous in the academy. Yu Yuwei's father was a teacher of the academy. Her mother was the famous chief swordswoman of the West Chu royal family. Her sword dance was one of the magnificent 8 masterpieces of Dechu, which was as famous as the Grand Preceptor Li Mi's Go. Yu Yuwei herself was a very charming woman. Therefore, her teaching at the Xianxia Academy attracted a lot of attention. It was said that even the Empress Yan Donggu, who lived deep in the imperial palace, heard of this extraordinary woman and wanted to persuade the emperor to summon Yu Yuwei to the imperial college in the capital to take up the position of a teacher. However, Yu Yuwei's great opportunity had been delayed due to the turmoil in the spring snow building of the Prince of Guangling's mansion. This woman, Ji Shang, did not seem to be depressed because of this. She had originally planned to bring the students of Jixia Academy to tour the spring lake in early autumn. Step by step, more than 160 people set off in a mighty manner. Yu Yuwei's teaching style was quite unusual. Half of her time was not spent in the Xianxia Academy. Instead, she led the students to visit the famous mountains and rivers, scenic spots, and the ruins of the previous dynasty. They listened to the sound of the pines, the gushing of the springs, and the whistling of the wind on the high cliffs. However, the spring lake, which was close at hand, had been forgotten by everyone, probably because it was dark under the lights. Until last month, a student proposed to visit the spring lake, and Yu Yuwei agreed. When they were approaching the spring lake, it happened to be raining heavily. A young military general led a group of elite cavalry and arrived unexpectedly. The sound of the horses' hooves splashed up a lot of mud. In the twilight, 200 armored cavalry soldiers clanked, dazzling the students of the academy. The leader of the cavalry swung the stirrups and dismounted. He took off his helmet and held it under his armpit. He strode forward and smiled at Yu Yuwei. Yuwei, after so many years, we finally meet again. Yu Yuwei's expression was the same as usual. She only nodded lightly. Like the students of Jixia, she wore a thick straw raincoat that covered her figure. Even so, she was still lovely and moving. When the scholars of the academy around her recognized the identity of the newcomer, most of them cried out in surprise. Their eyes were filled with passion, worship, and reverence. It turned out that this person was Qi Shens, who had graduated from Xianxia Academy. When Qi Shens was studying, he was known as one of the 8 elites of the academy along with Ko Jianghui, Zhao Kai, and the others. In just a few years, he first relied on his illustrious family background to serve under the commander of the southern expedition, Lu Shengxiang. However, he started out as an ordinary soldier and made a name for himself at the end of the Battle of Guangling Road. With his outstanding military service, he was quickly promoted on the battlefield. After West Chu was destroyed, the imperial court rewarded meritorious officials. Qi Shens was once again promoted to the ranks of military officers with real power. This time, during the Great Change in the Spring Snow Building, Qi Shens benefited from the disaster and stood out. He truly entered the eyes of the entire world. It was rumored that the king of Yan, Zhao Bing, and the king of Shu, Chen Jibao, each chose one person. The king of Yan chose the powerful general of the south, Song Li, for his own use. The war saint in white was the only one who was impressed by Qi Shens, who was a rising star among the younger generation. Therefore, when the scholars of the Shangyin Academy talked about his Xianxia, they liked to call him 3 steps to heaven. After the 2 vassal kings joined hands and announced to the world that they had officially started the war, other than the elites of the southern Jianghu crossing the river and entering the Guangling Road, large amounts of western Shu soldiers also entered the Central Plains. The king of Jing and Zhao Sun, who had won the 4 words loyal, fierce, brave and resolute, through 2 battles to the death, had disappeared for some reason. He was not under house arrest in the spring snow building like Liu Baijie and Wang Xiongui, nor did he speak out for the Zhao family of Liang in the vassal king's territories. This change caught the imperial court off guard. As Lu Shengxiang and Su Gong were moved to the border of Jizhou, and the minister of war Wu Zhongshuan was also summoned to the capital. Although the army under him did not follow him to the north, the situation was very unfavorable. They had no choice but to avoid the sharp edge. Before the imperial edict from Great Peace City arrived, the leading general retreated 400 miles to the north and set up camp at the southern border of the capital. The Liang emperor urgently summoned the great pillar state Gu Jiantang, Lu Shengxiang, Su Gong, and the Huai Jidushi Kai Nan to the capital. Only at this time did the Liang imperial court suddenly realize that there were not many trustworthy generals. Thinking back to the past, Yang Shenxing, Yan Zhenchuan, Ma Lulong, and the other old generals, which one of them was not enough to hold their own in the army? At this time, the resignation of the Imperial College Chancellor, Yao Baifeng, due to illness seemed especially unsurprising. It was not as eye-catching as the rise of Qi Shens. Qi Shens stood in the heavy rain. Raindrops fell heavily on the precious armor he had taken from the Guangling prince's mansion's treasury. The sound was crisp and continuous, and there was a vague, indescribably vigorous aura of metal. He and the woman not far away spoke some simple words of reunion after a long separation. When he spoke to her, he stared into her eyes, hoping to find a trace of joy, relief, or surprise in her eyes. Unfortunately, there was none. Other than the standard warblade hanging from Qi Shen's waist, he also had the 12th famous sword of the Dongyue sword pool, Linglong. His gaze shifted slightly to the surface of the spring god lake. He then withdrew his gaze and said with a smile, "Yue, I was once a comrade with the new Qingzhou Navy Admiral, Sir Liu. I heard that you were going to tour the spring god lake, so I specially asked him to give you a yellow dragon ship for you to use. Don't worry, there will be no battles in Guangling in the near future. You can enjoy yourselves to your heart's content." Yue nodded and did not refuse his kindness. She said indifferently, "I thank you on behalf of the students, General Qi." Qi Shens wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, he did not say those hurtful words. For example, he heard that in these troubled times, there was going to be a wedding in western Bailiang Prefecture. Qi Shens took a deep breath and smiled. He put on his helmet again and said in a deep voice, "Take care." Yue was startled. She then smiled with more sincerity. She nodded and said, "You take care as well." The giant ship gradually approached the shore. Her group boarded the ship, while his cavalry remained on the shore for a long time. Just as the yellow dragon ship completely disappeared behind the curtain of rain, another group of elite cavalry arrived at the shore of the spring god lake. Their leader was about the same age as Qi Shens, but his current rank was even higher than Qi Shens. He was the former general of Ji Prefecture, Yuan Tingshan. He was the son-in-law of Gu Jiantang of the Great Pillar State and the current master of the Wild Goose Castle Private Cavalry. He and Song Li had pledged their allegiance to the king of Yan, Zhao Bing, who was marching north with great momentum. However, he regretted not meeting Qi Shens sooner. It was just that the two of them had an ordinary relationship with His Royal Highness Zhao Zhu of Yan. Yuan Tingshan wiped the rain off his face and teased loudly, I'm late. I didn't get to see that magnificent Master Yu." Qi Shens lamented in a low voice, "You're late. I'm late too." Yuan Tingshan couldn't hear him clearly, but he could clearly see Qi Shens' despondent expression. He lamented his misfortune and was angry at his failure to fight. He said unhappily, "If it were me, I would have snatched her and brought her home a long time ago. I'm sure she'll be obedient. She's just a woman with no family or friends. Do you think the Shangyin Academy she's from can really arm wrestle with you, General Qi? Just by saliva?" At this point, Yuan Tingshan patted the saber at his waist and grinned viciously, "Don't forget that we have this toy." Qi Shens didn't say anything. He only shook his head. Yuan Tingshan snorted coldly, "We're really brothers in the same boat. We're both at odds with that Su guy." Xianxia dismissed it with a laugh. The yellow dragon ship gradually sailed away. Yu Wei and a short little girl were standing at the bow of the ship. The latter was helping her carry the big white cat, Wu Mainyang. The little girl was nicknamed Little Wooden Fish. Her hair was braided with goat horns, and her surname was Wang. Her father's generation were all teachers of the academy. The epitaph written by her father was famous all over the world. It was praised by the literary circles of the Central Plains as, "Those who don't shed tears upon hearing it must be heartless and unfilial." Because the little girl often appeared in Master Yu's lectures, she was as famous as Wu Mainyang in the academy. Over time, she also gained the nickname of Little Mr. Wang. Wu Mainyang jumped out of the little girl's arms and slipped back into the cabin to hide from the rain. The little girl stood on tiptoe and leaned against the railing. She asked curiously, "Big Sister Yu, do you think a flood dragon will appear in such a big lake?" Yu Wei couldn't help but laugh. "I don't know about that." The little girl asked timidly. "The newly established White Horse Academy in Beiliang has invited you to give a lecture. Do you want to go?" Yu Wei fell silent. Seeing this, the little girl didn't dare to say anything else. She sighed like an old woman and suddenly said, "The scenery is old, so how can I not recall Jiangnan?" Yu Wei's smile became slightly bitter. "The scenery is old, so how can I not recall Beiliang?" Chapter 18:17. Basins of various sizes in the western regions were scattered all over the place, making it easy for an army to move freely. It was difficult to set up a defense. Therefore, in history, the Central Plains dynasties could only reach the western regions during their heyday. The Beiliang Protectorate Sang followed the rise of the Great Feng dynasty. Today, the three towns of Qingcang, Linyao, and Fengxiang existed to connect the western regions and the Central Plains. In the vast area to the west of Linyao, the Miyun Pass was the main passageway. Mount Lantua was located on the left side of the pass, making it a natural place to store troops. One after another, two cavalry armies slowly moved east along this wide mountain pass. The latter was a typical northern Mang light cavalry formation. Apart from the 100-man commanders and 1,000-man commanders who wore armor that was no different from the Central Plains cavalry generals, the cavalry mostly wore light and durable armor made from leather. They were equipped with all sorts of weapons, including cavalry sabers, spears, cavalry bows, and there were even many wolf-tooth clubs and horse lassos hanging from the sides of the auxiliary horses. That vanguard cavalry was clearly even heavier. For the sake of not harming the warhorse's legs, there were two additional mounts, the two mounts separately carrying armors, namely weapons and armor. The armored horses had eye-catching armor pouches hanging from them, the set of armor almost completely covered in leather on the inside and either scale armor or chainmail on the outside. The weapons were also comparatively more orderly, all of them being spears, cavalry bows and cavalry blades, all of them hanging from the soldiers' horses. Meanwhile, this cavalry army numbering around 3,000 also had leather armor on their warhorses. Just from the scale of this one-man three mounts, one could tell that regardless of how strong or weak these 3,000 cavalry were, they were definitely the old man's army, in northern Mang's border army. According to Beimang's trusted enemy, the Beiliang frontier army, the Beimang border army could be divided into three types. The cavalry nicknamed the Sun's Army belonged to the elites of the southern dynasties, with each man riding two horses. They could be considered the sons of the southern dynasty's influential officials. They did not lack anything good. Their horses were excellent, and their armors were excellent. The cavalry of important military towns such as the tile-building Gentleman's Pavilion were among them. As for the Sun Zijuan army, they were much inferior. In the eyes of the cavalry outside Beiliang, especially outside the Liangzhou Pass, they were no different from military exploits on horseback. There was also a powerful cavalry force known as the Laozi Army, which was not to be underestimated. They had as many as 3 or even 5 auxiliary horses. For example, Dongshu's private cavalry, Hong Jingyan's Ruren Iron Cavalry, and the personal troops of the Beimang generals such as Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzan were all like this. Although their numbers were small, their combat power was extremely strong. There was no situation where they did not dare to fight to the death due to the disparity in numbers. If they won, they would be like a hot knife through butter, but if they lost, they would be completely wiped out. To a large extent, they were able to dominate the situation on the battlefield. After the first battle of Liangmang, the noble clans of the southern dynasty who had placed their bets on the battlefields of Liuzhou and Yuzhou were greatly weakened. Since they could not rely on Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzan, the 6 or 7 great clans of the southern dynasty who were connected with each other had learned their lesson and placed their bets on the famous Xia Zhemo, Zhong Tan. Of course, Zhong Tan, who enjoyed the shade of a big tree, also took out a lot of his family's savings. The 3,000 elite cavalrymen were from the Zhong family, and half of them were sent to Zhong Tan. Even General Zhong Shintong had no more than 3,000 private cavalrymen under his command, which showed how much the Zhong family valued this legitimate son of the eldest branch. However, this was not surprising. After all, Zhong Tan was a junior that even the empress personally praised in the imperial court. Looking at the Beimang officialdom for 20 years, among the seniors in the imperial court, only Lu Gui and Dong Zhuo had such an honor. Zhong Tan rode on a Fergana horse nicknamed Beauty. The young general, who should have been proud of himself, had a gloomy look in his eyes as he looked into the distance of the mountain pass. A trusted chiliarch beside him asked curiously, "Young lord, more than 80 horse stalls have been sent out, and they are all our men, so there won't be any mistakes. I estimate that there won't be any battles before we reach the Phoenix military town in Liuzhou. What is young lord worried about?" Zhong Tan's ears rang with the familiar sound of hooves and camel bells. He frowned and said, "It's too quiet." The chiliarch from the Zhong family scratched his big bald head and grinned. Young lord's trip to Mount Lantua was unexpected, so it's normal that the Bailiang frontier army didn't react in time. The pitiful cavalry in Liuzhou would have a hard time dealing with Huang Songpu's troops. How could they have the time to deal with us? Zhong Tan sighed and said worriedly, "In the previous battle, Dong Zhuo had already taken down Liangzhou's Huta city and maintained a balance of power in Liuzhou. In the end, they lost the entire battle because Yuzhou lost too badly. This time, the battle is to the north of Bibei city, but the key to victory is in Liuzhou. What I'm afraid of is that I'll lose in both wars because of where I am." The chiliarch hurriedly interrupted Zhong Tan's unlucky words and said resentfully, "Young lord, don't jinx it." Zhong Tan laughed self-deprecatingly. Then, with a determined look in his eyes, he said in a deep voice, "Keep an eye on the horse fence at the front and send back spies. If there are any abnormalities, our 3,000 cavalry in the vanguard will prepare for battle and rush out of Mount Miyun as quickly as possible. We must ensure that the 6,000 cavalry behind us can spread out their formation on flat ground." The reason why Xia Zhemo personally led 3,000 cavalrymen to open the way was that he was worried that they would be blocked in Mount Miyun. The 6,000 cavalrymen behind him, who came from various sources, might not be able to successfully block the sudden charge of Bailiang's cavalry. They might even be forced by the enemy to the point where the seawater would flow backward. If that happened, it would be a one-sided slaughter in Mount Miyun. Even though the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua were close at hand, it was of little significance to a cavalry battle where victory or defeat could be decided in a fleeting moment. Zhong Tan, who had experienced the bitter war at Huluku from the beginning to the end, knew very well that the superiority and inferiority of military strength on paper were all false. Not only did the battle at Liangmang prove this point, but the two young men, Xia Shibian and Ko Jianghuai, also proved this point with one unimaginable victory after another during the re-establishment of West Chu at Guangling Road in the Central Plains. Although Zhong Tan had a discussion with his father, Zhong Shintong, and his little uncle, Zhong Liang, beforehand, they believed that the dangerous situation in Liuzhou did not allow Bailiang to dispatch 20,000 cavalrymen to intercept them, and that once their military strength was less than 20,000 cavalrymen, then Zhong Tan's 10,000 cavalrymen and the nearly 10,000 monk soldiers of Mount Lantua, who were about to rush to the battlefield, would be in an invincible position on any battlefield to the west of Liuzhou. However, Zhong Tan never felt that there was anything inevitable on the battlefield. During the monarch's question and answer session at the imperial court in Xijing, Her Majesty praised this young man endlessly in front of all the important ministers. Zhong Tan did not say much, and said that there was nothing outstanding about him, and he could only be cautious in using troops. This was not only to give consideration to the face of Lu Gui, Dong Zhuo, and the other defeated generals, but more importantly, it was a true portrayal of Zhong Tan's disposition of troops. Zhong Tan muttered to himself, "As long as I get out of this Miyun Pass, even if you, Su Fengnian, have the ability to stir up clouds with one turn of the hand and rain with one turn of the hand in Liuzhou, it won't affect the overall situation. However, even if you have the courage to come and intercept me, can you really stop me?" Even though they were close to the exit, there was still some distance to go, and the latest military intelligence sent back by the stables didn't have any abnormalities. However, Zhong Tan suddenly narrowed his eyes and issued a strange military order. 3,000 vanguard cavalrymen, change horses. Put on armor. Zhongtan took the lead and charged forward. If there were no Bailiang cavalrymen waiting outside the pass, then it would just be treated as a military exercise. In the art of war, there had always been a saying of attacking halfway, and it varied according to the time and place. A young and scholarly cavalry general raised his arm, and the 6,000 cavalrymen behind him suddenly stopped. He raised his head and looked towards the Miyun Pass about 3 li away. The 6,000 men behind him were all travel-worn, revealing exhausted expressions. One person riding 2 horses, both men and horses were exhausted. Logically speaking, under such circumstances, without at least half an hour of rest and reorganization, their combat strength definitely wouldn't recover to its peak state. The best divine steed under the heavens could roughly run 300 li in a day. The so-called 600 li or even 800 li of haste were all obtained through the exchange of horses at the relay stations and the huge price of not being held accountable for the deaths of people killed by the courier horses. In reality, the key to determining a cavalry's speed was the stamina of the cavalry's most inferior warhorse. Those famous long-distance raids were all built on the premise of harming the horses. To put it simply, they had to continuously run the weak supporting horses to death to ensure the warhorse's stamina and charging power on the battlefield. Otherwise, how could a cavalry that would be exhausted after 2 or 3 charges cause any damage to the enemy? Chapter 18:18. For this attack on the western regions, the Bailiang Protectorate and the Liuzhou Provincial Governor's Office both required him and the other cavalry to do their best to intercept Zhongtan's 10,000 cavalry, and force the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua behind him to enter the Qingcang main battlefield in Liuzhou as late as possible. Thus, in the final analysis, this interception battle did not require great results. It was just to buy time for the Yulwandao cavalry to penetrate deep into the enemy territory and the main Longxiang army. It was easy to fight, but it was also not easy to fight. The conservative way of fighting was to ignore the Mount Lantua infantry and monk soldiers. They only needed to endlessly tangle with Zhongtan's cavalry to open the way. In this way, the mission would be considered complete. But as the 2 cavalry forces traveled side by side, he proposed an extremely risky idea, a radical plan that would make it difficult for the 2 cavalry forces to fight. He originally thought that the young man nicknamed Chow Shorty and Wintermelon would resolutely reject the idea and bring up the idea of looking at the big picture. However, this young Bailiang cavalry general, who was fighting side by side with him for the first time, actually agreed without a second word. Not only that, he took the initiative to take on an even more suicidal mission. His reasoning was that Chow Wei had more men under his command and that General Chow's ability to lead and fight was greater. At the same time, he did not know whether to laugh or cry. At the same time, he also had a somewhat inexplicable feeling. When he was in Guangling Road, he was used to shouldering all the burdens alone. He was used to the heaviness of having tens or even hundreds of thousands of soldiers all tied to his shoulders. This battle, before it even began, made him feel very unfamiliar. He turned his head to look at the cavalry forces belonging to the 2 towns of Linyao and Fengxiang. Unconsciously, he reached out to grasp the warblade he had obtained not long ago, the 6th generation Su Dao. He had only begun to understand many things and details after truly coming to the northwest and entering the border army. For example, the warblade in his hand. It turned out that the cold blade had to be sharpened twice. The first time was to sharpen the blade in the workshop, and the second time was to kill and drink blood on the battlefield. Otherwise, if the war blade only had the first time, it could not be called a cold blade. Xie Shibian smiled. Bailiang was cold and bitter, but there were many things to pay attention to. But he liked it very much. The 6,000 cavalrymen behind him had a complicated background. Some of them were originally strong horse bandits who had ruled over the 2 towns, some were young and strong refugees from Liuzhou who had fought for their household registration, and some were Western region cavalrymen who had been roped in by the woman called Chai Dongdi. Accurately speaking, they were like Xie Shibian. Compared to the Baimang barbarians, the Bailiang frontier army, they were all fledglings. The people were like this, and the newly issued cold blades at their waists were even more so. Cutting off the heads of the northern Mang barbarians and using them as a blade to bleed and sharpen, it wasn't the slightest bit inferior to those beautiful Yanji County women. It was unknown who was the first person who said, Xie Shibian. Although his master was Chao Chongqing from West Chu, he was born in the streets and alleys of Xie Shibian. Naturally, he liked it very much. Xie Shibian's military orders were accurately passed down one by one. He divided the 6,000 cavalry into 3 groups according to their origins. The 2,500 cavalrymen from the 2 towns were the vanguard. They charged at Zhong Tan's cavalry that had appeared outside the Miyun exit. If they succeeded, the whole army would advance. If they failed, as long as they could stabilize their position and prevent the Beimang cavalry from successfully spreading out their formation outside the mountain pass, they would retreat after a small battle. The second group of 1,000 cavalrymen would take their place. Then, it would be Chai Dongdi's 2,000 cavalrymen who would retreat and advance. He personally led 500 Longxiang army elites to hold the line. Once the Beimang cavalry appeared, Xie Shibian would retreat. If there were any signs of them breaking out of the formation, Xie Shibian would order the 500 elite cavalrymen to block the exit of Miyun Pass, even if they died in battle. After parting ways with Chao Wei's 10,000 cavalry, the latter had already passed most of the crossbows and cavalry bows to Xie Shibian's cavalry. The best-case scenario would naturally be the elite cavalry of Zhongtan tribe bringing up the rear, while the ordinary cavalry would be the first to charge out of Mount Miyun. However, Xie Shibang believed that the young man, who relied on the mouth of the bottle gourd and the corpses of Crouching Bao and Luan He, 2 cities' northern Liang border army, to become Xia Jubo, would definitely not be this careless. Even if Zhongtan really did not live up to his name, Xie Shibian was even more confident that he would be able to take back the merit that he had missed out on. Xie Shibian and Zhongtan in the mountain pass gave the order at almost the same time. Then they said the exact same words. Change horses. Put on armor. After Chao Wei's 10,000 cavalrymen separated from Xie Shibian, they began a lightning-fast long-distance raid without caring about the injuries of the war horses. They directly went around Miyun Mountain Pass. He wanted to charge in through an entrance near the west end of Miyun Mountain Pass, and then quickly rush east along the mountain pass. In the end, he would be between Zhongtan's cavalry and Lantua Mountain's monk soldiers. He wanted to see if Xie Shibian's 6,000 cavalrymen could defend the east gate. He wanted to wait until he could viciously stab Zhongtan's cavalry in the ass. Therefore, when Chao Wei parted with Xie Shibian, he half-jokingly said, "Surnamed Xie, I, General Chao, will definitely become a man like old Liang Wang Su Shao. In the end, this time, my head is tied to your belt. Please don't let me die young." Xie Shibian did not say any heroic words at that time. He only nodded. When Xie Shibian saw the short general galloping away, he raised his arm and gave him a thumbs up. He did not know what kind of unique meaning Chao Wei had, or what kind of strange rules the Beiliang frontier army had. 10,000 cavalrymen rushed forward with great momentum. Chao Wei's lips were cracked and some blood seeped out. However, his face was full of smiles as he roared, "I want the Battle of Miyun Mountain Pass to be no less heroic than Lu Shengxiang's Battle of Luzhou in the snow and Chu Lushan's 1,000 cavalrymen opening Shu. Chao Wei can die, but I can't die a nameless death." Although Miyun Mountain Pass appeared to be narrowed, like a woman's slender waist, it was still able to allow more than 20 cavalrymen to rush out side by side. Previously, Xie Shibian could see several Beimang cavalrymen rushing back to the mountain pass to pass on military intelligence. The battle was about to start. However, Zhongtan's cavalry rushed out faster and fiercer than expected. As a result, the 50 cavalry in front of the Phoenix Legion and Linyao Legion were scattered in an instant. Even though Northern Liang's light crossbows and cavalry archers already fired in unison, arrows scattering towards the exit like rain, quickly shooting down 20 to 30 Northern Mang barbarians, the Northern Mang cavalry's overall momentum didn't decrease. Xie Shibian immediately changed his strategy, immediately ordering the 500 Longxiang army soldiers to charge forward. There were not enough corpses on both sides, far from enough to form a natural barrier. Xie Shibian stopped his horse half a mile away from the mountain pass. Beside him were dozens of personal guards and 6 messengers. He was not a fierce general who charged into battle. When he personally wiped out Liang Chuanqiu's old general Yan Zhenchuan, Xie Shibian also did not go up to kill the enemy. It was not that Xie Shibian did not have the courage to kill people in anger, but he knew that only a general who was alive to give out orders could lead an army to kill the enemy. Not only did Xie Shibian send those 500 elite cavalrymen to their deaths, he even gave a military order. If they fell off their horses and did not die, please do your best to kill the horses. Xie Shibian thought back to those resolute faces. After hearing this order, almost everyone's eyes were filled with pain. In the end, they all silently rode their horses away. After the 500 Longxiang elite cavalrymen rushed to the battlefield, Xie Shibian expressionlessly ordered the cavalry of the two towns to spread out in a semicircular formation. Once the 500 cavalry showed signs of retreating, or when there were only 50 cavalry left standing on the battlefield, they had to fire at Miyun Pass without distinguishing between friend and foe. The deputy generals of Lin Yao and Feng Xiang wanted to say something but stopped. They gritted their teeth and accepted the order. Then, Xie Shibian had Lin Yao and Feng Xiang open up a path for 20 cavalrymen to charge forward side by side at the top of the fan. He had 1,000 young vagabond cavalrymen get ready, gathering all the spears in the army and distributing them to these young vagabond cavalrymen. He also picked out 600 people who were good at archery to form an army in front of the fan between the two towns. Xie Shibian sat on his horse and looked at the battlefield that could not be any narrower. It was a weird battlefield where both men and horses died. Although he could not see the situation within Miyun Mountain Pass, he could imagine the dense iron armor squeezing together like a swarm of locusts, like a nest of ants. If the Fu Shui Room's report had a mistake, the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain did not need to be reorganized. They would have gathered together with Zhong Tan's cavalry. If Chao Wei's cavalry did not advance quickly enough, or if they appeared on the battlefield, they were already at the end of their rope. If Xie Shibian could not defend this pass, as long as one of those was true, then the Battle of Liuzhou would be in a terrible state. At this moment, for some reason, Xie Shibian thought back to that young man who always seemed to smile warmly. That young man who personally suggested to him to walk around and see more things. Xie Shibian took in a deep breath and muttered to himself in a voice that only he could hear. You left 500 seeds for to chew. How can I not repay you with my life? From today onwards, there was no more General de Chu Xie Shibian. Only the Beiliang Frontier Army Xie Shibian. Chapter 18-19. Outside Beiliang Pass, there was the sound of horse hooves. It was like the sound of an old chick, endless and had been ringing for 20 years. Inside the pass, there was the sound of reading. It was like the sound of an old phoenix. The sound of reading came from a new academy. In Liangzhou, there was a new White Horse Academy. Unlike the previous Green Deer Cave Academy, which was located in the mountains and forests, this academy was built in the downtown area of Liangzhou. Yao Baifeng, who had just returned from the capital, was the first head of the academy. Not only did the Qingliang Mountain Palace gift 6,000 scrolls, but the king of Beiliang, Su Fengnian, personally bestowed a plaque. Beiliang's Dao administrator Li Gongda, the new Liangzhou provincial governor Lu Dongjiang, and the Yuzhou provincial governor Huang Yan all personally gave books to the academy. For a time, the officials and nobles of Beiliang followed suit. This allowed the White Horse Academy to complete an unprecedented feat on the first day of the academy's establishment. There were 10,000 scrolls in the library. Thus, the library was named after 10,000 scrolls. At the same time, Yao Baifeng created a new sage hall in the academy, sculpting the statues of the sage of the Zhang family and the 10 sages and 36 sages. At the same time, Yao Baifeng set up a monument to start the academy. He emphasized that scholars entering the White Horse Academy should preach and seek benevolence. Therefore, he didn't teach the imperial exam's art, which was the foundation of the imperial exam. This was obviously contrary to the study of the imperial exam. Other than Yao Baifeng as the headmaster, the renowned White Lotus of Mount Longhu, Bai Yu, and the former provincial governor of Lingzhou, Su Beiji, were both deputy headmasters. The mountain master of Green Deer Cave Academy, Huang Shang, and other great Confucian scholars of the Central Plains, who had rushed to northern Liang to take root, also promised to come to White Horse Academy to give lectures on time. It was even rumored that Chancellor Wang, who had led thousands of scholars to northern Liang, had also promised to contact Shangyin Academy and promised to recommend a Mr. Ji Shang from Shangyin Academy, which was known as the source of all the scholars in the world, to teach in northern Liang. As a result, White Horse Academy, which originally only accepted 80 people, was flooded with people. They had no choice but to make an exception and recruit 200 young scholars. The number of local and foreign scholars in Beiliang was roughly the same. Lu Dongjiang, the official of Liangzhou's parents, was even more enthusiastic. Supporting the White Horse Academy was the first thing he did after taking office. He opened the door to all the affairs of the academy, and even treated the lecture hall of the academy as the official residence of the provincial governor. He went to the White Horse Academy every 2 or 3 days. He even allocated 600 acres of fertile land under the name of the Lu family, and gave it to the academy in the name of Liangzhou. This made the officials of Beiliang, who had a lot of complaints about the Lu family, look at the Lu family in a new light. Even the deputy administrator Song Dongming, who had been estranged from the Lu family, once again invited Lu Piao, who had once been famous for his calligraphy, to a private banquet. At the beginning of autumn, a carriage slowly drove to the downtown area of Liangzhou City. The carriage was very ordinary, and there were no retainers following it. The coachman was a middle-aged man who didn't look like a coachman. The curtain of the carriage was lifted slightly, and the man in the carriage quietly looked at the scene on the street. Some shops had changed their signs, and some stalls had disappeared. Some restaurants were still selling green ant wine, and some inns had taken over their father's business. When the carriage passed by a newly opened shop, the carriage slowly stopped. The coachman quietly waited for the owner's orders. He didn't dare to speak without permission, reminding the people of the academy that they were patiently waiting for his arrival. The young man holding the corner of the curtain looked at the shop. He remembered that every time he returned, he would go there to buy a big bag of spiced beef wrapped in oiled paper. He had met Miss Hehe there. At that time, he had never thought that the old owner of the shop was Xianxia. At that time, Hehe's strange big cat was still alive. He remembered that he had reunited with Miss East and West in this area. It was also the first time he saw the little monk from North and South, who wanted to become a Buddha and burn his saraira. There was also a monk from Mount Lantua who insisted that he go to the western region to dual cultivate with the white-clothed bodhisattva, who would become a goddess at the gate of Xiangfan City in the future. At that time, he thought that she was an old cow eating young grass. She was too shameless, and he was too disadvantaged, so he didn't agree. Later on, he regretted it so much that his intestines almost turned green. However, when he thought about it now, he just smiled and let it go. The female bodhisattva with a head full of black hair was different from the girl who he mistook as a banished immortal when he first met her when he traveled the Jianghu. These beautiful women, when they had the chance to get close to someone, they would lose their feelings of love. When they saw her, they would still think that she was pretty, but they didn't need to have her. When they didn't see her, they wouldn't miss her. He put down the curtain and said softly, "Steward Song, let's go to the White Horse Academy." Steward Song was the chief steward of the prince's mansion on Mount Qingliang in Beiliang. In Beiliang, he could be said to be the only one. The carriage stopped at the gate of the White Horse Academy. When Su Fengnian got off the carriage, he suddenly asked, "Are there not many assassins who broke into Mount Qingliang in recent years?" Song Yu stood respectfully beside the young lord. He bowed slightly and said calmly, "Your Highness, it's probably because those stupid Jianghu people have finally become enlightened. There hasn't been a single assassination in Mount Qingliang this year. It's very peaceful. Many people in the mansion are not used to it." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "It's indeed less fun to fish. By the way, it seems that there are also fewer wanderers who show up in public?" Song Yu laughed softly and said, "It's too difficult for the Jianghu masters to show off their skills in front of your highness." The White Horse Academy didn't mobilize a large force to welcome them. Su Fengnian stood on the street, looked up at the plaque of the White Horse Academy, and said with emotion, "I never thought that there would be a day when an academy would open in Liangzhou." Song Yu said, "It's all thanks to your highness. Not everyone in the world is blind or has their heart stuffed with lard. Justice is in everyone's heart." Su Fengnian nodded solemnly. "Song Yu, your flattery skills haven't dropped at all these years. Compared to other people's flattery, it's always better to be honest." Song Yu, who had followed his highness for as many years as Su Fengnian had been his highness, smiled brightly. He seemed to remember the absurd times when he was at his highness's beck and call. Song Yu's flattery skills hadn't decreased, and in recent years, his temperament had improved even more. In addition, he was familiar with the temperament of this young lord, so he wasn't dissatisfied with the White Horse Academy's lack of activity. Naturally, he wouldn't do such a boring thing. Besides, he knew better than anyone that the leader of the Beiliang cavalry next to him had been very kind to the scholars in recent years. Otherwise, this White Horse Academy wouldn't be able to be established. There were not many rich and powerful vassals in the Liang dynasty, but there were quite a few of them, like the audacious Zhao Bing, the prince of Yanqi, or Zhao Yi, the prince of Guangling, who used to be at the height of his power. Who could make those learned scholars gather together and teach in their territory? Jinggon Circuit had the Green Party in the imperial court, and it was in the hinterland of the Central Plains, which was close to the Shangyin Academy. But they still couldn't establish a decent academy. Song Yu glanced at the scene around the carriage. In fact, in addition to their carriage, there were 4 or 5 other carriages, which also didn't show the style of the rich and powerful. Song Yu knew that in addition to the lord, there were actually 6 or 7 generals who came to the academy at the same time. It was not a coincidence. Under the proposal of the deputy headmaster of the White Horse Academy, Su Beiji, every once in a while, they would invite the generals to teach the scholars about the battlefield. Not to mention that this had never happened in other academies, perhaps even in the ancestor of the World Academy, the Shangyin Academy, there had never been such a strange thing. In the eyes of the scholars, they were just boorish men. How could they reason with the scholars? Although these carriages didn't look amazing, the horses were all plump and expensive horses. To be precise, if they were placed in the Beiliang Frontier Army, they were either the best or the second best. Because they were originally from the 2 pastures in Beiliang, Xianli and Tianjing, but they were not supplied to the border army through special channels. For this kind of thing, whether it was the old King Liang Su Xiao or the new King Liang, who was next to Song Yu, they all turned a blind eye and never looked into it. Those old generals, who had spent most of their lives on the battlefield, had more than 10 good horses at home after they retired. What was wrong with that? It was said that among the old generals of Beiliang who came to visit the White Horse Academy today, there were 2 senior deputy commanders, Wei Taizhan and Lu Yuanji, who had returned to the border army not long ago but didn't have any actual power for the time being. The 7 or 8 generals, who had all been exposed to the smoke of war, were the first batch of old soldiers that Su Beiji invited to the White Horse Academy with great hospitality. It was true that in the current Beiliang officialdom, especially the civil officials, perhaps only the 2 young officials, Su Beiji and Chen Shiliang, could invite these old guys. Even the administrator, Li Gongda, couldn't do it. Even the nominal deputy administrator, Song Dongming, who was in fact the leader of the civil officials in Beiliang, couldn't do it. As for the relative of the emperor, Lu Dongjiang, the provincial governor of Liangzhou, couldn't do it either. Because if one were to say something harsh, in fact, among the civil and military officials in Beiliang, only these 2 young people were the true ministers of the emperor. Iron Buddha General Ning Amei, Yuzhou General Huang Fuqiu, and the infantry deputy commander, Great Ancestor Gu, were still inferior to these 2. The backbone of the White Horse Academy was actually not the literary grandmaster of Liang, Yao Baifeng, but Su Beiji, who had successfully retired from the position of the provincial governor of Lingzhou. Song Yu, as the former steward of Wutong'an and now the chief steward of the entire Mount Qingliang, was of course the young lord's trusted aide. The most important thing was that Song Yu was still young, in his early 40s. If there were no accidents, he wouldn't have the opportunity to be a senior official of the Su family for 3 dynasties in the Beiliang. It was easy to imagine how important his position was. This had nothing to do with whether this man was an official or not. Even the gatekeeper of the prime minister was a 3rd-grade official, let alone the chief steward of a king's mansion. Therefore, Song Yu was very satisfied and grateful to the Su family. Song Yu slowed down slightly and followed Su Fengnian to the White Horse Academy. Chapter 1820. A young scholar in a green robe hurriedly walked out of the gate of the White Horse Academy. He looked around and was slightly stunned when he saw Su Fengnian and Song Yu. He was a scholar from Huainan who had recently studied at the academy. He was not one of the people who had followed Chancellor Wang to the grave. His ancestors were classmates with Yao Baifeng. They had studied together under Mr. Wang Yuan in Shanglua County. Because of this, his grandfather asked this grandson to come to Liangzhou when he heard that Yao Baifeng was hosting the White Horse Academy again. Because of his honest and gentle personality and profound family knowledge, the old Yao Baifeng asked this young man to help him with some trivial matters. Today, when the group of Beiliang military leaders came to visit, it was mostly him who led people into the academy. The White Horse Academy also received the news from Mount Qingliang at the last minute that the Lord was coming. This was naturally a big deal for the young scholar. However, the attitude of Yao Baifeng and Su Beiji made him a little confused. They were indifferent and only told him to lead the way when he saw the Lord. However, the young scholar was inevitably troubled. He didn't know the young lord, but he soon felt relieved. Presumably, when a powerful lord of Liang came out, it would be amazing. To be honest, he was very curious about the legendary young lord and also somewhat admired him. There was a popular saying in the Central Plains, Southern Song Dynasty and Northern Su Dynasty. It was said that West Chu Song Yushu's splendid articles and Beiliang Su Fengnian's charm and bearing were both peerless in the world. It was quite like Southern Xie and Northern Li, in the spring and autumn period. The young scholar looked at the man in a white robe with only one retinue. His intuition told him that the man in front of him was most likely Su Fengnian. However, how could such a simple person be the lord of Beiliang cavalry, who had successfully stirred up the general trend of the world? Su Fengnian went up the steps and saw a simple wooden frame at the door. A string of exquisite jade hooks was tied to the horizontal railing to hang the swords. Su Fengnian had once promised Mount Master Huang Shang when the Green Deer Cave Academy was first established that no matter which martial artist of Beiliang wanted to enter the Beiliang Academy, no matter their official rank, they would have to take off their swords. At this time, there were 7 Beiliang swords hanging on the wooden frame. Battle swords with jade hooks hanging on the wooden frame. Su Fengnian walked in front of the wooden frame and looked at the battle swords. Most of them were old, and not a single one was the newest Su 6 swords. One of the battle swords had a severely worn scabbard. It could even be called a unique first-generation Su family sword. Even in Mount Qingliang, there was not a single first-generation Su sword. Even though Su Xiao had sent people to the Central Plains to buy such battle swords at a high price, there were still no results. This was because the first-generation Su swords were not forged in large quantities. There were no more than 7,000 of them. Secondly, the conditions at the time were harsh and the forging process was very crude. This resulted in the battle swords not being of good quality. Many of them were damaged on the battlefield and could not withstand more than a few battles. At that time, Su Xiao had led his troops on expeditions everywhere and fought many bitter battles. He was even worse than a stray dog. He did not even know whether he could survive or not. He was used to the life of fighting. As for whether the sword was forged by himself or not, it really did not matter. It should be known that during the war, even Su Xiao himself had directly taken off the enemy's armor on the battlefield and put it on himself. When Su Xiao was alive, he only liked to brag to Su Fengnian about his great achievements. He said that he had won many battles and defeated many famous generals in the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn. However, he never told Su Fengnian about how many hardships he had suffered in those years. He did not even mention a word about it. Many of these things were heard by Su Fengnian a long time later when he chatted with people like Chu Lushan and Yuan Zuozong. Sometimes, Su Fengnian would also think that if he had children in the future, he would also have the opportunity to wait for them to grow up slowly. Probably like Su Xiao, he would only tell them that their father had defeated many martial arts masters in his life, but would not tell them how many injuries and how much blood he had lost in those life-and-death battles. Father and son in the world were generally like this. I have never been a father, so I don't know the hardships of my father. When Su Fengnian slowly took off the sword at his waist, he turned to look at Song Yu and asked with a smile, "Steward Song, will your twins who have just turned 10 years old be tired of your nagging?" Hearing such a question out of the blue, Song Yu, who was extremely clever, was still a little unprepared. But soon he smiled and said, "Of course, every time I tell the 2 children how many great figures their father has seen, they always snort at me and want to cover their ears. But when I tell them about the great deeds of the Lord, even if they have heard it too many times, they will still enjoy it." Chapter 1821. Su Fengnian had seen this pair of beautiful siblings a few times in Mount Qingliang. Different from the elder brother who was already an official and the second sister who was married to Ling Zhou, they were lively and naughty. They liked to run up and down the mountain. It was said that they had a good relationship with the young lady that Chen Shiliang brought from Gongnam-du, Huyen Daguan's daughter, and the little green robe that Yu Groom left in the prince's mansion. They often played together. Once, Su Fengnian was walking on the long embankment in the middle of the lake alone in the morning. A group of children were squatting by the lake stealthily, fishing for carps with the crude fishing rods they made themselves. There were already 4 or 5 fat carps in the small wooden basin. As a result, he bumped into them. He deliberately coughed from afar. Song Yu's youngest son immediately overturned the wooden basin, told everyone to throw the fishing rods into the lake, and then ran away. Su Fengnian, who didn't know whether to laugh or cry, could only help these troublemakers retrieve the fishing rods and wooden basins from the lake and stay where they were. The carps in Tide Hark Lake had an extraordinary origin. They came from a natural pond at the top of a mountain in Liaodong. In the eyes of Qi cultivators, these carps were not ordinary creatures. They were born with golden scales and carried the luck of the mortal world. The carps in Tide Hark Lake were said to be worth 10 gold per tael. They had always been the dream of Beiliang's civil officials. The generals who followed Su Xiao in the early years were all uncouth and had no interest in these things. Yan Jieshi, who had not betrayed Beiliang and went to Great Peace City at that time, also disdained to ask for them. Only Li Gongda shamelessly asked Su Xiao for a few. Su Xiao waved his hand and said that he would catch as many as he could and bring them home. At that time, Li Gongda, who was already the military governor of Feng province, really went to catch them himself. In the end, he caught 7 or 8 carps and brought them back to his own pond. It was said that the pond already had 100 carps. Of course, Su Fengnian and Li Hanlin both knew that Li Gongda would smile from ear to ear every time he looked at the pond, not because he liked those carps, but because those carps were all living silver. When the young scholar heard this conversation, he was shocked. He couldn't believe that the young man in front of him was really the king of Beiliang. He was the one who led the Beiliang cavalry to block the million-strong army of Bei Mang. After Su Fengnian removed the cold saber from his waist, he gently hung it on a jade hook at the edge of the shelf on the left. It was unknown whether it was a coincidence or not, but in this way, all 6 generations of the Su family's war sabers were gathered. The young scholar was a little frightened. He quickly bowed and said, "Dai Yuanjie of Fengtang County greets the king." Su Fengnian said in surprise, "Fengtang County of Ji Province? Who is Mr. Jiaowen to you? Are you the distant grandson of the Dai family?" Dai Yuanjie was even more surprised. He hadn't expected that a grand vassal king would have heard of his grandfather. Their Dai family had once been a wealthy and influential family of the old northern Han. For the past 300 years, the family's descendants had been ranked according to the 8 characters: indifferent and clear aspiration, tranquil and distant. When it came to Dai Yuanjie's generation, it just happened to be the distant character. However, the Dai family was the same as many other wealthy families of the spring and autumn period. Following the conclusion of that unjust battle, the Dai family had fallen into decline. The family's descendants scrupulously followed the rules set by Mr. Jiaowen, studying but not becoming an official. The Dai family's library, the 800 Iron Sword Library, was one of the 6 great libraries of the spring and autumn period. In particular, it collected over 100 types of rare books, as well as innumerable copies and copies. After the old northern Han was destroyed by Su Zhao's troops, the Dai family's library, which had always been open to outsiders, was no longer open to the public. Even the family's descendants couldn't rashly enter the library to read. This well-learned young scholar raised his head and replied with a stern expression, "It is my ancestor." Su Fengnian's expression was somewhat awkward. Half of the Tide Listening Pavilion's rare books were extorted from the 800 Iron Sword Library by our Su family. If you have come to Beiliang to ask for those books, I will have someone organize them and do my best to return them to you. This was the first time Dai Yuanjie had heard of this secret. His grandfather had never mentioned this matter to him. For a moment, he was even more embarrassed than Su Fengnian. He was just a weak scholar. How could he have the courage to come to Beiliang and settle accounts with this northwestern vassal king? Su Fengnian smiled and said, "The books will only be collecting dust in the Tide Listening Pavilion. It would be better to return them to your Dai family. However, let me say this first. The books can be returned, but the prerequisite is that your Dai family library must not keep them to yourself. You must open them to the descendants of other clans and scholars from other places. You can first discuss this matter with teacher Jiaowen. Of course, this is a presumptuous request. Teacher Jiaowen might not agree, but it won't affect your studies at White Horse Academy. You, Dai Yuanjie, can relax. If it really doesn't work out, I will gift those books to White Horse Academy under your Dai family's name. You can also mention this matter to teacher Jiaowen in your family letter." After weighing the pros and cons, Dai Yuanjie felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He bowed once more and said with great admiration, "Your Highness is magnanimous." Su Fengnian couldn't help but laugh. He held back some of the words he was about to say. In truth, Su Xiao had relied on knives to borrow the books back then. It was only because the Su family still had hundreds of thousands of knives that the matter of returning the books had become so voluminous. In truth, the Su family was in the wrong in this matter. It was just that Su Fengnian didn't want to talk about this with a descendant of the Dai family. No matter how good a book was, if no one read it, it might seem valuable, but it was actually the least valuable. However, Su Fengnian had also heard many strange words from Huang Longshi from Miss Hehe. This Huang Xianxia had said that the scholars of the future would be too relaxed about studying. They would instead pay less attention to the painstaking efforts of the predecessors. As a result, there would be the helpless sigh of "the ancients have already explained everything." Su Fengnian followed the young scholar into White Horse Academy. The young scholar glanced back for no reason. That wooden frame. After the spring and autumn period. The 6 Knives of the Su Family. Arranged here. Chapter 1822. The White Horse Academy was built according to the old system of having a lecture hall in the middle and a study hall on the left and right. The 300 scholars lived in the 60 study halls on the east and west sides. There were only 19 teachers teaching in the academy all year round, including Yao Baifeng and Su Beiji. The vice headmaster Bai Yu still needed to take charge of the official affairs on Mount Qingliang. However, the academy planned to invite more than 20 temporary lecturers this autumn and winter. There was a long list of names, enough to be described as a spectacular lineup. There was Huang Shang, the head of the Green Deer Cave Academy, Song Yan, the new provincial governor of Yuzhou who advocated legalism, Wang Shihua, the great scholar of Huangnam County who was praised by Yao Baifeng as one of the 3 talents of provincial governors, Chang Sui, the eldest brother who once studied under Han Guzi in the Shangyin Academy together with Su Weisheng, Su Huang, and others. It was said that there was also Yu Yuwei, the master of music who was currently serving as the teacher of Ji Shang in the Shangyin Academy. Su Fengnian walked slowly with Dai Yuanjie and finally stopped in front of the library. Yao Baifeng, Lu Yuanji, and Wei Tai's Han, these meritorious old generals sat together to bask in the sun, while Su Beiji led a group of young scholars of the academy to bask in the sun. Yao Baifeng, who had stepped down from the position of chancellor of the Imperial College, looked hale and hearty, unlike the rumors of Liang Imperial Court, who had resigned due to illness. In fact, even Su Fengnian didn't know why Yao Baifeng would take the initiative to leave Graydon City, and why he didn't spend the rest of his life in the capital, but instead returned to Beiliang. It should be known that the Yao Family Academy was reputed to be able to compete with the entire Imperial College. Although this was an exaggeration, no one doubted Yao Baifeng's lofty reputation in the literary circles of Liang. In fact, in the past few years in Graydon City, Yao Baifeng was almost the only one who was willing to speak up for Beiliang's military and political affairs in the imperial court. Su Fengnian believed that if he hadn't disobeyed the emperor of the Zhao family, then with Yao Baifeng's reputation and knowledge, he would have long been able to rise to the center of power in Liang, standing shoulder to shoulder with Huan Wen, Zhao Yuling, and Yin Mao Chun, instead of staying in the imperial college that had a clear reputation but no real power. Moreover, after Yao Baifeng had followed Yan Jieshi into the capital to become an official, many of the Yao family's younger generation followed suit. Now that Yao Baifeng had chosen to enter the White Horse Academy in Beiliang, even Su Fengnian felt a little worried for the old man. So much so that when he was discussing matters with Song Dongming on Mount Qingliang, Su Fengnian suggested that Yao Baifeng could only be a lecturer and not be the dean, in order to help the old man reduce the rumors in the Liang imperial court. As the prime minister chosen by Yuan Benqi in the past, Song Dongming, who was well aware of the deep and shallow waters of Liang's officialdom, also supported this idea. However, in the end, Yao Baifeng still tactfully refused. He jokingly said, "I'm not young, I'd rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a phoenix." He insisted on personally becoming the head of the academy. Mount Qingliang, or rather, Su Fengnian, couldn't dissuade this venerable scholar, and could only let Yao Baifeng take charge of the White Horse Academy. Seeing Su Fengnian's arrival, Lu Yuanji and Wei Tai's Han, the 2 deputy commanders of the Beiliang Frontier Army in the early years, did not dare to take advantage of their seniority and immediately stood up to welcome him. This was especially so for Lu Yuanji, who was unaware of the fact that the younger generation of his family had run amok in the countryside. On the eve of Su Fengnian's succession, Lu Yuanji had been scolded by his former colleague, Lin Dofeng, to the nose. Fuming with anger, Lu Yuanji rushed back to his mansion and the first thing he did was to summon all of his unfilial descendants, who were all respectful in front of him, to the ancestral hall. With an attitude that showed that he was not afraid to kill the wrong person, he made all of the younger generation of the Lu family kneel on the ground and personally whipped each of them 100 times with a leather whip. 7 or 8 people fainted on the spot, dripping with blood. The women of the Lu family outside the ancestral hall were so scared that they did not even dare to cry out loud. When 3 of the 7 stewards of the Tianfu were beaten to death, the study companions of the younger generation of the Lu family all packed up and left. From then on, the Lu family became very strict. Lu Yuanji even closed his door and refused to see any guests. It was not until the commander of the left cavalry, He Zhong, suddenly sent word to him that he and his old men were to return to the frontier army that Lu Yuanji finally showed his face. Otherwise, this old general probably did not plan to have any dealings with his former comrades in this lifetime. These generals of Beiliang, who had experienced the wars of the spring and autumn period, had made great contributions, were unruly and difficult to tame, and refused to be restrained. This was naturally the truth. However, there was one thing that was different from many of the founding heroes of Liang, and that was, they harbored an indescribable and deep-rooted complex toward the Su family, or rather, toward Su Shao. If Yan Zhenchuan, Yang Shenxing, and Ma Lulong, these great generals of Liang helped the old emperor to conquer the Su family's country, then Yan Wenluan, Wei Taizhan, and Lu Yuanji, these valiant generals, followed Su Shao to conquer the Su family's country. The difference of one word was like the difference between heaven and earth. It was very simple. Su Shao shared weal and woe with them, went into battle together, and fought together. There was not only the friendship between a ruler and his subject, but also the brotherhood of fellow soldiers who exchanged their lives for his. In the imperial court, it was difficult to understand, and it was the hardest to see the true heart. On the battlefield, in the moment of life and death, it was the easiest to see one's nature. Before and after the infamous Su Fengnian became the king of Beiliang, undercurrents surged. The original commander of the cavalry, Zhong Honggu, was killed. In private, it was said that it was not killing the chicken to warn the monkeys, but killing the tiger to warn the wolves. From this, it could be seen how swift and fierce the atmosphere in Beiliang was. When Su Fengnian led the Lingzhou generals as the heir, even if Su Shao was still alive and controlled the Lingzhou officialdom, there was still that disturbance. After Su Fengnian greeted everyone, he saw the old soldier of the Lotus Seed Camp, Lin Dofeng, and suddenly realized that the Su family's first-generation warblade must have been this one-armed old man's treasure. He remembered that in the early years, Su Shao had mentioned it many times, saying that if there was still a first-generation Su Dao in the world today, it would most likely be the one that he personally gave to Lin Dofeng as a token of the marriage between the two families. However, later on, Lin Dofeng did not have any children. After this first-generation general of the Lotus Seed Camp became disheartened, he also disappeared without a trace in Beiliang, so the marriage could only be cancelled. The current general of the White Feather Light Cavalry, Yuan Nanting, was from the Lotus Seed Camp. That time, when 600 old soldiers came to the capital to send His Royal Highness off, Lin Dofeng, Yuan Nanting, and the current commander of the Right Cavalry, Jean Partridge Zhoukong, had both appeared. Dai Yuanjie brought over 2 chairs for Su Fengnian and Song Yu. After Su Fengnian took the chairs, he did not rightfully occupy Yao Baifeng's seat in the middle. He just casually placed them next to Lin Dofeng and sat down. As for the head housekeeper of Mount Qingliang, Song Yu, he simply did not take the chairs. He smiled and shook his head in refusal, holding his breath and standing in the distance with rapt attention. Yao Baifeng took all of this in. He smiled slightly, and then his expression turned serious. He went straight to the point and asked, "Your Highness, may I ask if Mount Qingliang has interfered with the incident in Guangling Road Spring Snow Building?" The sun of early autumn was warm and gentle, but after Yao Baifeng threw out this question, even Lin Dofeng, Wei Taizhan, and the other old generals felt their hearts palpitate. Their originally leisurely sitting postures instantly became stiff and tense. Su Fengnian's expression was as usual. He gently shook his head and smiled. "I would like to have some connections, but unfortunately I don't." Yao Baifeng stared at the young vassal king's slightly long and narrow eyes, speechless for a long time. It seemed that he did not catch the clues that he had expected. The old man sighed and said to himself, "The signs of a chaotic world. After only a short 20 years of peace, how did it degenerate into such a situation?" Su Fengnian's expression was still tranquil. He asked with a slight smile, "Does Mr. Yao think that other than the Mang border where the smoke of war is rising everywhere, even the Central Plains is in turmoil and chaos?" Yao Baifeng was stunned, and then he smiled bitterly. "Your Highness, there is no need to be so sarcastic. This old man asks himself and has never felt that for the stability of the Central Plains, the Beiliang soldiers should die at the border." Chapter 1823. Su Fengnian pondered for a moment, then slowly said, "Today's chaos in the Central Plains is hard for the imperial court to absolve itself from the blame. Liang removing the feudal vassals and suppressing the power of the local generals are 2 things in the right direction, but the specific methods used are too cruel. For example, Yan Zhenchuan and Yang Shenxing, these old men who hold military power, are undoubtedly loyal to the Zhao clan. And that Zhao Ying, the Duke of Huainan, actually didn't need to die on the battlefield at all. On the contrary, these people are the source of Li Yang's vitality. Letting them die of old age and illness, although sloppy, is far better than using a deliberate Guangling war to cleanly seize power from the dead. Also, the civil and military officials of Liang are not fools. If my father's evil title is still within the acceptable range, then the old Grand Secretary Jianghu's failing in his old age is especially bitterly disappointed. The current son of heaven can't be called a fatuous ruler, he should be called a ruler of resurgence. All kinds of measures, such as building a new pavilion, making an exception to promote Yan Zhenchuan, and so on, can be considered to have greatly comforted the civil and military officials of the imperial court. Unfortunately, there are some things that as a subject, Zhang Julu can do well, but as a ruler, Zhao Zhuan may not be able to do well. At the very least, he doesn't have enough time. Su Fengnian calmly said, "Now the chaos in the Central Plains, where is the chaos? It's just the chaos in the people's hearts." Zhao Ying, the Duke of Huainan, died with a grudge. Zhao Sui, the Duke of Jiaodong, retreated gloomily. The King of Jing'an, Zhao Sun, trembling with fear, took Meitaian City. The Duke of Guangling, Zhao Yi, tarnished his own reputation to seek hereditary succession. Then the Duke of Yanqi, Zhao Bing, marching north is also within reason. The military generals of Liang, not to mention those old men like Yan Yang, among the younger generation Lu Shengxiang, Kainan, Tang Taizuang, and so on, I believe these people also have some indescribable hidden pain. If Zhang Julu hadn't died, even if he had already left the imperial court and retreated far away from Jianghu, or even if he didn't end up losing his reputation, the Central Plains definitely wouldn't be in chaos today. Yao Baifeng's face was filled with pain as he said with a trembling voice, "No matter what, the people are innocent." Wei Taizhan shook his head slightly while Lu Yuanji rolled his eyes. These Bailiang veterans who had survived piles of corpses all snorted disdainfully at this scholarly attitude. Su Fengnian said calmly, "Ever since the founding of the Great Qin Empire, for the past 800 years, there have been constant wars. Which dynasty's people are not innocent?" Moreover, the teacher's words of "no matter what" were too understated. Even if the Emperor Zhao Zhuan had thousands of excuses, as long as he was still sitting on the dragon throne, this disaster would have to be borne by him. Just like how I, Su Fengnian, blocked the Beimang's horse hooves and didn't allow them to drive straight into the Central Plains, I don't care if the imperial court doesn't care about my good intentions. If I couldn't block them and lost the Second Battle of Liangmang, I wouldn't care if I was cursed in the annals of history or if the people of the Central Plains were to curse me behind my back. Su Beiji, who was crouching not far away and flipping through books to dry them, turned his head and coughed heavily. He said unhappily, "These big words, bullshit, and unlucky words, don't say too much. You, the king of Bailiang, don't care, but I, Su Beiji, do. Also, Teacher Yao is the dean of our White Horse Academy, so you'd better be more polite." Su Fengnian was speechless and somewhat deflated. Yao Baifeng laughed loudly and said happily, "It's fine, it's fine. Today, your highness is willing to say these unpleasant words. This old man whose neck is buried in the yellow earth is very happy, very happy." Lu Yuanji chuckled and said, "Of course. Our prince is a true Bailiang man. An honest man. He's never said the bullshit bureaucratic words of the Liang imperial court." Lin Dofang laughed and scolded, "Your highness's ancestral home is Jinzhou of Liaodong. Moreover, you weren't born in Bailiang. You, Lu Laosen, have flattered countless times in your life, but you've never been able to show your face." Lu Yuanji wasn't afraid of the heavens or the earth, and he respected and didn't fear General Su Shao. He was only afraid of Lin Dofang, his old brother who had gone through fire and water with him. Otherwise, in the entire Bailiang, only Lin Dofang had rewarded Lu Yuanji with a few punches. If it weren't for Wei Taizhan and the others desperately stopping him, Lu Yuanji would probably have been kicked countless times. Wei Taizhan wanted to say something but stopped. Su Fengnian's eyes were sharp. He said gently, "Old General Wei, if you have something to say, say it." Wei Taizhan gritted his teeth and asked in a low voice, "Your Highness, is our Bailiang really going to rely on those young people? Are we going to leave the 300,000 cavalry and the survival of Bailiang to the war in Liuzhou?" This time, it was Yao Baifeng's turn to cough. He secretly threw a glance at Su Beiji. After all, the scholars of the academy who were drying books nearby were all crooks and honest folk. They had to be careful when dealing with matters at the border. Su Fengnian waved his hand and smiled. "It's fine. Talking about this now won't reveal military matters." Su Fengnian looked straight at Wei Taizhan. "Before Xie Shibian left for Liuzhou, he asked me a question in private. Do you hope that the 300,000 cavalry of Bailiang will all die in battle outside the pass and then wait with a clear conscience and regret for the fall of Bailiang's 4 prefectures? Or should I take a gamble? Maybe I'll bear the infamy of 1,000 years and be scolded as a border protector who doesn't understand military affairs but is greedy for merit and advance rashly, and be regarded as a classic example of an armchair strategist by the historians of the later generations, fighting for a chance of survival for northern Liang? The group of old generals fell into deep thought. Lin Dufang was the first to come back to his senses. With a serious expression he said, "If your highness says so, then I didn't come here in vain. When I go back, I'll drink 2 pounds of green ant wine. I'll put aside my stomach full of curses for now. If I lose, I'll go to Mount Qingliang's steel forest and point at that tombstone. I'll pick up the things in my stomach and curse again." Lu Yuanji said resentfully, "Lin Dufang, you're cursing your highness like that?" Lin Dufang said fiercely, "Since you're the king of Beiliang, and you have the world's strongest elite troops, then it's natural for you to win a great battle. In the past, the general even conquered half of the Central Plains. Why can't your highness stop the Beimang barbarians now?" Yao Baifeng's face was filled with disbelief. Was there such a logic in the world? Su Beiji gloated, "Old General Lin's words are sincere." Wei Taizhan, who had the most peaceful temperament, hurriedly tried to smooth things over. "Old Lin, we haven't even drunk yet. Why are you already talking about drunken talk? Your highness, don't lower yourself to the same level as this stubborn bull. Old Lin has a sharp tongue but a soft heart. In fact, among us old fellows, when we're not in front of your highness, he's the one who protects your highness the most." Lin Dufang, who was exposed, glared at Wei Taizhan. Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes and smiled sincerely. He joked, "Old General Wei, I know. After all, old General Lin almost became my father-in-law. It would be strange if he doesn't side with me." Lu Yuanji said, "Your highness is so handsome. Look at old Lin's ugly appearance. Even if he has a daughter, she's definitely not good enough for your highness." Lin Dofang, who had long been accustomed to punching and kicking Lu Yuanji in his military life, almost wanted to kick Lu Laosan, who had nothing good to say. However, the young lord and Yao Baifeng were present, so he managed to hold himself back. Su Fengnian suddenly said softly, "Mr. Yao, I have a suggestion. Can the White Horse Academy arrange for some scholars to go to the private schools in the villages outside Liangzhou City regularly to give lectures to the poor children? The content of the lectures doesn't need to be too detailed. First, it won't delay the scholars' studies in the academy. Second, the children won't understand the profound content. Because I hope that the future scholars in Beiliang can understand the local customs of the Central Plains as early as possible. I hope that they will know that there are many strange things in the world outside their hometown of Beiliang. I hope that they will have the ambition to read thousands of books and travel thousands of miles. Therefore, the scholars of the academy can give lectures at will. Even if it's just casually telling the children about the local food of the Central Plains, it will be fine." Su Fengnian was silent for a moment and said tentatively, "Maybe it's a little overkill. If the scholars of the academy are not willing to do it, I can give the Tide Listening Pavilion's collection of books as a reward for the lectures." As soon as the words came out, Yao Baifeng was in a daze and didn't say anything for a long time. In the open space in front of the library, the young scholars helping to dry the books in the autumn sunshine might not be able to hear the content of the conversation, but everyone could see the scene. An old scholar sat at the head of the table with a clear conscience. The generals of Beiliang who had killed countless people sat on his left and right. A king who had the power of 300,000 cavalrymen sat quietly on the edge. Then, the young people saw another scene. The Confucian grandmaster who had students all over the world slowly stood up and bowed respectfully to the young king. He lowered his head with tears in his eyes and said in a trembling voice, "I, Yao Baifeng from the White Horse Academy, greet the king of Beiliang on behalf of all the scholars of Beiliang." Chapter 1824. Today, since the opening of the Great Peace City Spiritual Cultivation Hall, it welcomed a small court meeting with the most people. Head of the Secretariat Qi Yonglong, Assistant Minister of the Secretariat Zhao Yuling, Assistant Minister of the Secretariat Huan Wen, Assistant Minister of the Manxia Province Huan Wen, Assistant Minister of the Left Scattered Cavalry Chen Wang, Minister of the Ministry of Personnel Yin Mao Chun, Minister of the Ministry of War and General of the Southern Expedition Wu Zhongshuan, Grand Secretary of the Hall of Wuying Wen Shoren, Grand Secretary of the Cavern Pavilion Yen Jeshi, Commandery, Prince of Chongshan Zhao Yang, Duke of Yen Country Gao Shizhi, Marquis of Huayang Song Downing, Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War Tang Tai Huang, Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights Jean Lanting, and so on. The former Qingzhou General Hong Lingshu, who had been transferred to the capital to receive the title of General Pacifying the South, the current Jidushi Kainan of the Tu Huai Dao, the administrator Han Lin, and Lu Shengxiang and Su Gong, who had gone to Jizhou to take charge of the northern border defense, were all unfamiliar faces. They were all gathered in one place, the civil and military resplendent. After leaving court, the young emperor of Liang, Zhao Zhuan, changed into a set of casual clothing from the Jiangnan Weaving Bureau. Although it was not as glorious and majestic as the court and auspicious clothing, it had the unique charm of Jiangnan. The central plains were plunged into chaos. The hundreds of thousands of elites that had left Nanjiang were like a hot knife through butter. They passed through 4 provinces, sweeping everything before them, and crossed the Guangling River almost without any resistance. In the capital of the Old West Chu, they faced off against the Liang Imperial Court north and south. The spring snow building incident caused the careful planning of the court in Guangling Dao to go down the drain. Not only were the 2 civil and military leaders of Guangling Dao prisoners, more importantly, a large group of Liang generals and officials who surrendered to the juncture of West Chu were all controlled. This caused Zhao Zhuan to almost completely take over Guangling Dao without any bloodshed. The good situation that Wu Zhongshuan, Lu Shengxiang, and Yan Zhenchuan had worked so hard to build up, became a wedding dress for someone else. Guangling Dao was once again corrupted. It could even be said that in one night, Zhao Zhuan almost owned half of the country. It was just that whether it was the morning court at the Wuying Hall or the small court meeting at the Recuperation Hall, the young emperor was not as flustered and exasperated as the Liang officials imagined. Not only was he calm and composed, he even did his best to conceal it and still revealed an appearance of eagerness. It was clear that this young literati emperor still had the valiant blood of the previous Zhao rulers flowing in his bones. At this time, the Zhao clan's emperor had in his hands an edict issued by a traitor to the world. The content was treacherous, listing the various crimes that he, the new Liang ruler, had committed after ascending the throne, including nepotism, unfair rewards and punishments, using traitorous officials, and internal strife within the Zhao clan. There were a total of 10 major crimes. The young emperor gently put down the edict and raised his head with a smile. It is said that this item is the work of that Song clan's eldest grandson? Northern Su, Southern Song, and Southern Song, Song clan descendant Song Yushu. His literary talent was outstanding, and even the great Peace City officials had long heard of him. Tantanon, who had once personally praised Song Yushu, shot a glance at the inscribed board in the Recuperation Hall. Then, he opened his mouth and said with a smile, "This kid can only write this kind of article full of hostility in the hands of an ordinary man like Zhao Bing. It is a pity that he is an unpolished piece of jade. If he had taken up a post in the Liang Imperial Academy or one of the newly established 6 pavilions, he would definitely be able to write an article that would be immortalized for generations to come. Not only would he be able to help the people, but he would also be able to secure a place in the literary world." The young emperor nodded. "It is a bit of a pity. Not long ago, I promised Attendant Yen that I would definitely recommend this Song clan jade tree born in Jiangnan scholarly circles. I reckon it will be delayed for a while." The Attendant Yen that the emperor spoke of was, of course, the new noble of the Imperial Academy, Yen Qiji. Currently, the Imperial Academy had recently built 6 new offices in the 6 departments of the Xianxia province. Servants of all ages were assigned to different classes to prevent the most noble officials of Liang, who were regarded as the prime minister, from becoming a chatterbox. Yen Qiji was temporarily in charge of the affairs of the 6 departments. Although he did not have the title of an official, his path of advancement was already very clear. Compared to the first 3 who had taken up posts in the 6 departments, Li Jifu, Gao Tingshu, and Wu Congxian, Yen Qiji was already showing signs of gaining the upper hand after striking. And the words of the young emperor revealed too many things that were worth thinking about. Other than the obvious intimacy he showed to his brother-in-law, Yen Qiji, the fate of the Guangling Path Song clan seemed to have been decided at this moment. Since it was only delayed, then the Song clan, who had first joined the remnants of the Jiang clan and then joined the rebel lords, would still be able to escape after the rebellion was quelled due to the presence of Song Yushu, a young talent in the emperor's heart. Their path to promotion in Liang's officialdom would not be blocked and cut off. It was believed that after today's small court meeting, the Song clan thousands of miles away would be able to quickly hear of the thunderstorm from the palace and would most likely be relieved of a heavy burden. The young emperor looked at the assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Tang Taihuang, who was seated at the back and asked gently, "Tang Taihuang, when will the pillar state leave Liaodong and enter the capital? Does the Ministry of War have any definite news?" Tang Taihuang was somewhat anxious and answered carefully. I only know that the Pillar State has replied to the Ministry of War that the 2 Liao borders are urgent. Beimang's Eastern Front Commander-in-Chief, Wang Sui, has been making a lot of movements recently and seems to have the intention of mobilizing troops. The Pillar State must make proper arrangements before leaving. The young emperor made a sound of agreement and comforted him. Order Gao Tingshu of the Ministry of War to draft a document and inform the Pillar State that there is no need to rush to the south. The 2 Liao borders have always been the most important matter in our dynasty. We must not lose the big picture for the small. Tang Taihuang accepted the order in a deep voice, but his heart became heavier. The more amiable His Majesty was, the less confident he, the assistant minister of the Ministry of War who had the word party-oriented, plastered on his forehead, felt. There was a saying in the great peace city officialdom called, after Gu Jiantang, the Ministry of War had no luck. This was referring to the important people in charge of the Ministry of War after Gu Jiantang. Almost none of them had a smooth career. Minister Liu Baijie was first transferred to Guangling and then became a captive of the King of Yan in the Spring Snow Building. Assistant Minister Su Gong was first sent to Liaodong. In name he was helping the emperor patrol the northern pass, but in reality, he was excluded from the officialdom of the capital, especially the center of the court. Liu Xianxia had led the southern expedition as an assistant minister, but from start to finish, he had very little military service. If it were not for the fact that he sent troops without permission later on, he probably would have become the laughingstock of the world. As for Chen Zhibao, between the 2 ministers Gu Jiantang and Liu Baijie, he had been granted the title of King of Western Shu. Originally, he had been favored greatly. In the end, he had mysteriously rebelled with Zhao Bing of the southern border. In the end, it was not a good ending. It was not easy to live in the capital, and it was not easy to be an official in the capital. Tang Taihuang glanced casually at Kai Nan, who was standing slightly in front of him. All sorts of feelings welled up in his heart. Last time, Wei Dong, Donggong, Huang Gong, and the other old subordinates of General Gu had come to the capital and parted on bad terms. This time, Kai Nan had no intention of visiting Tang Taihuang. She stayed at the Lianhui Road station in the capital and lived in seclusion. The young emperor turned his head and smiled at the Minister of Rights, Sima Puhua. In the 3rd year of Xianghu, the Ministry of Rights had been raised to the same level as the 2 ministries of civil service and military affairs. It was higher than the 3 ministries of civil service, and labor. Sima Puhua naturally enjoyed many of the benefits of Liu Daolin and Yuan Gua, the 2 former ministers. It was not without reason that the current emperor was viewed as a literati emperor by the Central Plains. Although he did not necessarily look down on military officials, it was clear that he valued civil officials. The relocation of the Hanlin Academy and the elevation of the Ministry of Rights were clear evidence. The young emperor looked at the high official of the Ministry of Rights and said earnestly, "The examination will be held at the beginning of spring next year. The Ministry of Rights has an unshirkable responsibility. Have you decided on the candidates for the position of president and vice president?" This time, the scale of the spring imperial examination has expanded greatly. The number of scholars is unprecedentedly large. Minister Sima, you still need to provide a detailed constitution as soon as possible. Other than the fact that I will personally look through it, the Ministry of Rights might as well hand the constitution over to Tantanon, Minister Yin, and the other seniors who have presided over the spring imperial examination many times. The old man, who was probably the most hopeless among all the ministers of the Ministry of Rights in Liang, said in fear and trepidation, "Your Majesty, the spring imperial examination that is held once every 3 years is related to the continuation of our dynasty's cultural heritage. Although I have been in the Ministry of Rights for many years, I have never had the experience of presiding over the spring imperial examination. Moreover, in terms of experience, I admit that I am far inferior to Tantanon and Minister Yin in terms of familiarity with the operation of the spring imperial examination. In terms of knowledge, I am even inferior to the head of the Hall of Governmental Affairs and Grand Secretary Wen. In terms of ability, I am also inferior to Chen Xiaobao and Minister Yen, who are young talents in their prime. Your Majesty, I do not know how to choose the president and vice president together with my colleagues in the Ministry of Rights. It is not that Li Yong is a talented person, but it is just like hanging a large bead curtain at the door of a small house. It is a dazzling lineup that is truly too much for the eyes to take in. I do not know how to choose. Therefore, I dare to say that Your Majesty has personally selected the candidates for the spring imperial examination." Tantanon listened to the heartfelt words of the Minister of Rights behind him. He could not help but turn his head and look over, giving him a thumbs up. This flattery had flattered many people in an instant. Chapter 1825. In response to Tantanon's gesture, Sima Puhua smiled foolishly. His eyes were sincere and impeccable. The young emperor gathered his sleeves and smiled slightly. I will not add to the matter of the candidates for the spring examination. It will still be decided by the Ministry of Rights. If you have a headache, Minister Sima can communicate more with Tantanon when you return. However, in my opinion, apart from the fact that the chief examiner for the examination needs to be of virtue and prestige, we can make an exception for the specific candidates responsible for marking the examination papers. There is no need to pay attention to seniority. The Ministry of Rights, the Hanlin Academy, and the Imperial College can each choose a few young people to take up the posts. Sima Puhua, whose face was full of admiration, quickly bowed and said, "Your Majesty is wise." The young emperor turned his gaze and with great difficulty found Hong Lingshu, who seemed out of place in this small court. After all, Hong Lingshu was an official who had just entered the capital from a local area. Hong Lingshu was also one of the leaders of the Green Party. The Green Party had many ups and downs during the reign of Jianghu, especially after Lu Feiqi of the Pillar of Xianxia chose to marry into the Su family of Beiliang. The Lu family moved to the northwest, causing all the officials in Jianghu to feel insecure. Fortunately, not long ago, old Assistant Minister Wen Taiyi had been promoted from an external post to the Jianghan Dao administrator. Only then did the people calm down. However, this was Hong Lingshu's first time in the capital, and he was not accustomed to the crouching tigers and hidden dragons in the capital. The young emperor's voice grew softer and softer as he said slowly, "Has General Hong's residence in Tian City been renovated?" Hong Lingshu, who had originally thought that he was just accompanying the crown prince in his studies, was overwhelmed by the favor. "Your Majesty, the residence that the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Revenue helped to arrange is excellent. I did not need to make any changes at all. The family members who came with me were full of praise. Your Majesty's kindness is vast and mighty. I am moved to tears." The young emperor smiled. Assistant Minister Tang put in a lot of thought into this matter. If you want to thank someone, thank him. Hearing this, Hong Lingshu immediately cupped his fists in thanks to Tang Taihuang beside him. The latter only cupped his fists in return and did not speak politely. The former was relatively simple and fast, but there was a big bottleneck between the assistant minister and assistant minister. The latter emphasized being down-to-earth and slow, but as long as one became one of the 3 generals of Pingzhen, his future would be assured. As long as he could hold on, he would be able to take advantage of the situation and move up step by step. On the other hand, the assistant minister of the Ministry of War still had to go to the local area to take up the position of deputy Jidushi. In the end, they would have to fight for the position of Minister of War based on their own abilities. Both methods had their advantages and disadvantages. However, for Hong Lingshu to be directly promoted from a general of a province to a general of Pingzhen was not a very reasonable promotion. It was reasonable because the imperial court needed to use the Green Party in the hinterland of the Central Plains to pacify the people when thousands of scholars from the Central Plains were rushing to Beiliang. Wen Taiyi, who left the capital, and Hong Lingshu, who entered the capital, were like this. Although Hong Lingshu was a proper outsider, he was not optimistic about the prospects of the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Tang Taihuang. On the one hand, Wu Zhongshuan appeared out of nowhere. On the other hand, Tang Tieshuang's faction was too strong. Hong Lingshu's identity as the Green Party could sometimes help balance the imperial court. However, Assistant Minister Tang's identity as a general of the Gu Party meant that as long as the pillar of state Gu Jiantang was alive, Tang Taihuang would not be able to reach the top of the imperial court. The imperial court could tolerate a pillar of state who led the military of 2 Liao provinces to live under the same roof as a General Tang, who led the iron cavalry of Liaodong. However, they would never allow a minister of state Tang to work together with General Gu. Hong Lingshu would not be grateful just because Tang Taihuang had spent a lot of effort on his residence but kept it a secret. However, the emperor seemed to casually reveal it in public. Hong Lingshu had to think about it carefully. The young emperor picked up the imperial edict again. His expression became serious. He sneered, "Zhao Bing is a vassal of the Zhao family, but he wants to be a traitor. I can tolerate the Guangling Path Rebellion. I can tolerate the civil and military officials who defected to the Jiang family of West Chu. I can't tolerate the people of Guangling Path who were caught in the chaos of war. However, I can't tolerate Zhao Bing and Zhao Zhu. The monarch of Liang paused. Wu Zhongshuan. The burly Wu Zhongshuan said in a low voice. I'm here. The young emperor said expressionlessly, Minister Wu, please explain the situation of Guangling Path to my beloved officials. Wu Zhongshuan said slowly, currently, the traitor Zhao Bing has a total of 110,000 troops stationed in the north of Guangling Path. In the following half a year, there will be at least 40,000 Nanjiang barbarians entering the north of Guangling River. The traitor Chen Zhibao, excluding the 20,000 Shu troops, will have 30,000 Shu troops rushing to Guangling Path. In addition to the original Zhennan General Song Li and the original Jizhou General Yuan Tingshan, as well as the newly absorbed remnants of the West Chu rebels, by the end of the fourth year of Xiangfu, the number of rebels will reach 260,000. Currently, the imperial court only has 120,000 soldiers guarding Guangling Path. Although the rebellion of the two kings had already made Great Peace City feel uneasy, when Wu Zhongshuan directly stated the number of troops on both sides, even when Shoren, an important official in the central government, felt fear. Furthermore, the older officials all knew the ability of the Yan King Zhao Bing. He was a martial artist who had once fought side by side with a certain cripple Rintu. There was also another matter that was understood. Beside the Yan King Zhao Bing stood a Chen Jibao, a white-robed war saint who controlled all the soldiers of West Shu. Chongshan Commandery Prince Zhao Yang, Yan Country Duke Gao Shizhi, and Huayang Marquis Song Downing. These three martial artists who had also experienced the fires of war in the spring and autumn period were all worried. Zhao Yang was one of the top 10 generals in the spring and autumn period. The more so, the more the old man understood the danger of Guangling Path. Qi Yanglong suddenly opened his mouth and said, General Gu is leading an elite force south to quell the rebellion, but it is not necessary to immediately enter the battlefield. The imperial court is training soldiers at this time. At present, the heart of the army is not with the imperial court but with the rebel army. Fortunately, the hearts of the people are with the imperial court and not with Zhao Bing and Chen Jibao. Back then, Su Zhao's situation was even better. But he still didn't rule by drawing a river. He was unwilling and unable to do so. Now, it's only 20 years later, not 200 years later. The ambitious Zhao and Chen vassal kings are just continuing the game of chess that has already been decided 20 years ago, as long as... At this point, the head of the secretariat suddenly fell silent. Tantanon continued, as long as the Bailiang cavalry does not rebel and continue to hold back the pace of Beimang's invasion to the south, allowing Gu Jiantang to have time to go south to quell the rebellion, the Zhao and Chen kings will be short-lived. For some reason, this as long as caused many of the nobles and officials in the Cultivation Divine Hall to feel a strange meaning. If Bailiang was not willing to fight to the death with Beimang and abandoned the northwest, retreated 1,000 li south, and then conspired with the Yan King Zhao Bing on the Central Plains, what would the imperial court do? It should be known that after Wan Taiyi and Ma Zhongxian, the Jidushi and administrator, arrived at Jinggan Road, the matter of the grain entering the cold, as expected, was bumpy and slow. Who would have thought that 20 years of peace and prosperity would be turned upside down overnight? It turned out. Unknowingly, the length of the Liang kingdom was once again tied to a person surnamed Su. This truth made most of the people in the Cultivation Divine Hall feel extremely humiliated. For example, the head of the 12 scholars Wen Shoren, the imperial relative Yan Jieshi, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights Jean Lanting, and others. There was an extremely vulgar saying in the countryside of Liang. Without Butcher Zhang, could it be that you can't eat pork? Now it seemed that it was really possible. Without Butcher Su to help kill people, the official status may not be stable. Wen Shoren, the Grand Secretary of the Wuying Palace, was pale. Yan Jieshi, who looked down on His Royal Highness for many years, was gloomy. Jean Lanting was even more livid. Kainan quietly lowered his head, his expression dark and unclear. Administrator Han Lin, whose relationship with Kainan had improved greatly after the battle with the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry, had a complicated expression. At this time, the young emperor smiled. The Su family has guarded the northwest for 2 generations. In the second year of Xiangfu, the Bailiang frontier army contributed greatly, so the imperial court should reward them. Lu Jinu, Wang Lingbao, and other Bailiang generals have died on the battlefield. I'm prepared to write a decree to confer titles to all Bailiang generals, including these 2. I also plan to give the king of Bailiang, Su Fengnian, the title of Pillar of the State. The Zhao family's emperor squinted his eyes and looked over. The entire hall was stunned. Chapter 1826. Thank you all for supporting me and my work in the snow during the year-end inventory. As soon as he heard that His Majesty was going to return the title of Pillar of State to the Su family, the Grand Secretary of the Wuying Palace, Wen Shoren, immediately looked extremely embarrassed. This old and stubborn official, who had once become famous all over the world for carrying the coffin and remonstrating Su Shao to death, began to tremble all over. The leader of the clear stream in the officialdom, who had always given people the impression that he was still vigorous despite his age, finally looked somewhat like a candle in the wind. In the Liang dynasty, although the Zhang and Gu palaces were already like passing clouds, each had its own legacy. For example, when Wang Xiongui, the former Minister of Revenue, became Zhang Lu's successor, even though he was sent to the Guangling circuit, he still managed to win over a large group of civil officials from the spring of Yonghui around him. Tang Tai's Huang, Donggong, Huang, and other military generals entered the capital from the border. The same was true for the Green Party. The Assistant Minister of Personnel, Wen Tai, and Hong Lingshu's promotions all belonged to the same origin. In fact, apart from these three parties, there was another party that was even more secretive and had even more complicated origins. It was the Anti-Su party headed by Wen Shoren, with Jean Lanting, the Assistant Minister of Rights, as his hidden successor, and Gao Tingshu of the Ministry of War, as the backbone. These people came from all over the world, and had no friendship with their hometown or the same age. There was a great disparity in seniority, and their backgrounds were completely different. The former general of the north, Ma Lulong, was also one of the backbone who did not show his face. These people might have different opinions on many military and state matters, but they always maintained a tacit understanding on one matter, and that was to do their best to suppress the reputation of the Bailiang Su family in the Liang imperial court and the Central Plains. Simply speaking, this group of people had a bone-deep obsession with how to squeeze out the Su family and father. When the old Grand Secretary Zhang Julu was still alive, he still had misgivings and did not dare to put his personal interests over his official duties. After the blue-eyed woman, who had once blocked out the sky and covered the sun in the Liang imperial court, passed away, and Tantanon broke off with her early on, this group of people seemed to be able to see the clouds and see the moon, and they became more and more unscrupulous in their actions. For example, this time, the matter of the imperial court setting 1,000,000 dan of grain to cool down before autumn, it was precisely because of the spread of these deeply rooted large trees in Great and City that they brought back a lot of solemn gossip to Jing'an Road, especially Qingzhou's Xiangfan, as well as all kinds of inside information that did not need to be said out loud. As a result, less than half of the grain had slowly made its way to Bailiang. As for when it would arrive at the granary in Lingzhou, the grain officials who had rested on the grain transport for 20 years naturally had all kinds of skilled excuses to deal with the Imperial Court's Ministry of Revenue. Moreover, the Ministry of Revenue only sent a few letters every few days that seemed to be strictly worded. How could they really investigate the officials for failing to do their duty? Who did not know that the Ministry of Revenue had always been seen as Zhang Lu's last defensive position? The officials who held real power in the Ministry of Revenue were almost all scholars who had emerged from the spring of Yonghui. Everyone saw themselves as the old Grand Secretary's disciples. When the former minister Wang Xiongui was in the capital, even though he was not very close to the famous Wen Shoren, Wang Xiongui had always had a bad impression of the northwest border. In addition, his son Wang Yuling had formed a deep grudge with the new prince of Liang, Su Fengnian. This was a topic that everyone in the capital knew about. Most importantly, although the matter of the grain entering the capital and suddenly changing its route to the northwest had long been independent of the Ministry of Revenue, how could the Ministry of Revenue, which was nominally in charge of taxes, not really have anything to do with it? To be precise, the entire Ministry of Revenue's hands and feet were very clean on the surface, but many of the Ministry of Revenue's high-ranking officials were not necessarily clean. Once the transportation of the grain deviated from the familiar path of the officialdom, it would inevitably lead to the loss of countless vested interests. Once the transportation of the grain from the capital to the two Liao provinces was divided into 3 provinces and 1 Bailiang, it would become a rule. This meant that the annual dividend of 1,000,000 shur of grain would go down the drain. Among the large group of meritorious families in Great and City behind the high-ranking officials of the transportation of the grain were the Duke of Yan, Gao Shi, and the Marquis of Huaiyang, Song Downing. When the old Emperor of Liang first gave out titles to meritorious officials, according to Yuan Benqi's plan, it was roughly, the civil officials were given power and the military officers were given money. The Prince of Changshan, Zhao Yang, was also in this group. A large group of manners, such as Gao Shi and Song Downing, were able to get involved in the transportation of the gold rolling in. However, Gao Shi and Song Downing ate better and did not get a large share. In these years, they had intentionally or unintentionally instructed the people in charge of the transportation of the grain to keep a low profile. The gradual withdrawal of these two dukes and marquis also led to the rising arrogance of many other families. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were insatiably greedy. The reason why Jianghu's reorganization of the transportation of the grain and the officials was difficult was because these two matters had almost offended both high and low levels of the Liang officialdom. Although there was not a strong backlash, it was not very effective. After all, there were no free people in the officialdom. After Zhang Julu was sent to prison, the entire imperial court was as silent as a cicada in winter. During this period of time, there was no doubt that the blue-eyed boy's best friend Huan chose to stand on the sidelines and watch with folded arms. And there was also the fact that Zhang Julu allowed Zhang Lu to fall apart. But wasn't it also because of the selfishness of those Liang civil and military officials, who felt that they had no day to see the light of day? Who would think that dealing with the Su family in the northwest would be an easy and pleasant matter? Who would dare to rigidly apply the Liang officialdom's set of rules and regulations to the Beiliang frontier army? Who would have the guts to run to the Northwest Territory and ask the Su family's officials for kickbacks? Who would not be afraid that those Beiliang barbarians' heads would be chopped off? Therefore, one could well imagine the Ministry of Revenue's real attitude toward the matter of the grain going cold. Naturally, they would drag it out as long as they could, slow it down as long as they could. In fact, this strategy happened to coincide with the opinion that when Tai raised to His Majesty the Emperor's face during the small court assembly. Suddenly, the young emperor smiled and asked, "Kainan, Han Lin, the territory you two are in is closest to the Beiliang road. What do you think of the second battle of Liangmang?" Moreover, in the first battle, Northern Liang's first-rate elite cavalry suffered very few casualties. Putting aside the fact that the Great Snow Dragon cavalry remained intact, those two heavy cavalry units that had always been kept secret from the outside were also accumulating strength and waiting to set out. Moreover, Jianghu and Zhou Kang's left and right cavalry did not participate in the first battle at all. On the other hand, in northern Mang, Yang Yuanzhan's entire army was wiped out at Gourd Mouth in Yuzhou. At that time, Lu Kuei's direct troops in Liuzhou on the western front also suffered rather heavy casualties, with nearly 10,000 Chong cavalry completely wiped out. Now, the second great battle has yet to officially begin. In the Battle of the Dragon Eye Plains, putting aside the fact that northern Mang's elite cavalry was almost completely wiped out, Hong Jingyan's Ruren cavalry scattered, and Dongzhu's private cavalry also suffered serious injuries. This is definitely an enormous hidden danger that northern Mang still has a great advantage in terms of military strength on the surface. I believe that both sides in Liang and Mang will have a new set of considerations on this matter. The young emperor sighed softly, as expected of the Beiliang cavalry, the best in the world. The Beiliang cavalry, the best in the world. This phrase was not unfamiliar to the Central Plains but might not be recognized. Perhaps today was the first time it had been publicly spoken by someone in the officialdom of Liang, and it was from the mouth of the Zhao Emperor. The administrator of the two rivers, Han Lin, was more refined than when he was in the capital. His skin was darker, and his aura had become steadier and more restrained. There was a rough and simple aura of the border around him. Compared to Wen Shouren and Jean Lanting, who had been in the court for a long time, there was an indescribable feeling of distance between the two. Han Lin was one of the dozen or so administrators who had left Great Peace City to take up the post of a major official of a border. He was the one who had been promoted in name and in reality. The court had placed high hopes on him, and he had not been demoted from an important place. Li Yang favored this former assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice. The emperor of the Zhao family looked at this administrator who would send secret letters to the capital every 10 days through the hands of spies. His gaze was gentle. "Han Lin, you've worked hard this year." Han Lin bowed and said fearfully, "I have betrayed your grace." The young emperor smiled. "You have already done very well. If it weren't for Kainan, I'm afraid you would be the first administrator of Liang to die on the battlefield, and I would have lost an arm. Han Lin, in the future, you must not act so rashly. The loyalty of a civil official to the country is never on the battlefield. I have never doubted your loyalty. Otherwise, I would not have let you be the administrator of the border." Other than Tang Taizuang, who had the title of minister in name, Wu Zhongshuan, who was not familiar with the affairs of the Yamen and was temporarily still the most powerful person in the Ministry of War, all the civil officials in the Hall of Cultivation were confused. Even Zhao Yang, Gao Shi, and Song Downing, who had gradually walked from behind the scenes to the front and regained control of the military power, did not understand why the emperor said this. However, for Han Lin to be able to receive such a direct verbal praise, it meant that this person was destined to return to the central government in the future. Perhaps he could even successfully control one of the 3 provinces. This was indeed something that no one had expected. After all, Han Lin was a student of Zhang Lu in his early years. However, compared to Zhao Yuling and Yin Mao Chun, he seemed to be lacking in ability. Compared to Yuan Gua, he was also inferior in terms of knowledge. Even compared to Wang Xiongui, he had many disadvantages. Perhaps this was the so-called great talent matured late. There were many examples of people in the officialdom who were proud of their achievements one day, but would be punished the next day. On the contrary, Han Lin, who was calm and steady, had more potential. After a seemingly casual discussion between the emperor and his subjects, the young emperor once again brought up the matter of awarding the young king Su Fengnian as the most outstanding military official of the Great Pillar State. This time, the hall was still silent. However, compared to the previous surging undercurrent, the eyes of many of the officials clearly showed a hint of resignation. The young emperor's fingers lightly stroked the imperial edict on his knee. The Ministry of Revenue will draft a constitution and send it to the Hall of Cultivation. If there are some local resistance, the Ministry of Revenue can discuss with Assistant Minister Tang of the Ministry of War. In short, I guarantee that when the imperial edict reaches Bailiang, the grain will cool down before the imperial edict. Chapter 1827. At this point, the young emperor glanced at Gao Shizhi and Song Downing. The latter's heart trembled at the same time. When the emperor shifted his gaze, the two looked at each other and smiled bitterly. It was an unexpected calamity. The income of Duke Yan's mansion and Marquis Huayang's mansion had long been diluted to the point that it was negligible. Now, the ones who could truly be called the biggest rats in the country were none other than the 3 members of the Zhao family who had the same surname as the country. 2 of them were the elders of the Zhao family, who had long been indifferent to the court. The last one was a new member of the imperial family, who had recently entered the muddy waters. It was said that the former had tried to rope in the latter, and the latter had suddenly gained power with the help of a certain son-in-law during the auspicious year. Apparently, he had somewhat forgotten himself and his bones had become lighter by several jin. Once he heard that it was such a profitable business with no capital, he had thrown himself into it without hesitation. For half a year, the guaranteed bonus was 2.5 million taels of silver. In fact, Gao Shizhi and Song Downing had only received around 500,000 taels of silver at their peak. It should be known that the son-in-law of the county king was standing in the Hall of Immortal Cultivation at this moment, and his position was only behind Qi Yonglong and Huan Wen, alongside Zhao Yuling, Yin Mao Chun, and Wu Zhongshuan. But why did the emperor not look at that person, but instead reminded Yen and Song? It was very simple. The young man who had been imperceptibly tricked by his father-in-law was named Chen Wang. In the officialdom of Liang, he had always been respectfully called Chen Xiaobao. He was an important official of the central government and close to the emperor. In terms of the degree of his confidant, perhaps even Yan Jieshi and Yan Qiji, the father and son of the emperor, could not compare to him. At this moment, Chen Wang, the left-scattered cavalry officer of Menxia province, was expressionless. He held his breath in concentration, and no one could see anything strange. Jean Lanting narrowed his eyes and carefully sized up the back of Chen Wang who was standing in front of him. His eyes were dark and gloomy. The Grand Secretary of the Hall of Wuying, Wen Shouren, was not at ease in today's small court meeting. As the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights who aspired to take control of the Liang literature vein, he was also greatly disappointed. Earlier, the emperor had mentioned that the chief examiner of the spring examination would be someone of virtue and prestige. This meant that Jin Sanlang, who had little experience in the officialdom, had actually already missed the great opportunity to use the spring examination to become the common teacher of all the scholars in the world. During the Yonghui era, when Zhang Julu and Tantanon, 2 people jointly controlled the imperial examination, why did everybody like to call themselves Zhang Julu's disciple, Grand Secretary Wanqing? It was not only because Zhang Julu's official position was higher than Huan Wen's, nor was it because of the difference between the positions of president and vice president. The key was that in the end, Huan Wen was only responsible for dividing the rooms and marking the examination papers. Even if the person was personally selected by Huan Wen, he still had to be approved by Zhang Julu. Jean Lanting originally thought that after Qi Yonglong clearly stated that he would not participate in the spring examination, and Yao Baifeng took the initiative to pack up and leave the Imperial College, he would be able to obtain one of the 3 positions of president and vice president. As for whether or not he could take over the position of chief examiner, it was not that Jean Lanting did not covet it. However, he did not expect that in the end it would be such a bleak situation. The small court meeting that followed was mainly to discuss the deployment of troops from Guangling Road. Lu Xianxia emerged as the biggest winner. The assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Su Gong, remained in Jizhou, while Lu Xianxia became the general of the southern expedition. Compared to last time when he was restricted everywhere, this time the emperor not only personally gave Lu Xianxia the power to do whatever he wanted, half of the Ministry of War and the entire capital's military strength leaned towards him. He also had the power to control the 14 provinces of the Central Plains, including Jing and Road. In addition, he casually said, when a general is outside, the emperor's orders cannot be taken. In this way, Lu Xianxia seemed to have leapt to a position above a Jidushi. After stepping out of the Yangshan temple today, he almost controlled half of the Liang dynasty's military forces. Wu Zhongshuan's expression was calm, but even an idiot knew that this minister of war from a barbaric land was probably cursing in his heart. After the small court meeting ended, the young emperor looked tired and did not keep any of the officials to continue the discussion alone. These officials, who could be called the pillars of Liang, all left in a line. Lu Xianxia, who was the laughingstock of the capital's officialdom just a day ago, was surrounded by endless congratulatory voices. Gao Shizhi and Song Downing still walked together without any suspense. However, Chen Wang, who had not interacted much with them, suddenly came to their side. He did not say anything, only smiled apologetically. Everything was understood without words. Gao Shizhi and Song Downing waited for Chen Xiaobao to leave. They looked at each other and smiled, without the bitterness in the Yangshan temple. When dealing with smart people, it was more reassuring to know when to stop than to speak with certainty. To be an official in the same court as a scholar like Chen Wang, no matter how high his position was, it was a comfortable and pleasing thing to the eye. It was hard to dislike him. Gao Shizhi joked, to have such an old father-in-law who only knows how to drag him down, it really is hard on our Chen Xiaobao. Song Downing stared and said softly, the palace is an important place, you don't even know the words careful? How are you any better? Gao Shizhi laughed it off. At this moment, Chongshan Commandery Prince Zhao Yang suddenly shouted, startling Wen Shouren and the other officials. They looked up and saw a child of 7 or 8 years old appear at the corner. The officials who were familiar with the Chongshan Commandery Prince's mansion all recognized the identity of the child. He was Zhao Yang's eldest grandson. Now he was studying in the diligent room in the palace where the Zhao family's descendants gathered. All the children of Liang's vassals were proud to enter the diligent room. The Yangshan temple was located at the intersection of the outer court and the inner court. It was also a top military important place. Logically speaking, even if the grandson of Chongshan Commandery Prince was playful and lost, he should not appear in front of everyone. The rule of killing anyone who approached the Yangshan temple for no reason was not just for show. It was no wonder that Zhao Yang was so angry. The old man who had been in the officialdom all his life was really scared. The child studying in the diligent room was so scared by his grandfather that his face turned pale. His little face was wrinkled and he looked pitiful as if he wanted to cry but did not dare to. But soon, a young man in white appeared beside the child. His eyes were closed and his face was calm. He smiled slightly and reached out to touch the child's head. Then he looked at Chongshan Commandery Prince Zhao Yang and said, "Don't be angry, old Commandery Prince. I asked Zhao Yuan to help lead the way. I have already talked to the ceremony directorate before. I did not cross the palace's rules." The old Commandery Prince was stunned and could not figure out the reason. After thinking for a long time, he remembered that his grandson had said not long ago that there was a blind chief teacher in the diligent room whose surname was Lu. He was very knowledgeable and knew everything about astronomy and geography. He had a very good temper and never beat people. At that time, the old Commandery Prince was puzzled that a blind man could be one of the chief teachers in the diligent room. Although Liang was not the great Feng dynasty where even officials had to be judged by their appearance, it was still not normal for a blind man to be an official. There was no harm in him being a strategist in the local area. Later, the old Commandery Prince asked around and found out that this blind scholar had once been a strategist by the side of the king of Jing and Zhao Sun. During the last years of Yonghui's reign, He had prepared the influential 4 digs and 13 strategies for the Jing'an Palace. Later, for some reason, he had taken root in Tai'an City. Zhao Yang snorted disdainfully at this. He guessed that this blind scholar was just another scholar like Jean Lanting who swayed with the wind. After the old commandery prince heard the explanation of the young man who was the diligent room's chief teacher, he still harumphed coldly with a straight face. He said to his grandson in a bad mood, "What are you wandering around for? Go back to study." The child, who was as scared of the old commandery prince as his father, unexpectedly did not listen to the military order this time. He gritted his teeth and said in a trembling voice, "Grandfather, I still have to lead the way for Mr. Liu. Mr. told us that the last 10 miles is the most difficult to walk. The last 10 miles is the best way to see a person's innate character. I've only walked half of it." The old commandery prince, who was used to the obedience of everyone in the commandery prince, was instantly enraged. The power that he had accumulated from half his life in the military exploded. "Little brat, half your uncle. You dare to reason with me? If you have the ability, then don't go back to the commandery prince Chongshan's manor today. Go sleep on the street outside the gate." The blind young man smiled slightly and said, "Don't scholars study so that they can understand etiquette and act according to reason? Why can't you reason with your elders?" The amiable and diligent room's chief teacher was a stark contrast to the ruthless commandery prince of Zhao. Even many of the Liyang officials walking at the front couldn't help but stop and turn around to look. They were all waiting to see what would happen. The old commandery prince glanced at the young man who had no hair on his mouth. He was too lazy to say anything. Then he continued to glare fiercely at the child. "Are you rebelling? How many meals of scabbard do you want to eat tonight?" Most of the high officials and nobles of Great Peace City had heard of the matter of scabbard rice. It was the trump card that the old commandery prince Zhao Yang used to discipline the children of his family. In reality, even the Duke of Yan and the Marquis of Huaiyang, who lived close to the old commandery prince Fu, had been hit by Zhao Yang's scabbard when they were young. He had said that their elders could not discipline them well, so he would discipline them for them. It was a small matter, so there was no need to thank him. Hearing the words, "scabbard rice," the child's legs trembled even more. The young man crouched down and whispered a few words to the child. The latter nodded furiously and ran away from the trouble. Then the blind scholar from Qingzhou stood and said with a smile, "It is true that the rod produces the filial son. But if a family only has the rod and no poetry, they are fated to be foolishly filial. Even if they have the loyalty of a family, it is difficult to have the loyalty of a country. There is no benefit to the monarch and the country, and no favor to the people of the world." The old commandery prince smiled coldly and clicked his tongue. "You can scare people with your principles. No wonder you are the chief teacher of the diligent room. It is a pity that this king is not interested in listening to your nonsense today. You are a rotten scholar who speaks of benevolence, righteousness, and morality. This king killed many in the spring and autumn war. Now that you are working in the diligent room, this king does not have the ability to make things difficult for you. You are lucky to be born 20 years later." Chapter 1828. The older generation of Yonghui officials all knew that this commandery prince Chongshan was famous for his outspoken words. Even the teachers of Zhang Julu and Huan Wen had had the misfortune to experience Zhao Yang's spittle. The young scholar still had a smile on his face and stopped arguing with commandery prince Chongshan. Wu Zhongshuan, who was watching coldly from the side, smiled. He sympathized with this old commandery prince who had outstanding military achievements but was born at the wrong time. Jean Lanting hid her schadenfreude very well. The former arrogant scholar of Imperial College Sun Yin, the current young phoenix of Hanlin Academy Song Kelly, the 10th level chess saint Fan Zhongho, and the white-robed poor scholar Lu Su, who had appeared out of nowhere, were all viewed by the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights as serious problems in the future officialdom. Qi Yanglong, Huan Wen, and Chen Wang all frowned at the same time. Especially Chen Xiaobao, who had become the welcoming autumn official again this year, had a rare angry look on his face. During this period, only one person was truly frightened, and that was the former general of Qingzhou, Hong Lingshu. Back then, the Lu family of Qingzhou had suffered an unexpected disaster. Only a young man, who had stabbed himself in the eyes, was lucky enough to survive because his official career was destined to be cut off. Later, it was said that he gambled chess in Yongzi Alley and worked as a musician in a brothel. He relied on these two lowly jobs to make a living. Later on, for some unknown reason, Smoke rose from his grave and he became a clerk in the palace of the old king of Jing and Zhao Hang. Then, he became the chief strategist of the new king of Jing and Zhao Sun. However, the Lu family's tragedy was never overturned. Some worried people who were involved in the tragedy had probed the Jing and palace several times, but they did not get an answer. In the past, Hong Lingshu did not pay much attention to this. Firstly, he and the Hong family did not participate in the tragedy. If they did, they would have eliminated the root of the problem long ago. Even a blind young man would not be left alive. Secondly, at that time, he was the general of Qingzhou who had held military power for many years. The small Lu family was like an ant. If Lu Su wanted to make things difficult for his enemies, it was tantamount to challenging the entire Green Party, who was used to huddling together for warmth. The two generations of kings of Jing and Palace did not help the Lu family. Most likely it was because of this concern. A young strategist with no roots or the entire Green Party. Who was more important, compared to the entire Green Party? It was obvious who was more important. However, when Hong Lingshu saw the young blind man in this important place in the palace, especially when he said, "I have already communicated with the ceremony directorate and have not overstepped the restrictions of the palace," how could Hong Lingshu, who was now an official in the capital, not have wild and fanciful thoughts? This blind man had suddenly become the teacher of a large group of Great Peace City's top nobles. If he harbored resentment and could not let go of the entire Green Party, to the point of taking his anger out on him, Hong Lingshu, the general of Liangping, perhaps it would be difficult for him to cause too much trouble. However, in the end, it was definitely not a good thing. If Hong Lingshu had not entered the capital and remained in Qingzhou, far away from the emperor, and continued to be a third-rank general, then perhaps Hong Lingshu would have had hidden worries for the future, but he definitely would not have been as frightened as he was now. Hong Lingshu sighed in the depths of his heart. In the end, it was because the Green Party lacked a voice in the court at the intersection of Yonghui and Xiangfu. Furthermore, Hong Lingshu was not as deeply rooted in the capital as Wen Tai. If it had been the old assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments, Wen Tai, who was more deeply implicated in the Lu family's tragedy, even if he were to face this young blind man face to face, he would not be so uneasy. At this moment, Hong Lingshu greatly desired the title of Zhang, which was a level higher than his own title of Ping. The four great generals of Liangzhang were Yang Shenxing, Yan Zhenchuan, Ma Lulong, and Yang Jian. Among them, Yang Shenxing had already lost his title after the defeat at Guangling Road and was thrown to Bailiang Road as that comical deputy Jidushi. Yan Zhenchuan had even died on the battlefield at Guangling Road. After his death, he received a high standard title, which could be considered a blessing to his descendants. Ma Lulong, who was most trusted by the court, had also died of illness. After all, Yang Jian was old and would withdraw from the Liang army in at most 5 years. The three great generals of Zhengping were all officials with real power and were not empty titles. Therefore, when he retired, there was no such thing as standing in the latrine without taking a shit. Someone would immediately replace him. For example, the current Minister of War, Wu Zhongshuan, had replaced Yan Zhenchuan to obtain the title of Great General of the Southern Expedition. During Hong Lingshu's journey to the capital and Wen Tai's journey to the capital, after the death of Lu Feiqi, the leader of the Green Party's troika, the two became more and more like grasshoppers on the same rope. Although they had not met, they had exchanged secret letters. Wen Tai, who was familiar with the inner workings of the capital, had confided in Hong Lingshu about the situation. In Wen Tai's view at that time, excluding the great pillar state Gu Jiantang, Hong Lingshu's future opponents were Lu Xianxia, Tang Taizuang, Su Gong, Ma Zhongxian, the deputy general of Jizhou, Han Feng, whose father was Yang Shenxing's Yang Huchen, the extremely lucky Song Li, and his father-in-law was Gu Jiantang's Yuan Tingshan. Song Li and Yuan Tingshan had already destroyed their own futures and were in cahoots with Zhao Bing and Chen Jibao, the two rebellious vassal kings. There was no need to pay attention to them. The left assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Tang Taizuang, was both a blessing and a curse. His success was because he cared about the country, and his failure was because he cared about the country. He seemed to be in the limelight in the Ministry of War, and even the minister Wu Zhongshuan had to avoid him. However, in Wen Tai's eyes, he was less of a threat than Su Gong. This general of Dragon Xiang, who was born in Gongnam-do, was not to be underestimated. As the representative of the Jiangnan scholars quickly elected after Liu Baijie lost power, no matter how bumpy his official career was, it would be difficult to stop his rise. As for Ma Zhongxian, who had both the support of his ancestors and the ability to lead, as long as he left the capital where his family was based. Although Wen Taiyi did not say a word more in the secret letter, Hong Lingshu knew very well that the Jianghu road where the Green Party was located would inevitably be a muddy area for this deputy Jidushi. They would not brazenly let him fall. In reality, the Green Party did not have the strength and boldness to do so. However, to slow down Ma Zhongxian's rise for 3 or 4 years was not difficult. As for the younger generation, Han Feng and Yang Huchen, compared to Hong Lingshu, who had been a general of a province for close to 20 years and now had the title of Ping in her hands, they were at a clear disadvantage. As long as these two rising stars did not make great contributions and Hong Lingshu did not make any major mistakes, it was believed that Hong Lingshu would reach the top one step earlier than them. Wen Taiyi originally did not have high hopes for Lu Xianxia. In the end, Lu Xianxia, who was the commander of the southern expedition, only received the empty title of General of Piao Yi, similar to that of a civil official, the pillar of the country. In the capital's officialdom, he had become the biggest laughingstock. Looking back now, Lu Xianxia's rapid rise and unfailing prosperity could no longer be hidden. Hong Lingshu could secretly compete with Tang Taihuang and Su Gong, but she would definitely not try to arm wrestle with Lu Xianxia. At the end of the secret letter, Wen Taiyi frankly stated that when facing the enemy on the battlefield, it was a matter of life and death. When it reached a certain height in the court, it was actually a different approach to achieve the same result. You go up, I go down. It was definitely not a matter of peace and light, and everyone was happy. There were some words that Wen Taiyi did not write in the letter. Instead, he had the trusted aid of the One family relay them to Hong Lingshu. Do not become enemies with Chen Wang. Be friends with Yan Qiji. Remember to be careful of Lu Su. On the surface, Lu Su's identity in the capital's officialdom was just one of the diligent teachers. At this time, he took a few steps forward and made a gesture of looking around. He asked with a smile, I heard that General Hong is also in the small court meeting today. I, Lu Su, happen to be from Qingzhou. Of course, the officials in the capital did not know about the tragedy of the Lu family. They only treated it as a normal reminiscence of old friendships between people from the same hometown. Furthermore, the Qingzhou officials in Taiyan City had a close relationship. Perhaps the two Qingzhou officials whose residences were in the east and west of the city would meet every 10 days to exchange greetings. In the eyes of the other factions in the officialdom, this was an inconceivable and strange matter. The guild halls in the capital of other provinces were usually deserted, but the 4 guild halls in Qing province were almost always full of guests. Regardless of their status, high-ranking officials, scholars, merchants, and rangers, all kinds of people, they were happy and contented. They never cared about the good or bad reputation of the officialdom and scholarly circles, and also never cared about being ridiculed for being a profit-seeking person. Therefore, when Lu Su publicly proposed to reminisce with Hong Lingshu, none of the officials in the capital found it strange. Only Hong Lingshu felt chills all over her body and her heart palpitate for no reason. Once this accidental meeting was spread to Qingzhou, would Wen Taiyi, the most suspicious old fox, really continue to diligently pave the way for him without sparing any effort? However, Lu Su's smile did not allow Hong Lingshu to shed all pretense of cordiality and reject the invitation. Hong Lingshu could only brace herself and walk side by side with Lu Su, gradually pulling away from the others. Hong Lingshu then discovered that there was a middle-aged eunuch standing not far behind them. The distance was just right. He could see Lu Su but could not hear their conversation. Judging from his clothes, the status of this eunuch in the palace was not low. The moment his gaze met with Hong Lingshu's, it was clearly because of Lu Su. The middle-aged eunuch smiled slightly at Hong Lingshu, revealing some goodwill. This made Hong Lingshu even more shocked. How many people in the court could be treated so cautiously by a eunuch dressed in a python robe? No wonder Wen Taiyi was so wary of Lu Su and did not hesitate to use a large number of connections in Qingzhou to secretly obstruct Ma Zhongxian's official career in exchange for Hong Lingshu keeping a close eye on Lu Su. Lu Su, who could not see anything in the world, walked slowly. He stepped lightly on the stone path. Every time he touched the edge of the path, he would immediately adjust his direction to ensure that the path ahead was unobstructed. Seeing this scene, Hong Lingshu felt all sorts of emotions. For such a young blind man to be able to achieve what he had today, was it due to luck? Lu Su did not speak, and Hong Lingshu was also unwilling to take the initiative to speak. He and Wen Taiyi, as the leaders of the Green Party who had stood tall in the Liang imperial court for more than 20 years, were indeed wary of this person, but it was not to the extent of being overly fearful. This white-clothed scholar, one of the diligent teachers, finally said indifferently, "The Green Party has contributed greatly to my current situation." Hong Lingshu was silent. Chapter 1829. Lu Su suddenly stopped in his tracks and turned to face General Pingnan Hong Lingshu, who had also made rapid progress in his career. Assistant Minister Wen may not be the culprit for the grudges of the past, but he cannot absolve himself from the blame. I will naturally calculate with him. General Hong and Assistant Minister Wen are old friends, so why don't you tell him word for word? Hong Lingshu's aura did not falter at all. He asked in return, since Mr. Liu and Wen Tai are officials of the same court, and Mr. Liu is a diligent teacher who teaches the meritorious children of our court, do you want to steal the national weapon to avenge a personal grudge? Lu Su laughed involuntarily and then said seriously, "A gentleman can be deceived by other means, but it is difficult to overlook other ways." Hong Lingshu was stunned and did not know how to answer. Lu Su said self-deprecatingly, "Besides, I am not a gentleman. Otherwise, how could I have struggled at death's door all these years, to the extent that the mellow family style of the Liu family was swept away because of me?" Hong Lingshu smiled coldly and said, "I will help you convey Mr. Liu's meaning. If there is nothing else, then I will take my leave." Lu Su shook his head and chuckled softly. "If it's just to ask General Hong to help me convey a few irrelevant resentful words, why would I take the risk of being suspected of forming a clique and meet you right under His Majesty's nose?" Hong Lingshu did not know whether to laugh or cry. Lu Su's words could not be considered unimportant at all. Perhaps the old fox would not be able to sleep and eat well after hearing it. Lu Su said slowly, "General Hong and I have no old grudges and we are from the same village in Jianghu. In addition, the court is supporting the Green Party. Lu Su will naturally go with the flow. Not to mention the civil officials of the court, just the generals of the court. The scholars of Jiangnan have the right assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Su Gong. The Liaodong clan was originally wavering and did not know how to choose between Tang Taizuang and Lu Xianxia. In the end, after today, Lu Xianxia is no longer someone they can bet on. They can only choose the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Tang Taizuang." Hong Lingshu nodded unconsciously. Lu Su continued, "General Hong must have heard that the true leader of Gongnam-do scholars is the old head of the Gumusu family, the pillar of the state, Yu Zhenkong. Not only does this person's words carry enormous weight in Gongnam-do officialdom, he also has a deep relationship with Tantanan, who can influence the direction of the court. And Tang Taizuang, intentionally or otherwise, is distancing himself from Kai Nan, Donggong, and the others. And Su. Lu Su laughed and lowered his voice. "Dare I ask General Hong, is it difficult for Wu Zhongshuan, who has the body of a first-rank martial artist, to live for another 20 years? What he meant was that General Hong, who could only wait for Southern General Wu Zhongshuan to die of old age or illness, would have to endure for at least 20 years if there were no accidents." Hong Lingshu's face darkened. Lu Su digressed. "The administrator of Jianghu Road, not the minister of personnel of Great Peace City." Hong Lingshu also laughed. "But Mr. Liu is only one of the teachers of the diligent Chief Feng who has a noble status." Lu Su grunted and did not say anything else. Hong Lingshu only saw this young scholar close his eyes and smile intoxicatingly. The young man's last sentence was said in a very low voice, but it was like thunder in Hong Lingshu's ears. "I, Lu Su, can recite a secret letter with a total of 682 words. The confidant who sent the letter for the old assistant minister." Lu Su did not reveal the secret, but when he turned to leave, this teacher raised his arm and extended a finger. Then he curled it lightly. After understanding the gesture, Hong Lingshu was instantly covered in sweat. Sima Puhua and Jean Lanting, the two officials of the Ministry of Rights, naturally walked together. Sima Puhua did not even need to look at Jean Lanting to know that the second in command of the yamen would not give him a good look. There was nothing he could do about it. According to the original conclusion of the people of the Ministry of Rights behind closed doors, they would strongly recommend Jean Lanting to be the chief examiner of next year's spring examination. In addition, Jean Lanting would also promise to look after his two sons. At least one of them would be able to sit in the position of Chancellor of the Imperial College or Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights. However, as the Ministry of Rights became more and more powerful, Sima Puhua's family's threshold was now higher, and his horizons were also higher. Not long ago, He had also established a friendship with the Minister of the Secretariat, Zhao Yuling. Since then, Sima Puhua seemed to have been enlightened. He had the intention to change the situation in the Ministry of Rights where the minister and assistant minister did not understand. The matter that truly made Sima Puhua make up his mind was that on the day of the beginning of autumn, he unexpectedly did not become the autumn announcing official. At the time, everyone thought that this special honor would be fought between Jin Lanting and Yan Qiji. However, almost no one thought that Chen Wang would once again take first place. If it was before this, Jin Lanting was only slightly inferior. Then after this, no one in the Liang court felt that Jin Lanting could compete with Chen Xiaobao for the position of future Grand Secretary. Today, the emperor had personally said the words of virtue and prestige, which completely extinguished Jin Lanting's desire to take first place in the spring examination. However, no matter how he viewed Jin Lanting as a joke, Sima Puhua, who could not be the minister of the Ministry of Rights for many years, still did not dare to openly offend this person, even though he was already a person who had achieved great merit and was uninterested in the officialdom. When all was said and done, Jin Lanting had displayed such a tyrannical attitude in Beiliang over the years. When he was in power, he was praised by everyone and was praised as unyielding and unyielding. However, when he lost power it was a different story. For a person to forget his roots, all of the officialdom in the capital could see it. Chapter 1830. Sima Puhua comforted him with a look of pity. San Lang, you have understood His Majesty's intentions. It's not that I don't want to help you, but I really don't have the strength to. Jin Lanting smiled faintly. His Majesty is naturally more insightful than us officials. If you don't mind me overstepping my authority, I do have a list of candidates. Sima Puhua was surprised. Oh. San Lang, please tell me. Jin Lanting, who no longer had a beard to show his ambition, smiled. The three candidates for the spring examination are Minister Yin, who has been a scholar of the Hanlin Academy for many years, Minister Yan of the Dongyuan Pavilion, Minister Chen of the Left Loose Cavalry, Minister Yan of the Yellow Gate, Minister Yan of the Yellow Gate, and Li Jifu, Gao Tingshu, and Wu Tsongxian, the top three in the palace examination. These young talents can all be assigned to different rooms. Sima Puhua habitually stretched out 2 fingers to twirl his beard, carefully weighing the pros and cons. Finally, he nodded. This candidate is flawless. San Lang is indeed San Lang. Jin Lanting dismissed it with a smile, as if nothing had happened. Sima Puhua secretly glanced at the man beside him. What a good retreat in order to advance. The old minister, who originally didn't think highly of Jin Lanting's prospects, suddenly gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, San Lang, don't worry. When I retire and return to my hometown, it will be time for San Lang to advance in the Ministry of Rights. Jin Lanting smiled but didn't say anything. Sima Puhua said softly, San Lang, my 2 disappointing children will be handed over to you in the future. Please take good care of them. Walking to an open area, Jin Lanting raised his head to look at the endless palace ridges in the distance. He said calmly, if I really have such a day, it's not impossible for the Sima family to have 2 ministers. Sima Puhua, who understood the deep meaning, smiled knowingly. He didn't take it seriously, but he was also full of longing. After Qi Yonglong and Huan Wen walked side by side for some distance, Qi Yonglong walked towards Zhao Yang, the commandery prince of Changshan. Tantanan also parted ways and walked towards Chen Wang. Because of the blind scholar, the old royal prince, who was in a bad mood, clearly didn't expect that the head of the secretariat would take the initiative to approach him. For a moment, he was caught off guard. In terms of military achievements, this member of the imperial clan was actually more outstanding than Yan Zhenchuan and Yang Shenxing. Facing an elder who was a generation older than Zhang Julu and Huan Wen, he still felt some respect. The saying that civil and military officials despised each other couldn't be applied to everyone. Qi Yonglong smiled and said, Commandery Prince Changshan, you shouldn't have said those words to Lu Su earlier. Just the mention of that young scholar made him angry. The Commandery Prince of Changshan said disapprovingly, Don't tell me that brat will complain to the emperor? Besides, Your Majesty doesn't have the time to uphold justice for such a trivial matter, right? Qi Yonglong pointed at his chest and sighed. We scholars are very narrow-minded. The Commandery Prince of Changshan laughed loudly. Lord Qi, what are you saying? How can there be scholars in the world who would trample on themselves like that? Qi Yonglong joked. Otherwise, why is there an ancient saying that it's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge? The Commandery Prince of Changshan was stunned. Then, he said in realization, now that Lord Qi has mentioned it, I understand. You're different from us martial artists. For us, we'll settle our grudges today and never wait a night. Qi Yonglong sighed emotionally for no reason. At the beginning of each dynasty's founding, the imperial court was filled with both civil and military officials. When the dynasty finally fell, the court was filled with civil and military officials shouting without restraint while the military officials could only mutter and moan. The commandery prince of Chongshan was puzzled. This king originally thought that Lord Qi was helping that brat surnamed Lu. I'm a little confused now. Qi Yonglong smiled. I didn't think much of it before I came to the capital. Now, I'm beginning to feel that there are too few martial artists like the commandery prince of Chongshan in the imperial court. The old commandery prince restrained his expression. Lord Qi, if you have something to say, just say it. If you continue to beat around the bush, this king won't feel at ease at all. It's better to just scold this king directly. Qi Yonglong shook his head and strode away. The two bigwigs of the Manxia province, Huan Wen and Chen Wang, walked together. Aside from official business, they did not have much of a personal relationship. Huan Wen went straight to the point. Chen Wang, don't be angry if I tell you. Although you and that Sun Yin are both from Bailiang, this old man actually doesn't like you. Chen Wang did not seem surprised. He smiled gently and said, birds of a feather flock together. Tantanon is a straightforward person. Naturally, he would like to associate with Sun Yin. For someone like me who doesn't show his emotions, I'm too bureaucratic and crafty. I don't have much elegance. It's reasonable that Tantanon wouldn't want to get close to me. Huanwen raised his eyes and looked ahead. Not far away, Yan Jieshi and Han Lin were walking together. Kai Nan was deliberately keeping a distance from Tang Tai's Huang. These small scenes were all part of the study of officialdom. Huanwen was in a daze. Chen Wang asked, what's Tantanon thinking about? The old man's eyes were absent-minded. He said in a hoarse voice, all the officials are busy. Everyone is smart and calculative. Chen Wang was speechless. The old man turned around and asked, is it true that every dynasty can't escape this calamity? Chen Wang nodded, but then shook his head. The shrewd old man grunted. There was no need for Chen Wang to explain anything. The old man put his hands behind his back and said with a wry smile, the smartest people in the world are all here. In the end, the remaining idiots all ran over there. The old man was silent for a moment. In the end, he called out Chen Wang's name. Chen Wang said softly, Tantanon, please speak. The old man curled his lips. If, and I'm saying if, one day someone needs to stand out and speak up for those idiots, and I'm already dead by then, can you say a few words? Chen Wang stopped in his tracks. He pursed his lips tightly and did not immediately give a reply. The old man did not have the patience to continue waiting. He walked forward slowly and muttered to himself, how sad it is when there are only smart people like us left in the world. Chapter 1831. A horse-drawn carriage stopped outside the outskirts of Liangzhou City. A young man wearing a saber and a jade pendant alighted from the carriage, carrying a jug of green ant wine that he had just bought. Looking around, he saw persimmon trees scattered on the plains in twos and threes. Clusters of bright yellow flowers hung on the branches, barely making the barren northwest land look like a bumper harvest. The young man walked forward slowly, from time to time looking at the familiar persimmon trees near and far. He remembered that he often slipped out of the city to wander around this place. He was bored to death, so he gave the persimmon trees many nicknames. Half a li away, the tree with a branch that seemed to be baring its fangs and brandishing its claws was called Hanging Armor. If you saw it in the twilight, it would be a little scary. The short persimmon tree that depended on it for survival had grown a little taller after not seeing it for a few years. At a glance, it seemed to be more fruitful. Its whole body was golden and very cheerful. The nickname he gave it was Little Yellow Robe. The young man continued to walk along a dried-up stream and finally came to a hut that was not surrounded by a mud wall. There were a few strange crooked elms behind the hut. The hut was empty. The young man walked in front of a tree stump and squatted down. He used his sleeves to wipe off the dust and sat on the stump. He looked around and gently placed the green ant wine on his robe. He shouted at the top of his voice, "Blind old Su, I brought you some wine." If it was during the last years of Yonghui, there would definitely be a blind cripple who would run out and take the wine pot from his hand. He would skillfully open the mud seal and lower his head to take a deep sniff. Then, a big smile would bloom on that old face of his, like a persimmon tree in autumn. However, when the old man shared the wine with him, he would always take advantage of him and teach him a lesson. When he had some spare money on hand, he could not waste it casually. No matter how small the copper coins were, he had to save them one by one so that he could marry a wife. The world was big, but marrying a wife and having children was the most important thing. At that time, Old Su always hypocritically said that there was a place called Yanji County in our northern Liangzhou, where the women there were the most beautiful. If you, little Su, could get a young woman from Yanji County to be your wife and send a message to me, I, Old Su, would go to your family's wedding feast even if I had to walk for 3 days and 3 nights. He remembered that time, after the old man said these words. He carefully asked him if he would find it embarrassing to have a blind old man like him as a guest at a wedding banquet. If the elders and in-laws in your family would dislike it, then Old Su would not join in the fun. He would just go back and buy 2 jugs of green ant wine at a reasonable price. At that time, the young man who often brought green ant wine or stolen chickens and ducks to the old man patted his chest and said that his words carried the most weight in his family. When he held the wedding banquet, if Old Su did not go, he would get angry with him. He even said that Old Su must sit at the main table. At that time, the old man only thought that the young man who often chatted with him was a young man commonly seen in the streets of Beiliang. When he was young, he was like him, the kind of person who never touched the ground. He always floated around and was restless. Therefore, when he heard that he would be invited to sit at the main table for the wedding banquet, he was happy but did not think too much about it. He also did not associate the arrogant young man with Mount Qingliang. There were too many people in the world with the surname Su, weren't there? At that time, the young man always revealed his longing for a place outside of Beiliang. He wanted to be a chivalrous Jianghu wanderer who used the best sword, drank the strongest wine, and found the most beautiful woman in the Jianghu. She would definitely be the kind who was prettier than the women in Yanji County. The old man always sang a different tune to the young man. He used the tone of an experienced person to tell him that he should not be so ambitious. No matter how good the Central Plains was, it was not his home. At that time, the young man also sighed with emotion and said that he also understood this principle. His master who taught him how to read and write at home once said, "For a young man, 10 years is not considered a long time after leaving home. For an old man, leaving home with just 1 step is a long journey." After the old man heard this, he laughed and said that your family's teacher was really knowledgeable. How could he teach a half-baked disciple like you? Sometimes the 2 of them would sit together and chat. The old blind man, Old Su, would sit on a tree stump next to them. He would lean on his walking stick with both hands and secretly doze off while basking in the sun. Perhaps many years ago, on the battlefield of the Western Fortress, there was a young soldier from the old barracks. His legs were not crippled, his eyes were not blind, but he also had a similar scene. He would also doze off under the sun. The only difference was that the walking stick in his hand had been replaced by an iron spear. Perhaps there was a large banner with the character Su, not too far away, flapping loudly in the wind. Now it was already the beginning of autumn in the 3rd year of Xianghu. The blind man, Old Su, had died long ago. Naturally, there would be no more chatter. The old man did not live long enough to drink the young man's wedding wine. The young man had once promised the old man that after the old man died, he would personally carry the coffin and send the old man off. But the young man did not do it. At that time, he was far away in Jiangnan. He did not go to Old Su's grave. He only gently poured the green ant wine on the ground in front of the tree stump. When he bent down to pour the wine, he said softly, "Old Su, I secretly bought this wine from the wine seller Xianxia. Now that the world is not peaceful and there is going to be a war soon, our Beiliang has begun to prohibit private brewing among the people. Therefore, this pot of wine is not cheap. If it wasn't someone familiar, the shop might not have dared to sell it to me. The proprietress's daughter is now full of life. A woman changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. I heard that the girl has taken a fancy to a young scholar from outside the city. He is currently teaching at a private school near her home. When I was buying the wine earlier, the proprietress even made fun of me, saying that I was late. Her daughter has actually waited for several years. You see, I really didn't brag to you back then. I told you that the girl had good taste. Otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen me." There was some regret, like an old dog lying in the corner of the street whimpering by itself. It was slow and long, scratching at the heart and lungs. He left the wine pot on the tree stump and stood up to leave. The carriage returned to Mount Qingliang. At present, there were two places in Beiliang Palace that were famous throughout the world. The Wutongin Palace was jokingly called the Phoenix Pavilion, and halfway up the mountain, the residence of the deputy administrator that Song Dongming presided over was called the Dragon's Gate. Just as he returned to Mount Qingliang, an official of the Dragon's Gate rushed over in a hurry and reported to him that the deputy administrator had important matters to discuss. When he saw Song Dongming personally standing in front of the low official residence and waiting, he knew that regardless of whether the news was good or bad, it was definitely not a small matter. Otherwise, given the composure of one of the former prime ministers of Liang, he would not be so impatient. As expected, Song Dongming waited until he came closer before turning and walking into the official residence in the middle. His voice was slightly urgent as he said, "The 4 pieces of news have been gathered together. They are respectively related to Liuzhou, the Central Plains, the capital, and Beimang. They are all considered by the prince." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Then let's talk about the news from Liuzhou first." Song Dongming nodded and said, "There is an urgent spy report from the military town of the Phoenix Division closest to the western regions. Chao Wei and Xie Shibian have arbitrarily changed the strategy set by the Governor-General and have chosen to take the initiative to attack. They want to take down Zhong Tan's cavalry in one go at the mouth of Mount Miyun." Su Fengnian's expression was normal as he said, "It should be because the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua did not move with Zhong Tan's cavalry." Song Dongming said worriedly, "Even so, the difference in strength between the two sides is not large. Isn't it against the original intention of Liuzhou to use troops to exchange lives in a head-on clash?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "If we are unable to wipe out Zhong Tan's cavalry at the mouth of Mount Miyun, then this battle will be meaningless. It can even be said that their greed for merit has caused Liuzhou to fall into a passive state. But since even Xie Shibian is willing to take the risk with Chao Wei, I believe in their foresight." Song Dongming sighed and said with a bitter smile, "These two fellows are really troublesome." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If they win, there might be an unexpected surprise." Song Dongming understood and said, "That's true. If Zhong Tan's cavalry is completely wiped out, perhaps Mount Lantua will have to reconsider." Chapter 1832. Su Fengnian asked, "What's the news from the Central Plains? Is it that Wan Taiyi and Ma Zhongxian are finally no longer obstructing the grain issue?" Song Dongming smiled and said, "This can't be considered important news." Su Fengnian was slightly surprised. "There's a change in the situation that's more important than this?" After Song Dongming and Su Fengnian took their seats in the meeting hall, this deputy administrator of Beiliang, who had already been acknowledged by the Ministry of Personnel of the Liang Imperial Court, had a playful look in his eyes. That king of Jing and Zhao Sun, who was originally loyal to the imperial court, has just joined the 2 rebel vassals. Su Fengnian was stunned where he stood. Song Dongming sneered and said, "Waiting for the right price to sell, this move is really beautiful. I estimate that this vassal king, who is able to judge the situation, has sold himself for a sky-high price." Su Fengnian felt this was absurd and said with a frown, "Could it be that Zhao Bing and Chen Jibao want to push Zhao Sun out to be the emperor?" Song Dongming smiled and said, "Wang Yi is right." Su Fengnian sank into deep thought. If one added the Jing-An road in the middle of the Central Plains, and the western Shu and southern Zhao that had long been controlled by Chen Jibao, then the entire area south of the Guangling River was completely united. Half of Li Yang's territory was already in the hands of the 3 vassals. At this time, the king of Yan, Zhao Bing, who was the first to start the war and had the most power, seemed to be the most qualified to ascend to the throne and rule with Li Yang by dividing the river. However, in reality it was the exact opposite. Zhao Bing was the least suitable to change his official robe for a dragon robe. No matter how bad Song Yushu described the emperor of Li Yang in the imperial edict, the entire court, especially the nobles led by Gong Namdu, were still loyal to Great Peace City. Zhao Bing was not suitable to stand out, and Chen Jibao, who did not have a proper surname, was even more unsuitable. Thus, the king of Jing, Zhao Sun, became the most difficult choice. In the Li Yang dynasty that had not yet annexed the Central Plains, Zhao Sun and his son's branch of the Zhao clan were actually far more suitable for the orthodox status than Zhao Heng's branch of the Liang dynasty. After the old king of Jing, Zhao Heng, failed to seize the throne and was exiled to Qing province, there was a reason for his deep resentment. In the current Xiangfu dynasty, There were probably not many officials who knew of this secret. Before Zhao Zhuan's grandfather ascended the throne, because Chun Wang, who was of the same generation as him, did not have a son, the imperial clan court had proposed that Zhao Heng be adopted by Chun Wang's branch. However, the process of Zhao Zhuan's grandfather ascending the throne was even more confusing than that of his son, Zhao Zhuan. In the end, Zhao Heng's identity became a muddled matter that even the elders of the imperial clan court could not understand. However, if this old matter was brought up again now, it was better to be early than coincidental. It could be said to be just right. Su Fengnian did not feel any jealousy towards Zhao Sun's meteoric rise, but he could not help but laugh. He thought of that pitiful fellow who had been thrown into the spring god lake by him twice. Did he really give him a dragon robe to sit on the dragon throne? Su Fengnian gathered his thoughts. No matter how chaotic the Central Plains are, that's it. Oh right. Is there any movement in Great Peace City? Out of habit, Song Dongming used his thumb and forefinger to rub a jade pendant hanging from his waist. He smiled and said, "The eunuchs in charge of the Directorate of Credentials have all moved out. They're on their way to Bailiang with a large pile of fresh imperial edicts and decrees." Su Fengnian said in bewilderment, "A large pile?" Song Dongming couldn't help but laugh. Otherwise, why would they need 3 or 4 eunuchs from the Directorate of Credentials to go out together? The most important is your title of Pillar of the Country, and the posthumous titles for Lu Jinu, Wang Lingbao, and the other generals of the Bailiang Frontier Army. For example, Great Peace City posthumously made Lu Jinu a first-rank count and gave him the title of Gujing. Other than that, there are also the titles of noblewomen prepared for Lu Chang and Yan Chudong. The eunuchs from the Directorate of Credentials have moved slowly, probably because they want to wait for your marriage and hope for a good fortune. From this, it can be seen that the sincerity of Great Peace City this time is like the mud to the clouds compared to the last 2 times. Su Fengnian sank into deep thought. Song Dongming did not disturb this young vassal king's thoughts. Song Dongming looked calmly outside the room, his thoughts flowing. The greatest feeling of this Bailiang civil official was the rise of Lu Xianxia in the imperial court of Liang. This person was able to be made a marquis and become a minister, not because this old man of the spring snow building was skilled in the officialdom, but because he was too talented and had great military achievements. But the timing of Lu Xianxia's rise was worth considering. He believed that Lu Xianxia himself might not be as full of himself as the officialdom of Jingdo imagined. He might even be walking on thin ice compared to when he was the commander-in-chief of the southern expedition. Being in a high position under the general trend, what would happen when the general trend was gone? Would he be able to retire after succeeding? The old prince of Liang Su Zhao's evil title, and the old Grand Secretary Zhang Julu's family extermination, were they not examples of what happened before? The 2 emperors of Liang before the current son of heaven Zhao Zhuan each wore 2 dragon robes. One was wise and powerful, the other grand and magnanimous. But it was undeniable that the sleeves were dripping with blood. The 2 emperors were not incapable rulers who would willfully kill the innocent, but when they wanted to kill someone, the person they killed was always the person with the greatest merit. Was Lu Xianxia not worried that he would become a sacrifice when the new emperor after Zhao Zhuan ascended the throne? Song Dongming finally understood. It was not difficult to make a living in the officialdom of Liang. Great Peace City could accommodate scholars like Qi Yanglong and Huan Wen, who were both talented and virtuous. It could also accommodate scholars like Wen Shouren and Jean Lanting, who were angling for fame. It could also accommodate scholars like Sima Puhua, who only cultivated through official means. But it could not accommodate those scholars who insisted that the people were important and the monarch was not important. Similarly, it could not accommodate people who had no merit. In Liang and the Central Plains, it was easy to become an official for the Zhao family, but it was not so easy to work for the common people. There were many things that even the emperor would be constrained in every way. In the early years, Bai Yan managed the transport of grain and officials. Perhaps this was what the late Emperor Zhao Dun wanted to do. But the complex power that had accumulated around the Zhao family for hundreds of years, or the new nobles who had recently ascended to power in the imperial court, each had their own desires, each had their own selfish motives. It was like a deeply entangled net, covering the sky and the earth, covering the territory of the Central Plains. On this large net, there were all kinds of unimaginably complex situations mixed in. The struggle for imperial power, the struggle for power, the struggle for political parties, the struggle for civil and military power, the struggle for noble clans and cold clans, the struggle for the northern and southern regions, the struggle for the capital, the struggle for the position of nobleman and villain, the struggle for the position of superior and inferior within each government office, and the internal and external struggles between government offices. Therefore, Song Dongming recognized Beiliang more and more. Here, doing things was relatively simple. But at the same time, Song Dongming also knew that this kind of precious simplicity would quickly deteriorate if the Beiliang Su family was no longer limited to the 4 provinces of Beiliang in the future. For example, between him and Bai Yu, between the relatives of the Lu and Wang families, between the young people like Su Beiji and Chen Shiliang and the old generals of the border army, between the outstanding people like Huang Shang and the notorious people like Huang Fujin and Li Mofan, between the cavalry and the infantry of Beiliang, between the elite border army, and so on. There might even be a day when a conflict would arise between Su Fengnian and the people. At this moment, Song Dongming had mixed feelings. A voice rang by his ear. "Sir Song, what's going on in Beimang?" Song Dongming came back to his senses and smiled. That Beimang princess, who goes by the pseudonym Fan Bainu, entered the pass from Ji province and came to our Yuzhou. She reported her name to Huang Fujin, and finally, under the escort of the cavalry at Tong Pass, she will arrive at Mount Qingliang in about 2 days. Su Fengnian asked in surprise, "What is she doing here?" Song Dongming shook his head. "I can't guess. But she brought a few retainers with her. They are all Che Shui guards from the Biting King's tent." Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "When did Beiliang become so lively?" Song Dongming was in high spirits, showing off his ability. He spread out his palms and then clenched them. "The ownership of the world is in the hands of Beiliang." Su Fengnian laughed for no reason. Su Shao loved to hear these words when he was alive. Song Dongming laughed and asked, "Does your highness not like it?" Su Fengnian smiled and said frankly, "There is no one in the world who doesn't like to be flattered." After saying this, Su Fengnian's expression became somewhat lonely. After Su Shao became successful and famous, as he gradually grew old, perhaps the only regret of that old man's life was that he had never heard his son say a single good word about him. Not a single word. Chapter 1833. A group of 500 elite cavalrymen from Tongguan escorted a carriage to the outskirts of Liangzhou City. Captain Xianxia Ma, who was personally leading the team, did not meet with the local garrison. Instead, 2 leaders of the Fushui Fang in Liangzhou City took over and led the carriage quietly into the city. They went straight to the mansion of the deputy Jidushi, where young Xianxia, the veteran general of the spring and autumn period, was in charge. A graceful woman wearing a curtained hat walked down from the carriage. However, compared to the women's clothes in the Central Plains, which were called shallow dew by the scholars, the woman's bamboo curtained hat looked coarse and unbearable. She was followed by 3 strong retainers. They looked calm and confident, like tigers and wolves. Their hair accessories were strange, and they did not look like Beiliang people. Fortunately, the street outside the mansion of the deputy Jidushi of Beiliang Road was empty at this time. Otherwise, it would be hard to avoid wild and fanciful thoughts. The middle-aged man closest to the woman looked at the style of the mansion and asked her a few questions in a whisper. After getting the answer, his face was full of anger. The woman with the special identity immediately reprimanded him in a low voice. The burly man was obviously still a little dissatisfied. He muttered and didn't stop. Under the curtained hat, the woman seemed to be helpless. The Che Shui bodyguards were all direct descendants of the Norland officials of the grassland, and the one beside her was even more unusual. She was actually curious about the young lord's choice of meeting here. According to the spies of the western capital, young Xianxia, the general of Liang, did not have a good time in Beiliang Road. The mansion temporarily under the old general's name was not supposed to accept such an important military mission. However, since Mount Qingliang had made such an arrangement, as a guest from afar, she had no choice but to accept. In fact, the worst situation she expected was that she would not even see the outline of Liangzhou City, and the 4 of them would quietly die on the way. Now that the young vassal king was willing to show herself, it could already be considered a good result. Her familiarity with Qingliang Mountain and the northern Liang Iron Cavalry was far from what the 3 proud and arrogant Che Shui guards beside her could compare to. In their entire lives, these 3 people had probably only interacted with the remnants of the southern dynasty, and their knowledge of the northern Liang border army was only limited to some rough military intelligence reports. The person leading the way for them was a middle-aged man with an amiable demeanor. His clothes were decent, not extravagant, but exquisitely ironed.
Beside the middle-aged man who looked like the steward of the mansion, there was a young maidservant.
Her face was delicate, but she had voluptuous breasts, a thin waist, a plump buttocks, and long legs. If she were lying on the bed, perhaps she would look very much like a rouge horse.
Even the woman in the curtained hat could not help but look at the maidservant, not to mention the Cheshire bodyguard beside her.
He did not hide the passion in his eyes. He swallowed and suddenly laughed. He sped up and reached out to touch the maidservant's slender waist.
The woman in the curtained hat did not have time to stop him.
However, the burly Cheshire bodyguard did not succeed either. His arm was gently held by the middle-aged manager who had turned around and stopped walking. The burly Cheshire bodyguard struggled hard, but he could not move. He suddenly felt that he was facing a great enemy. There was no longer any contempt in his eyes. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not break free from the manager's white fingers. The middle-aged manager did not look at the Cheshire bodyguard at all.
Instead, he looked at the woman in the curtained hat and said with a smile, "This is not your Baimang.
There has never been a custom of giving beautiful concubines and maidservants. If you have the ability to make a woman fall in love with you at first sight, then that is true ability. If you don't, this lady, you should obediently restrain the people around you. Otherwise, I believe you are familiar with how Bailiang treats its guests in the past 20 years.
After saying these words, the middle-aged man calmly loosened his 5 fingers.
The burly Cheshire bodyguard was caught off guard and staggered backward. The other young Cheshire bodyguard quietly stepped forward and reached out to support him. Only then did he stand firm. The Baimang bodyguard, who had lost face, was furious. He reached out to grab the white rainbow saber at his waist that only members of the royal tent could wear. He was about to draw the saber in anger. The middle-aged man remained indifferent towards this. His face was still that calm and amiable expression.
He shot a glance at the muscular northern Mang man who seemed to only have muscles but not brains, and said with a smile, "If you want to use this to test our prince's bottom line, then as a servant, I can't help but give you a word of advice. This action is meaningless and meaningless."
The burly Cheshire bodyguard immediately restrained his irritable expression. However, he still held the beautiful saber and stared at the hidden martial arts master in front of him. At the same time, the bruise on the wrist holding the saber instantly disappeared. It was obvious that the middle-aged manager's skills were not ordinary, and this Cheshire bodyguard who had purposely made himself look wretched was definitely not someone easy to deal with.
The woman in the curtained hat asked indifferently, "Sir, you shouldn't be the manager of this deputy provincial governor's mansion, right?"
The middle-aged man did not hide anything. He nodded and said, "I am a servant at Mount Qingliang. I do some chores and welcome people who come and go." She suddenly understood. There was more respect in her tone. She smiled and asked, "Are you Manager Song from Wutongan of the Wang family?" The middle-aged man who had served the Bailiang Su family for 2 generations, first signaled the maid to continue leading the way with his eyes. Then, he walked side by side with the woman in the curtained hat who recognized his identity. He smiled and said, "I didn't expect Princess to have heard of me." The woman in the curtained hat was Baimang's Qingwan Commandery princess who used the alias of Fan Bainu. She had the reputation of being the best in the grassland on horseback. The story of Fan Bainu and the former Bailiang protector General Chen Jibao, a hero and a beauty, had also been widely spread in Bailiang. She said softly, "The king of Shu has mentioned Sir Song's father many times in casual conversation." Song Yu, the head manager of Mount Qingliang, frowned and did not reply.
In Bailiang, perhaps even many of the spies and men of sacrifice who had entered the whisk room later did not know that the old manager, who had been coughing all year round, was actually the same as Tide Listening Pavilion's Li Yishan and the current Chu Lushan, the founder of the whisk room. The reason why the old man at the bottom of the lake had been imprisoned at the bottom of the Tide Listening Lake was because he was no match for Jian Zhehuang. However, the reason why Jian Zhehuang had remained at Mount Qingliang as a horsekeeper was another secret that had long been buried in the depths of the whisk room's secret files. After Su Shao had been conferred the title of king and taken over Bailiang, countless remnants of the Central Plains and Jianghu people had rushed to Mount Qingliang to take revenge on the Su family. If it could be said that they had not been able to kill the old cripple butcher even after exhausting all means at their disposal, it was because Su Shao had Su Yambing and Han Lao's Han, Wang Xiu's junior brothers, serving as his personal retainers. Then at that time, His Royal Highness Su Fengnian, who often roamed the 3 prefectures of Bailiang, had servants and retainers at his side. If it could be said that the servants and retainers at his side could be said to be able to compete with the other Baelyang's junior brothers who also did not engage in proper work, then it could be said that they were not enough when faced with a true Jianghu expert or top assassin.
How could Su Fengnian still be alive and kicking?
At that time, Song Yu, the steward of Wutongan, who was an inconspicuous person with a gentle voice and a mild temper, seemed to have been busy paying for His Royal Highness's drinks and wine in his early years, and giving gold and silver plaques to the wanderers who caught his master's attention. He seemed to be a harmless guy who only knew how to clean up after His Royal Highness's mess.
This was the truth of everything.
Before White Fox's face read through all the secret manuals in the Tide Listening Lake Martial Library, there was actually another person who had accomplished this feat first.
This person was Song Yu.
Although he had been seriously injured when he was young and had an incurable disease, resulting in his body being only at the level of Level 2 Master, regardless of whether it was his high vision or the various Finger Mystery Realm secret skills that he had learned from others, Song Yu could be said to be worthy of the title.
He was the second person after Su Fengnian of Mount Liang. When Fan Bainu was led by Song Yu to a lakeside pavilion, he recognized the young king almost at first glance. Chapter 1834. There was no distinction between the host and the guest in the pavilion.
The young king was surrounded by a graceful scholar in white, a tall and majestic old man, and a middle-aged man who looked 60 to 70% similar to the old man. After seeing Fan Bainu and the others, the young lord slowly got up and walked to the top of the stairs. With a smile on his face, he welcomed the princess of the enemy country who had quietly sneaked into Liangzhou. Fan Bainu didn't know why, but she didn't feel relieved after seeing this scene. Instead, she hated this young man even more. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because this person forced Chen Zhibao to leave Baelyang. Maybe it was because this person was the eldest son of Su Shao. Maybe it was because the tragic battle at the Calabash Gate spread to Bei Meng. Maybe it was because she had just heard the news of Hong Jingyan's death not long ago. Fan Bainu quickly suppressed the disgust in her heart and tried to keep herself calm. After all, in front of Su Fengnian, a master of martial arts evaluation, if she showed a little bit of abnormality, she would be caught. Although the four men were originally drinking wine, there was a small and exquisite table of yellow rosewood in the pavilion.
A whole set of tea sets was available. This was probably the way Baelyang treated their guests. They treated women who were not on the battlefield. Sure enough, the beautiful servant girl with the enchanting figure followed Fan Bainu up the stairs. Her eyes were gentle and her steps were light. She sat on one side of the table and skillfully began to make tea. Following the conclusion of Hongjia's journey to the north, there was no lack of remnant citizens of the spring and autumn period, who brought the northern Mang nobility the atmosphere of the Central Plains culture and elegance. Drinking tea was one of them.
Before this, Northern Mang's impression of tea drinking in the Central Plains was nothing more than the two actions of placing the tea leaves and pouring the tea. Now, even the 7 prohibitions and 12 amenities, which were even more elaborate than during the Great Feng dynasty, had become a set of rules, and they even looked like they were being followed.
Su Fengnian sat down again and looked at Fan Bainu who had taken off her veil hat. He introduced the other people to her.
They were Mr. White Lotus from Dragon Tiger Mountain, Yang Shenxing, the current deputy provincial governor of Baelyang, and Yang Huchen, the son of Yang Shenxing who was temporarily the deputy general of Jizhou. In the end, he added that they were not outsiders, so she could speak freely. When Fan Bainu was carefully considering her words, Su Fengnian suddenly looked at the 3 Beimeng guards outside the pavilion. He retracted his gaze and slowly said to her, "If this king did not remember wrongly, the white rainbow saber with a golden peach leather sheath was produced by the Yelu royal family 30 years ago. There were only 16 sabers in total. Excluding the few in the king's tent, there were only 9 sabers in the whole Beimeng. Huang Songpu, Lu Gui, and Yang Yuanzan had all received them. The last 2 sabers seemed to be from Dong Zhua who became the king of the South Courtyard and Zhong Tan who was promoted to Xia Zhemo. This king can carry this saber on his waist, and it seems to be an old item that has been hung for many years. This king's status is not lower than that of Commandery Princess. Why don't we go into the pavilion to drink and taste our Baelyang's green ant?" A trace of surprise flashed through Fan Bainu's eyes. She was about to speak, but the young king's next words almost made her stand up in anger. "The reason why I know the origin of this saber has nothing to do with encyclopedic knowledge. Tide Listening Pavilion has long known the real appearance of this saber. It seems that Su Shao personally took it from the waist of a Yelu prince on the grassland in the early years. Last year, Yang Yuanzan left another one at the mouth of the gourd. She sneered and said, "Of course the prince has outstanding military achievements and is not inferior to his father's generation. But he doesn't need to use this saber to remind others." Su Fengnian shook his head and smiled. "Commandery princess, you think too much. If this king wanted to show off his strength to you, he wouldn't be here to meet you for. Since you came from Yuzhou, wouldn't it be easier for me to let you go straight to the mouth of the gourd?" Fan Bainu suddenly stood up. Su Fengnian ignored her. When he reached for the wine cup, he said calmly, "You came all the way to Liangzhou City. It won't be so easy for you to sit down after you leave." She smiled and turned to Shui Wei, who was carrying a saber and hiding his identity, and said something in Beimang language. Shui Wei strode to the pavilion, and she sat down calmly again. Su Fengnian asked directly, "This king is very curious. Who is the big shot who made Commandery Princess come to the south?" She also answered directly, "It's His Highness the Crown Prince." Su Fengnian was not too surprised. He grunted and said, "Then how much did he offer to buy the throne of Beimang?" Fan Bainu shook his head and said, "Your Highness' words are a bit biased. Who will sit on the northern Mang dragon throne in the future? Your Highness' decision today will indeed have quite a bit of influence. However, it still hasn't reached the level where Your Highness is implying." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "It won't be? Then why did Commandery Princess come to Beimang at the risk of being beheaded? To eat the northwest wind?" Fan Bainu wanted to say something but stopped. The servant girl, who had been concentrating on brewing tea, had finished distributing the teapots. She should have served the tea, but she did not dare to disturb the two sides. She seemed to be in a difficult position. Su Fengnian came to her rescue and said, "Commandery Princess, this is this year's new tea from the spring deity lake. Try it. However, Liangzhou is not like Lingzhou. There is not much water in the well, not to mention the sweet spring in the forest. So, Commandery Princess, please make do with it." Fan Bainu extended 3 fingers and took the teacup that was 70% full. She lowered her head and took a sip. Her waist was straight the entire time. Of course, she was a moving beauty. She had a cold and inviolable aura around her. This aura that could keep ordinary people at a distance was exactly what a certain type of person wanted. It was believed that almost all men, if they had to choose between this Commandery Princess and that servant girl, would choose the former. However, Su Fengnian's eyes were clear the entire time. He did not pay any attention to the cowardly servant standing behind Commandery Princess Qinghuan, who was sizing him up with his hand on his blade. After she gently put down the teacup, Su Fengnian said, "This king originally believed that it was Yelu Dongchuang's idea. After all, before this person returned to Beimang, he had specially gone to Mount Wudong to meet with me under the accompaniment of Deng Mao. At the time he had also made a price. Back then, Hong Jingyan's Ruran cavalry was able to leave the mouth of the gourd intact. Firstly, it was because he had tactfully avoided battle. Secondly, it was because the matter of the Ruran cavalry was mentioned in the transaction. In addition, our main target was Yang Yuanzhan's main army, so we were not willing to waste our forces on the Ruran cavalry. This king has met with such sincerity, and behind Commandery Princess stands His Highness the Crown Prince of Beimang, who has an even greater background than Yelu Dongchuang. This king feels that the following price should not be lower than Yelu Dongchuang's." In the ears of Commandery Princess Beimang, this news was earth-shattering. It was not strange that Yelu Dongchuang was ambitious, but he was lawless. Before the dust of the first great battle of Liangmang had even settled, he had already made a deal with the king of Beimang. If this was confirmed by the king's tent of the grassland, the two surnames that appeared to be in harmony but were actually at odds with each other would inevitably set off an unprecedented storm of blood. As a result, Su Fengnian's following joke did not make her feel the slightest bit funny. Instead, she felt a chill all over her body. For example, this king was still the idol His Royal Highness. When he met those rangers who mistakenly thought he was a master of Jianghu, he admired them very much. If they received less money, this king would not only not be happy, but also be angry. He would feel that they looked down on the identity of His Royal Highness. So this time, when His Highness the Crown Prince sent Commandery Princess to Beimang, "You must bring enough money." She gently exhaled, staring at the young king for the first time, or it could be said that it was the first time she looked at the young man, but she was not in a hurry to speak. Suddenly, Su Fengnian looked up at the 2 expressionless ordinary guards outside the pavilion. "Huh? There's a murderous aura."
Commandery Princess Qingluan was stunned at first, then her expression changed dramatically, and she immediately turned her head to look.
But under the gaze of the people in the pavilion, the two guards were at a loss.
In an instant,
someone in the pavilion unsheathed his sword.
The power of this sword was not weaker than Gu Jiantong's thunder of mind. Chapter 1835.
Because of Su Fengyan's line of sight, both inside and outside the pavilion by the lake were also staring at those two cowardly shui guards, so much so that when the tall and sturdy man with the golden blade in the pavilion suddenly attacked, even Fan Bainu, who was sitting behind him, didn't have time to show the slightest expression of alarm.
The situation changed too quickly. Moreover, the momentum of that saber strike was too fierce, like a strong snowstorm that suddenly came during winter on the grassland. It was as if there was an immortal inside and outside the pavilion. Mr. White Lotus, who came down from the Dragon Tiger Mountain and then went up the Qingliang Mountain, was still habitually looking outside the pavilion with a smile. Bai Yu was still holding a cup of green ant wine in his hand, and the ripples in the white porcelain cup were light. Yang Shenxing and Yang Huchen, who were leaning forward slightly, also put their attention on the two cowardly guards outside the pavilion.
This pair of fierce generals on the battlefield were really eyeing them covetously, and they even had the unique majesty of fierce generals on the battlefield.
And Princess Qingluan of Beimang maintained the posture of looking back with her back straight. Her slanted shoulders were round and attractive. The maidservant who was cooking tea was still paying attention to the charcoal fire with her head down, fearing that it would spoil the fire. The flickering light of the fire shone on her delicate face, imperceptibly adding a bit of radiance to her.
In fact, the cowardly guard in the pavilion who attacked silently from the moment he unsheathed his blade to the moment he chopped down, so this blade shouldn't have instantly released such a powerful aura when it was close to the young lord's head.
Just like when two armies collided, naturally, the horse hooves would already be as loud as thunder before the battle. How could it be like a spring breeze drizzle? However, this saber strike had done it. Therefore, everyone was caught off guard. Even Song Yu, who was the gatekeeper of the Qingliang Mountain, who had all kinds of mysterious finger techniques and naturally had sharp senses, was a step slower to react. A burst of fine dust splashed up from where he stood, and this martial arts master who might be the #1 level 2 master in the world was about to jump into the pavilion. But the next moment, for some reason, Song Yu landed on the ground again, and his body didn't move at all. He no longer cared about the situation in the pavilion, and his gloomy eyes slowly moved around the two cowardly guards like a snake looking at a mouse. Logically speaking, as the local tyrant of Northern Liang, this private meeting was supposed to be a show of strength to these Northern Mang characters who had something to ask of them. For example, in historical novels, throwing a cup was often used as a signal. Hundreds of executioners would swarm over from behind the screen, or a pot of boiling oil would be set up in an open space, with the owner holding chopsticks. Unexpectedly, the young lord from the beginning to the end, Bei Mang was the first to attack. This group of Bei mortals knew that they were facing one of the four masters of the Bei Mang Wushu, and in the territory of the Su family's territory of the Su's family of the of the Beiliang cavalry, of the Su of the southern of Bei Mang, of the southern of the families of the ofs. Mr. White Lotus's eyes were still looking outside the pavilion. The wine in his cup rippled violently, and he sighed softly. When Princess Qingluan looked back again, she didn't see the scene of heads falling to the ground and blood splattering everywhere. She only saw the deputy commander of the Beiliang Shui Guards, who had the same surname as her, still holding the sword in his hand. His whole body was full of power, like an eagle that had just swooped down from the clouds, his claws suddenly hooked onto the wooden frame. In contrast, the leisurely young lord was holding the cup with 2 fingers on his right hand, slowly raising it, and then smiling at her after raising the cup. It was very ordinary, like a friendly toast between 2 friends. But the young lord's left hand was raised high, and his 4 fingers were naturally bent. Only his index finger just happened to be pressed against the blade of the white rainbow sword in the golden peach skin scabbard. This unstoppable blade, after touching the young lord's finger, couldn't move forward even a little bit. Perhaps what could prove that the previous blade was indeed unstoppable was the black hair of the maidservant next to the young lord. The slightly undulating black hair was like a lotus in a pond. After waving the blade with the most true meaning of martial arts in his life, the deputy commander of the Beiliang Shui Guards was pale. His eyes were desperate, and his lips were slightly trembling. Su Fengyan's finger that blocked the Beimang royal family sword gently shook, and the white rainbow sword with the golden peach skin scabbard flew out of his hand, and with a bang, it was quickly nailed into a pillar of the pavilion by the lake. The Beiliang Shui Guards, who was determined to die,
but also thought that the chance of success was very high, didn't care whether the young lord understood the Beimang language or not, and said in a trembling voice, "Weren't you successfully injured by Tuoba? And then in Huaiyang Pass, you fought with Chen Jibao. Why are you not injured at all?" Fan Bainu's hands were tightly clenched on his legs, and blue veins appeared on his white skin. He raised his head and shouted angrily, "Yalu Songlong!
Are you crazy?
Why did you assassinate the king of Bailiang without permission?" The burly dainty Shuegard was in a daze. He turned a deaf ear to the commandery princess's exasperated reprimand. He muttered to himself, "This is impossible," over and over again. He was confident that he had crossed the threshold of the celestial state. If he was facing Su Fengnian, who was at the peak of martial arts of course, it would be a joke. But the spy report clearly showed that the current young lord was in a bleak situation. Even if it couldn't be said that his life was hanging by a thread, his celestial body was almost shattered. Purely speaking of his body, he was even weaker than the ordinary Jianghu warriors who had reached the finger Xian state, let alone the great Vajra of Buddhism who had cast an invincible golden body. It was just like those Taoist immortals who had taken the shortcut to the sky. They seemed to have endless mysterious secret techniques, but in fact, they were vulnerable in front of the pure martial artists who were down to earth on the road of martial arts. After the deputy commander of the Bailiang Shueguards was exposed, one of the young Bailiang Shueguards outside the pavilion finally couldn't bear the torment in his heart. Suddenly, his eyes turned red, and he roared, and then he blatantly pulled out his sword. Not only did he not look imposing, but he also gave people a feeling of sadness. However, before the young Beimang guard could take 4 or 5 steps forward, he was kicked in the waist by Song Yu from the side. The corpse that was killed on the spot flew out, giving the onlookers a feeling of fluttering willow catkins. Next, everyone present looked at the remaining Bailiang Shui guard in unison. Song Yu's eyes were cold, Yang Shenxing and Yang Huchen's eyes were sharp, and Mr. White Lotus, who had been reading too much, seemed to know his own limits. He didn't look outside the pavilion in vain. Instead, he put down the empty wine cup and smiled at the frightened maidservant who was cooking tea, as if he wanted to ask her for a cup of tea. The young Bailiang Shui guard had a pitiful look on his face. A strange scene appeared. It was still not outside the pavilion, but inside the pavilion, very close to the young lord. Su Fengnian leaned back, barely dodging an extremely ruthless hand knife. The arm that was exposed from the shoe-embroidered sleeve was slender and beautiful, full of ivory gloss. But when her hand was used as a knife, it was full of murderous intent. Chapter 1836. If he was stabbed in the neck by this seemingly ordinary hand knife, he believed that it would be even easier than being chopped in half by the white rainbow sword. Princess Qing Luan, who was at a loss, stared blankly at the harmless maidservant who was brewing tea. The corners of her mouth held a faint smile, and the lingering charm between her graceful brows even remained the faint fear that she had deliberately faked after the previous unforeseen event. She twisted her wrist. The hand knife swept horizontally towards the young king's throat. The next moment, Su Fengnian held 2 arms with both hands and blocked 2 hand knives at the same time. One hand knife was from the mysterious maidservant who was cooking tea. And the owner of the other arm, even Song Yu, who knew everything about the Qingliang mountain, probably didn't expect it. Princess Beimang widened her eyes and couldn't help but have a look of disbelief on her face. She didn't know when a girl was standing next to her. She stepped on the table with one foot, and her hand knife was probably only a thin line away from the temple of the maidservant who was sitting sideways. Su Fengnian didn't look at the maidservant who was cooking tea, but raised his head and smiled helplessly at the little girl who still had the childishness of a girl's body. In front of so many distinguished guests, it's not appropriate for you to make a bloody scene, right? The girl snorted with a fake smile, retracted her hand, and then jumped up, grabbed the eaves of the pavilion by the lake with one hand, and disappeared after a light flip. Su Fengnian turned his head and said to the maidservant, "What is your relationship with the little girl in the princess's tomb?" The eyes of this young maidservant, who was actually very good-looking, were still gentle, without the slightest ruthlessness of ordinary Jianghu killers. She turned her eyes and saw that the young king was holding her hand, and there were drops of black blood oozing out from his fingertips. She raised her sharp chin again and saw that between the young king's eyebrows, there was a purple gold mark, as if an immortal had opened his third eye. She used the most mellow Gangnam-do voice and said softly with a smile, "Your Highness, you have a good method." Su Fengnian laughed it off. Blood that was as black as Su Fengnian's fingertips seeped out of the corner of her mouth.
Her face was filled with relief as she slowly closed her eyes. After Su Fengnian let go of her arm, he held her shoulder and let her lie on the yellow rosewood table. She was just like an ordinary servant girl, slacking off and falling asleep. Su Fengnian replaced the maidservant and handed Bai Yu a cup of fragrant spring spirit lake tea. Mr. White Lotus took the teacup, sighed again, and drank it in one gulp. Drinking tea was like drinking wine. The vice-commander of the Shui guards watched all of this with cold eyes. It was very likely that her real identity was the maid of the Princess Tomb female death warrior. When she attacked, he didn't have the intention to take advantage of the situation. At this time, he had a heroic smile on his face. He didn't show any sign of kneeling down and begging for mercy. He said loudly, "Your Highness, my life, do you want to take it personally, or do you want someone to do it for you?" Su Fengnian reached out his hand and gestured for him to sit. With a northern Mang official's voice that carried the accent of Gusai province, he said with a laugh, "This king is truly strange this time. The family that you, Yelu Tsonglong, belong to has always considered themselves to be the orthodox Yelu surname. Didn't you, Yelu Hongkai, and Yelu Donghua, this pair of grandfather and grandson's families always view each other as enemies? You all hate that Yelu Hongkai, who had been loyal to the emperor for 3 dynasties, let down the previous emperor. Moreover, since you can sit here this time, you can clearly be considered a trusted aide of your northern Mang crown prince. Why would you help them turn around and stab the crown prince?" Yelu Tsonglong hesitated for a moment and finally sat down. He was puzzled. "Why does your highness think that I am allied with Yelu Hongkai? The assassination of your highness came from the Beimang's crown prince. Isn't it more reasonable?" Su Fengnian didn't answer his question and asked, "Before you unsheathed your sword today, have you not used it for at least 2 years?" Yelu Tsonglong nodded. Su Fengnian's mouth curved up. This king also knows this kind of unorthodox sword training method that emphasizes the mind and not the strength. Tuoba Chun's son must have secretly told you. Yelu Tsonglong's mouth was slightly agape. Obviously, this young vassal king who could calculate was right again. Su Fengnian explained with a smile. When this king was traveling around Liang Lake, he often became a fortune teller. He didn't cheat every time. Yelu Tsonglong's mouth twitched. Su Fengnian raised his cup and took a sip of green ant wine. He narrowed his phoenix eyes and asked with a smile, "You don't believe me?" This famous deputy commander of the Shui guards didn't say anything. He was still skeptical. Su Fengnian laughed and pointed at himself. "It's actually very simple. The ancestor of your sword technique is far away but right in front of you." Perhaps no one noticed that when it came to Jianghu matters that didn't help the world, this young king seemed to be much more carefree. Yelu Tsonglong laughed involuntarily. So that's why. His family was close to the war god Tuoba. Everyone in the grassland knew about this. Especially him and Tuoba Chun's son were sworn brothers. Yelu Tsonglong exhaled heavily and asked with a smile, "Your Highness hasn't told me yet. How do you know that it was actually Yelu Dongchuang's idea that I went south?" Su Fengnian said seriously, "This king also only knew about it now." Yelu Tsonglong's expression turned sluggish. He was so aggrieved that his blood boiled. Yelu Tsonglong suddenly smiled and cupped his fists. "This time I took the risk to assassinate your highness. It has nothing to do with Yelu Dongchuang. It's just that I admired your highness's reputation as the #1 person in the world. I couldn't help but make a move. Originally, that move was for the Shui guards at the beginning of next year. I hope your highness will be magnanimous enough to forgive me for this. I believe your highness can understand the thoughts of a martial arts fanatic like me. If this small matter causes a misunderstanding between the 2 kings and delays your grand plan of conquering the world, I, Yelu Tsonglong, will not be able to absolve myself from the blame even if I die 10,000 times." Su Fengnian's eyes were playful. Just as Yelu Tsonglong was about to instinctively think about the deeper meaning of the young king's words, this burly man suddenly turned his head with difficulty and looked at the insignificant woman in his eyes. What Fan Bai knew? What Beimang's first commander? Originally, as long as he completed this business, there would no longer be Princess Qing Luan in this world. She would only become a plaything on his bed. Could it be that the good-for-nothing crown prince had the guts to say no? If he, Yelu Tsonglong, was really annoyed, when the Beimang imperial court was turned upside down in the future, even the crown princess who won the title of Han Gu in the chess and sword music school would also be snatched into his pocket. But at this moment, The Shui Guard's vice-commander Yelu Songlong was clearly a dying man. A dagger pierced through his thick neck. And the Beimang princess who was holding the dagger with both hands quickly pulled it out after her successful attack. Her movements were clean and efficient, without the slightest hesitation.
Yelu Songlong covered his bleeding neck with one hand and pointed at the woman with the same surname, who was even more ruthless than him with the other hand.
Fan Bainu gently put down the dagger and didn't look at Yelu Songlong at all.
She stared at the young king across the table. "Your Highness, now you and I can continue the original topic. I will still do the business for His Highness the Crown Prince. And now, Your Highness seems to have no other choice."
Chapter 1837. Su Fengnian expressionlessly pointed at Yelu Songlong's corpse lying in a pool of blood. "To put it bluntly, he can appear here, can speak and do things for Yelu Dongchuang. Then no matter whether Yelu Dongchuang really wanted to kill this king or not, it means that this king and your crown prince, who can't do anything right, are not reliable at all. If you put yourself in his shoes, how would you feel?" She bites her lips so hard that she doesn't even notice the scarlet blood oozing out. Beimang princess, who is not stupid, has no answer to the young king's question. No one here is a fool. She doesn't want to and disdains to say those words that go against her heart. Even if Yelu Dongchuang did have the sinister idea of killing two birds with one stone from the beginning, but compared to Beimang's fatuous crown prince, whose confidant was successfully instigated by his mortal enemy, the former is still a more suitable business partner. After all, this business is not as simple as tens of millions of gold and silver, not hundreds of officials' hats, and not even the military power of 200,000 or 300,000 people. It is related to Beiliang, Beimang, and Liang, these two countries. In a real sense, the whole world. If you are not the kind of ambitious and ruthless person who lacks temperament, real power, skill, and even destiny, you can only be a joke. Throughout history, only the ambitious wolves are qualified to fight for the world. In fact, she is sitting here now, is already a big joke. Yelu Songlong's knife, and the tea maid's assassination. Isn't it Yelu Dongchuang, the ambitious young man, showing his monstrous power in the grassland to the whole Beiliang and Su Fengnian? As for her, a chess piece played by the big people, how can she be on equal footing with the young man surnamed Su in front of her? She pulls the corner of her mouth, smiling bitterly. These years, she has always believed that the Beiliang cavalry that made the whole Beimang suffer was given to this young man by Chen Jibao with both hands. It was the white-clothed war saint's charity. Now looking at this young man, who has been talking and laughing from the beginning to the end, this hidden thought in her heart is not as firm as before. At this moment, a poor guy, who is in a more awkward situation than Beimang princess in the pavilion, moved. Song Yu suddenly appeared next to the only timid Shui guard who was still standing.
The latter raised his hands high and tried to move away from the sword at his waist as far as possible to show that he was an honest man.
When he met the eyes of the king of Beiliang, the young guard swallowed his saliva and said in a trembling voice, "His Highness asked me to send a message to your Highness." Nodded his head a little bit. Then the cowardly Shui Wei said something inexplicable.
Mr. White Lotus, who was in the pavilion, tilted his head and smiled at the young lord.
"As for the other peoples, they are. That sentence is of the of Bimes of Baiman. His Highness wants to ask your Highness, in your Highness's Wutongan, are there more parasol trees or more purple bamboos?" Even though many people in northern Mang, whether it was the northern court or the southern court, were curious about Su Fengnian, the new prince of Liang, the crown prince, who was at least the second most important person in northern Mang, being so interested in a small Wutong courtyard was still very boring. Princess Beimang princess didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but she also felt disheartened. The reason why she became the leader of this trip to the south, in addition to her familiarity with Beiliang, is that her family has high hopes for the crown prince, or it is because she sees him as a rare commodity. After plucking up the courage to say this, the young cowardly Shui Wei felt as if he had been fighting for a day and a night. His legs felt weak, and his entire body felt weak. Su Fengnian is stunned, and then said with a smile, "Tell your crown prince that if there is a chance, this king invites him to come to Wutongan to count. He feels that if he can return to Beimang alive, he must tell all his acquaintances. The young king of the Su family, like his father Butcher, is too powerful. He is worthy of being a Wu Dao master who is as famous as Tuoba, the grassland's god of war. He is worthy of being the king of Beiliang who killed General Yang Yuanzan. The grassland men have never been merciful to weak enemies, but they are never stingy with their respect for the strong. His family elders once told him that the biggest difference between the grassland and the central plains of Liang is that the scholars there, as long as they are rivals in their hearts,
they will never respect them. But it doesn't stop them from wagging their tails and begging for mercy when they are living under someone else's roof. But we grassland men are different. No matter how many generations of our ancestors were displaced, no matter how powerful the enemy was behind us, we will travel thousands of miles like wolves. This young man of Bei Mang who worships martial arts in his bones is in awe, but also a little excited. In the grassland's most honorable timid guard, who doesn't have a relationship with the royal family? Everyone is arrogant, but who has seen this legendary figure with their own eyes like me? If it weren't for the fear of being killed on the spot, the timid guard would have taken a few steps forward. In the lakeside pavilion, Princess Bei Mang had already given up, but her eyes lit up, and she can't suppress the excitement in her voice. Your Highness! Su Fengnian nodded and then shook his head. This king didn't agree to form an alliance with your crown prince, but I can give him another chance. The premise is that he must take out something more sincere than Yelu Dongchuang. Her eyes were shining and she said confidently, No problem. As for the thing in my hand, Your Highness, please take a look at it first. I believe Your Highness won't be disappointed. Su Fengnian joked, this king is already not disappointed today. Princess, don't worry. Let Steward Song take you to General Yang's mansion and find a quiet and elegant courtyard to stay for the time being. Some things can't be thoroughly explained in a few words, not to mention that this king also needs to weigh the pros and cons repeatedly. She put away the dagger, stood up, and put on the curtain hat again, leaving this small pavilion that may leave a strong mark in the history books in the future. In less than an hour, she walked side by side with Song Yu, who also looks gentle and elegant. This time, Princess Qingwan of Bei Mang has a completely different mentality. Chapter 1838. Song Yu still didn't exchange any pleasantries, and her expression was still warm. After leading the princess to a small courtyard, Song Yu turned around and left. She gently pushed open the door. The young Xie Shui guard was standing at the bottom of the stairs, about to move to the side room. She suddenly asked, What does His Highness mean by that sentence? The Xie Shui guard, who was the only one left alive, hesitated for a moment. He probably regarded this princess as a friend in adversity from the bottom of his heart, so he went beyond the rules and answered, Princess, I don't know what His Highness means. This is not an excuse. To be honest, during this trip to Beiliang, I have privately pondered over this sentence countless times, but I still can't figure out the mystery behind it. She didn't say anything else, pushed open the door, and closed it. She took off the curtain hat, leaned against the door, and almost collapsed to the ground. Today's matter in the lakeside pavilion, there were layers of conspiracies and overt plots, complicated and confusing. In the end, she was just a woman who was far away from the center of the imperial court of Bei Mang. After Yelu Songlong made his move, she was in a state of incomparable tension. It was really not easy to support herself to this room without batting an eyelid. For some reason, at this moment, faces appeared in Princess Qingwan's mind. First, it was the grandfather and grandson. The skinny Yelu Dongbei's dark face that revealed a mouth full of white teeth when he spoke. There was also his grandfather Yelu Hongtsai's smiling face. The old man liked to smile at everyone, and when he smiled, he would reveal his sparse yellow teeth. Then, it was a handsome face that she couldn't forget. It was the man in white who was silent no matter when and where in her memory. Finally, it was the pale face full of excitement and fighting spirit when the Crown Prince of Bei Mang told her to be careful before leaving. She breathed rapidly, gasping for breath. She closed her eyes in pain. Unconsciously, she vaguely remembered the face in the lakeside pavilion. She opened her eyes, gritted her teeth and said, If that knife didn't stab Yelu Songlong's neck, but your eyes, it would be satisfying. Deputy Provincial Governor Yang Shenxing, who had been feeling uneasy, walked around the tables and glanced at the corpse of the female death warrior lying on the table. He cupped his fist and lowered his head as he said in a heavy voice, Prince I, Yang Shenxing, have committed the crime of negligence. I am willing to accept the punishment without any complaints. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said with a smile, It has nothing to do with old General. After all, she was able to enter this house in the first place because of our Liangzhou branch's Yangying branch and Fushui branch's responsibility. However, I don't dare to complain about my second sister's injustice. As for Chu Lushan, that guy is probably thick-skinned and is not afraid of my scolding. Therefore, old General and I are actually the most innocent. Yang Shenxing was unwilling to look up. Yang Huchen first patrolled the western area of the territory as the Deputy General of Ji Province. Then,
He secretly entered Liangzhou with the help of Beiliang's Yongying branch's spies.
At this time, the one-armed general said, "Father, we know what kind of person Prince is.
You don't have to pretend." General Xianxia, who was called pretentious by his son, immediately raised his head and glared at Yang Huchen. His face was full of anger. Yang Huchen naturally avoided the sharp edge. He quickly raised his wine cup and clinked it with Mr. White Lotus's teacup.
The corpses of the Cheshui guards in the pavilion and in the lake, as well as the corpse of the female death warrior in the princess tomb, were quickly taken care of by the residence's nimble maidservants. Among them, there was a young maidservant who looked delicate and delicate. She usually didn't show off and looked like she would be blown away by the wind. However, when she carried away the corpse of the maidservant who was cooking tea, it was as easy as carrying a piece of silk that weighed a few kilograms.
Yang Xinxing returned to her seat and ignored this.
As for whether that maidservant was a spy from Beiliang's Yongying branch or the Fushui branch, and as for whether there were other people in this residence, she was an old man who had fought on the battlefield for half his life and spent half his life in the officialdom.
She was not at all interested, nor did she feel uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was only natural that someone like her would take root in the Jidushi residence. Once one entered a noble house, it was as deep as the ocean. Which noble house in the world was not like this? Yang Xinxing seemed to want to say something but stopped. There was no more green ant wine left, so Su Fengnian directly began to cook tea. He was actually not inferior to the female death warrior of unknown origin. This made Yang Huchen click his tongue in wonder. When Su Fengnian served tea to Yang Xinxing, he said with a smile, "Old General, if you have something to say it directly. The Su and Yang families are now allies who share honor and disgrace. Mr. White Lotus can be considered as a witness." Yang Xinxing smiled knowingly. "Then I'll say it directly. Based on today's situation, the Crown Prince of Beimang, who has been mediocre for so many years, does not seem like a person who can be supported. The officials around him who support the Crown Prince of Beimang will probably be hard-pressed for many days." Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "In my early years, I was not even as good as this Crown Prince. At that time I, His Royal Highness, did not even have a single official who sincerely supported the Crown Prince by my side." Yang Xinxing's expression inevitably became somewhat awkward. Yang Huchen, who rarely saw his father suffer in front of outsiders, did not hide his gloating. Su Fengnian leisurely drank a mouthful of spring tea and said softly, "Of course, I and the Crown Prince of Beimang seem to be in a similar situation, but in reality, we are very different. I am much, much luckier." Yang Xinxing thought for